Faltering Wind. Chapter 22, Faltering Wind. I've got a bad feeling, said Twilight, shifting nervously to press her side against Arkenstone. You too, said Arkenstone, feeling his own muscles tense. Around them, the train rattled and rumbled. Both Applejack and Rarity were sitting on another bench chatting away excitedly as they discussed their successes in obtaining the royal warrants, while Coco Pommel listened in silently. Having left Canterlot the day before, they were due back in Ponyville almost any time now. However, the feeling of warmth and security that Twilight normally felt when returning to her home was curiously absent. It made Twilight seriously uneasy. After all, given that everything in Canterlot had gone off without a hitch and they'd managed to leave without being harassed, everything should have been all right. However, the closer they got to Ponyville, the worse Twilight was feeling. Some vague feeling of dread settled in her heart, making her wonder if something was seriously wrong at home. She decided to take a look out the window, hoping that the familiar sight of the town would help calm her nerves. Instead, she noticed several things at once. Flocks of birds had taken to the air and were winging their way away from town as fast as they could, looking like swarms of bugs as they filled the sky. From her position, she could see Ponyville itself. Her eyes picked out a faint spiral of dust coming from near the town center. Something's wrong, she said, whipping her head around to give Arkenstone a distressed look. There's some kind of disaster in Ponyville. To her surprise, Twilight saw her normally unflappable cold friend pale slightly, his eyes opening wide to reveal the featureless white orbs his lids normally concealed. It must be him, said Arkenstone, Terra Heart. That pony from the cult Solar? Asked Twilight, her heart hammering in her ribs. Applejack and Rarity had fallen silent, the two of them realizing that something was wrong. Now they were listening to Arkenstone and Twilight, their ears standing upright on their heads and their eyes wide with shock. I can't think of any pony else who would be capable of inflicting such a grim feeling, said Arkenstone, especially at this distance. He shot to his hooves. Where are you going? Asked Twilight. I'm going to talk to the conductor, said Arkenstone over his shoulder. I need him to wring every ounce of speed he can out of this train. The sooner we get back to Ponyville, the better. What can I do to help? Asked Twilight, moving to follow him. Nothing for now, said Arkenstone. I get the feeling we might need your magic for something else in the near future, so we shouldn't squander it now. I can only pray we aren't too late. They left the car, sliding the door shut behind them, practically forgetting about their friends who were still there. Applejack swallowed hard and turned to look at Rarity. Red was worried something fierce when all left, she said. Ya don't think. I'm sure he's fine, darling, said Rarity, gently patting Applejack's arm. Red River is a most capable stallion. But if that brute is even half as dangerous as Arkenstone seems to fear, then, Rarity's hoof flew to her mouth. Oh no, Flaxseed, he's still in Ponyville. What if that monster finds him? Now it was Applejack's turn to be the reassuring one as she rubbed a hoof up and down Rarity's back. Take it easy there, Sugar Cube, she said. That jerk's probably there for Dawn. Dawn ain't gonna let that guy know about Flaxseed. He'll be fine. I hope so, said Rarity, turning to look out the window and watch Ponyville as it got closer. Despite their encouraging words to one another, neither of them could completely stamp out the feeling of dread that continued to swirl in their hearts. Dawn, said Scootaloo, shuffling nervously behind him. Get back, said Dawn softly, not daring to take his eyes off the stallion in front of him. Already, Cheerilee was doing her best to usher the foals away. Dawn prayed fervently that Terra Heart's single-minded determination to kill him wouldn't drive the stallion to attack before his classmates were clear. I'm not leaving you, said Scootaloo. Scootaloo, you're going to make things harder if you stay, said Rumble as he and Sweetie Belle did their best to try and tug the orange filly along with them. I didn't say I was going to try and fight, said Scootaloo, but I'm not gonna leave him alone like this. If you're going to stay, then stay clear, said Dawn, risking a glance back at Scootaloo. I can't guarantee anything, Ab. His voice cut off as he felt a surge of air approaching him from the front. Dawn barely managed to wrench his eyes back to his opponent just in time to see Terra standing directly in front of him. It was the same type of technique he'd seen Red River use in their past fight and sparring matches. Terra almost seemed to close the distance in a single step, arriving even before the sound of cracking and splintering wood that signaled the destruction of the schoolyard fence that had been between them. The surge of air was the only warning Dawn had gotten as Terra's forehoof was already a blur, lashing out with blinding speed, aiming straight for Dawn's chest. Unable to do anything else, Dawn threw himself backward with every ounce of speed he could muster, his body seeming to be in two places at once, with Terra's hoof actually passing through the afterimage he'd left behind. In actuality, Terra's hoof came within mere millimeters of connecting with Dawn's flesh, so close that it grazed the hairs of his coat. Skidding to a halt several meters back, Dawn was aware of a searing pain in his chest. A second later, he coughed and spat out a bit of blood, the action shocking Scootaloo, who was now standing level with him. Dawn, she exclaimed, shocked at the sight of blood. She'd been sure that Terra's strike had missed. Get back, said Dawn sharply, unable to think of saying anything else to her under the circumstances. It was clear that even a minor distraction could prove to be fatal. He barely even grazed me, but still, even without pressing his hoof to his chest, Dawn suspected that there might even be small fractures in his ribs from the impact, even though Terra's hoof had only barely brushed past him. It reminded Dawn of his fight against Scan, where allowing even the slightest contact with his opponent's blows would be fatal. However, Terra was clearly stronger than Scan by an order of magnitude. If his hoof made even the slightest contact with Dawn's actual body, Dawn had the feeling that he would crumple like a paper cup. The sound of fluttering wings told him that Scootaloo was following his advice and putting some distance between herself and the fight that was about to begin in earnest. Now that she wasn't in obvious danger anymore, Dawn allowed himself to return all of his focus to Terra, who was still facing Dawn with that same, stony expression. Once again, Terra moved, taking a single step that seemed to eat up all the distance between the two of them all on its own. In reality, it was several steps at once, as the sound of ringing impacts that followed in Terra's wake told Dawn. But Dawn was in no position to quibble over such details as he ducked beneath another lightning-fast punch that Terra had sent hooking in from the side. Even as Dawn ducked beneath it, Terra planted that hoof back down, the movement of the punch itself bringing the stallion's shoulder in line with Dawn. When the hoof came down, it completely shattered the ground beneath it as Terra surged forward, thrusting his shoulder at Dawn like a battering ram. Dawn's wings beat downward as he kicked off with all four of his hooves, shooting upward out of the line of Terra's attack. To Don's amazement, the strike didn't simply end with Tara's shoulder, but actually sent a shockwave ahead of itself that tore a trench along the ground. Such a blow would have allowed Tara to kill Don without even touching him. Don responded with an attack of his own. From above, Don beat his wings downward again, lashing out with his hooves to steady himself as he sent a blast of compressed air capable of shattering rock straight down at Tara's head. Tara didn't even flinch as the blow slammed into him. The ground around his body exploded in a flurry of dirt and torn up grass as the blast of wind scattered and vented its force on Tara's surroundings rather than the stallion himself. From the blast, a single stream of wind whipped out randomly and slammed into the side of the schoolhouse, slashing through the wall and practically cutting the building in two. With a roar of shattering timber, the upper half of the building sagged and toppled over, the tower with its bell slamming to the earth in a ringing cacophony. Well, that didn't work, thought Don as he looked down at his opponent. Tara had shrugged off the blow as though it hadn't even been there. Don knew that hardening the body was supposed to be one of the most basic skills of the mountain root and earth pony martial arts in general. A master like Tara could probably withstand the most powerful strikes Don could use against him without difficulty. There was little point in taking the offensive if that was the case. It would only be a waste of stamina on Don's part. Perhaps I can wait him out, thought Don. After all, from what he knew, the mountain root was based almost entirely on physical contact. If Tara's blows couldn't reach him, then there was no way that the stallion could inflict any damage. If Don could wait outside of Tara's reach and play for time, then maybe he could keep this going until Arkenstone arrived. Do you think you're safe up there? Asked Tara coldly, his eyes narrowing. Before Don could even think about answering, Tara seemed to vanish and reappear not only in front of but above Don. Out of reflex, Don jumped to the side as Tara thrust a hoof out at him. Don swung a wing across his body, bringing a hammer of air slamming into Tara's flank. However, Don was the one who was thrown away as the force of his own strike seemed to rebound against him. Luckily, the force was scattered somewhat so he was spared being smashed and was instead sent into a disorienting tumble. Barely managing to right himself, Don got upright just in time to see Tara Hart seemingly walking across the empty air at fantastic speed straight at him. How? Once again, Tara struck, this time twisting his body around to kick his hind hooves at Don, who barely managed to force himself up above the line of attack. However, to Don's dismay, the force of the kick seemed to disperse the air directly beneath his wings, sending the colt into a fall. Don managed to arrest his descent right before hitting the ground, but still landed hard enough to buckle his legs slightly. A faint whistle was the only warning he had before he threw himself to the side to avoid Tara, who descended from above with the force of a meteor. Kicking off the ground again, Don used his legs and wings to propel himself back away from Tara as the stallion hit with an explosion that threw dirt and stones in the air. Before Don could actually try to leave the ground, he felt a faint pulse of something through the earth that seemed to flow up the one hoof he currently had connected to the ground. All of a sudden, Don's body, wings and all, felt as though it were made of lead. His liftoff aborted and he dropped down onto all four hooves. The feeling vanished almost immediately afterward, but it had halted Don's movement just enough for Tara to come rushing in once again. Desperately, Don swept both his wings forward so that the outermost primaries pointed out past his head straight at the incoming Tara. Even as he flapped, Don also lunged, putting the full force of his body into the motion of one of the first techniques he taught Scootaloo. The forward wing strike sent a wave of air that pulverized the ground ahead of it, turning rocks into dust and digging a trench through the earth as its full force slammed straight on into Tara. It didn't even slow the massive stallion down. Instead, the cannon blast of compressed air exploded outward on impact, tearing apart the ground all around the two combatants. On one side, the remnants of the schoolhouse crumbled into fragments while the fence on the other side vanished in a storm of splinters. Through it all, the roar of the wind filled the two combatants' ears as Tara blurred closer to Don. Once again, Tara lashed out with a forehoof in another hooking strike that came at the side of Don's head. Don's own body blurred and vanished as he jumped sideways, moving in such perfect time with his opponent that Tara's hoof suddenly seemed to hang still in the air in front of his very eyes. Dancing around to Tara's flank, Don attempted to attack again, using a wing to drive another battering ram of air into Tara's side. However, once again, the force of the attack seemed to simply rebound against him. This time, Don let out a grunt of pain as he felt nearly the full force of his own attack slam back into him, launching him through the air. He only barely managed to avoid serious injury by relaxing his body to allow the force of the attack to knock him away rather than break him. Even so, the pain from the impact he'd received on his chest earlier redoubled. Folding his wings tightly against his sides, Don hit the ground shoulder first and quickly went into roll to bleed out his excess momentum. The roll also carried him back onto his hooves. Using the remainder of his inertia, Don pushed off the ground before he could allow himself to be dragged to a stop and beat his wings to quickly take to the air once more. That was what saved him as Tara's front hooves came crashing down on the very spot Don had hit. Once again, the earth shattered. Don grunted again as he was pelted with tiny stones that had been thrown up from the impact. The hail of tiny projectiles peppered his body, one or two even drawing blood. This is no good, thought Don as he saw Tara already going into motion again. The stallion was relentless. If it was at all in his power, he would not let Don get into the air. Even worse, he could apparently follow Don into the sky if he needed to. How was something Don had yet to determine. Furthermore, Tara was doing everything in his power to keep Don from gaining distance on him. Every move Don made was being matched by Tara in order to keep him in the stallion's range. Finally, the constant motion and the need to remain alert and aware of Tara Hart's every movement were slowly taking their toll. Even though the fight had barely begun, Don already felt as though he'd been through half a dozen training sessions in a row with barely any time for a breather in between them. In contrast, he couldn't even make out the faintest trace of sweat across Tara's brow as the stallion came at him again. This is a master of the mountain route. Don knew he couldn't afford to pull his punches any longer. Tara Hart was just too strong an opponent to even think about holding back against. Even as the realization occurred to him, Don flicked out one wing, holding it with its feathers splayed out so that it resembled a blade's edge. Slashing his wing through the air, Don seemed to carve a line through the world itself as a slim, crescent-shaped blade of vacuum whistled faintly through the air, straight for Tara's chest. Tara Hart didn't even see the strike coming and was in no position to avoid it as it hit dead on. Don simply seemed to break in two across his chest, not so much as drawing a single drop of blood. Only the sheer intensity of the fight kept Don's jaw from hanging slack as he dodged a flurry of strikes from Tara, moving so quickly that his body seemed to be in several places at once. His swiftest, deadliest attack, capable of slicing even through nigh indestructible metals like mithril, hadn't even scratched Tara's hide. Desperately, Dawn launched a flurry of vacuum blades at Tara, trying to find some way to penetrate the stallion's unyielding defense. But they all scattered uselessly as Tara came on. Continuing to give way in a fighting retreat, Dawn's wind sense told him that something large and inanimate was looming up behind him. Not even bothering to look, his wings blurred, sending another barrage of blades, this time behind himself. The wings sliced through wood and plaster, cutting the corner of the house Dawn had been about to ram into pieces. Kicking off both the ground and air as hard as he could, Dawn dashed backwards, using his wings to shift the air out of his way to allow him to accelerate away from Tara and put the crumbling walls of the house between them. A second later, Dawn's wings beat again, this time sending a wave of air that turned the fragments of the house's wall into a deadly rain of shrapnel. Driven by tornado force winds, they rushed with blinding speed at Tara with enough force to shred flesh and shatter bone. Shifting the angle of his body slightly, Tara brought his hooves down to the ground with enough force to crush stone and thrust his shoulder straight at the oncoming barrage. The house fragments shattered and scattered in all directions, along with the wind that had been driving them. The remainder of the house simply seemed to explode like a balloon, throwing debris everywhere. Dawn's let his mind empty of thought, relinquishing complete control to his body. Spinning and flipping, he managed to slip between the flying pieces of wood, glass, and plaster that had originally been driven by his own attack as they buzzed and zipped around him like a swarm of angry hornets. Even as he dodged, he began to agitate the air around his wings, producing a faint hum as bolts of electricity arced between his feathers. Snapping a wing out, Dawn pointed his leading primary at Tara and sent a bolt of pure electrical energy lashing out with a loud crack. The bolt exploded against Tara's body in a shower of sparks but failed to do anything. Not letting up, Dawn wheeled his wings, moving them through exaggerated circles as though they were joined together by a bar running across his shoulders. The power built in both his wings through their movements. As Tara came pressing on through the storm of their own colliding attacks, Dawn sent the electricity from his left wing rippling across his shoulders to add to the power he'd been building on his right wing. Continuing the circular motion he'd started with, Dawn swept his right wing upwards in an arcing motion that sent a stream of lightning curling out in a whip-like motion. Larger and much more powerful than his first strike, the bolt of lightning carved a fiery line across the ground, leaving a trail of glowing hot earth in its wake. Tara swept a forehoof inwards, upwards, and across his front in a blocking motion. It intercepted the incoming bolt of lightning and swatted it away, sending the redirected energy lancing into a nearby tree, which exploded in a shower of fiery splinters. Not even missing a beat, Tara came on once again, his hooves moving relentlessly to crush the life from Dawn's body. Without even thinking about it, Dawn swept one wing out and around in an arcing motion, throwing the force of his entire body behind it. A roaring funnel cloud twisted around both combatants, seeming to swallow them whole as it rose up into the sky. Fluttershy pressed herself up against Caramel's side, trembling like a leaf as she watched the tornado ascend upward. Dawn, she whispered. Like the rest of Ponyville, she had gone straight to Sweet Apple Acres when word had reached her about what was happening in town. Her first thought had been to go to her son's side. However, her bodyguard's words and her own experience told her that she would be more of a hindrance than a help in that situation. Can't ya do anything? Asked Apple Bloom, looking imploringly at the two griffins that stood nearby. Scan curled his forepaws, gouging lines in the dirt with his deadly talons. We would only get in the way, he said, frustration evident in his voice. That colt beat me the last time we fought. If he's up against a pony that can press him this hard, then I doubt I'd last more than a minute. Besides, said Zahn softly, we can't abandon our charge. That would be betraying Dawn's trust. Her eyes watering, Bloom turned to watch the tornado as it gradually began to abate. They're tearing apart the town, observed Mayor grimly. Now I understand why they went through the trouble of having us evacuate. Looks like Dawn's trying to lead the fight to the park, said Big Macintosh, less stuff to smash up around there. Dinky Doo cowered between his hooves, taking shelter beneath the red stallion's hefty form. In the air above them, Ditzy tried to observe what was going on as best she could. However, between the distance and her own irregular vision, she was unable to discern any details. Only if he can keep it in the park, Mayor pointed out. I think that's the least, our concerns, said Macintosh darkly. Help. Several had turned at once as the assembled ponies saw a frantic Flitter diving towards them, her eyes leaving a trail of tears in the air behind her as she rushed down. What's wrong? Asked Macintosh as Flitter barely managed to land upright in front of them. It's Red and Storm, said the weathermare in a tone that clearly indicated she was seconds away from panicking. They're badly hurt. They need help. Doc, shouted Macintosh, turning towards the barn. He'd arranged for the barn to be used to house the patients from the hospital, who were being evacuated as quickly as they could while the fight progressed. Dr. Stable, who'd heard Flitter's shouts, was already giving orders to his staff. Red Heart, Tender Heart, take charge of unloading the patients. Triage, Gauze Roll, get back to the hospital on the double. His orders given, he came galloping up to where Macintosh and the others were waiting. I'm afraid all the ambulances are currently in use. Do you have a wagon we can use to collect the patients? Yep, said Macintosh, I reckon we do. The wagon, in fact, was the one that Red River would have normally used to haul the produce to market. But on this day, the Azure Stallion had left the wagon unloaded and gone into town without it. Macintosh found himself wondering if Red had foreseen just this sort of situation and left the empty wagon ready, just in case. He'll need you to pull it, said Dr. Stable. I'll come along to make sure the patients are moved safely. Macintosh was already hitching himself to the wagon, leaving a reluctant Dinky to cling to her mother as he and Dr. Stable prepared to head dangerously close to the battle still raging. Led the way, said Macintosh to Flitter, who nodded and took to the air, flying ahead of the two stallions as they headed back into the town. The locomotive hadn't even fully slowed down, coming into Ponyville Station at a much higher speed than it should have. The brakes had been applied much later than usual. As a consequence, it was likely that the train would be well past the station when it finally coasted to a stop. Before it reached the station, Arkenstone bounded out from the locomotive itself, hitting the ground at a gallop. Over the screeching of the train's brakes, Arkenstone could hear the sound of roaring wind and crashing wood. His nose filled with the sense of fear, exertion, and blood. He came to a halt, realizing that he was now in Ponyville's market district. His ears swiveled around even as he sniffed the air, trying to find out where the scent of blood was the strongest. Time was of the essence, but the continuing roar of wind, punctuated by the crack and buzz of lightning, indicated that Dawn was still fighting. As long as Dawn was still fighting, it was Arkenstone's duty to ensure that any innocents and injured were away from the zone of conflict. After all, once Arkenstone himself entered the battle, it was highly unlikely that there would be anything that could be saved for several miles around. Finally, he managed to pinpoint the location of the first body. Coming over, Arkenstone's eyes opened once again, betraying his shock as he realized whose blood he was smelling. Red River. The Azure Stallion was practically embedded in the wall of the local florist. One side of him had sunken deeply into the plaster wall, while two of his legs bent at unnatural angles. Hearing the sound of his name, Red slowly pried one eye open and focused it on Arkenstone. Hey, you made it back. Don't talk, said Arkenstone softly, I'll make sure you get treatment. Don't worry about me, said Red, his chest heaving with the effort it took to speak. Fine Storm. I think he's in a real bad way. Frowning, Arkenstone stepped away and tried to home in on the scent of the other mercenary. It took him a little bit of work, but he found it. Just as Red had said, Storm was in much worse condition. His body had been thrown into a back alley, where he now lay, motionless. Only the faintest twitching rise and fall of his chest indicated he was still alive. However, there were signs of several fractures and one of his wings appeared to have had its bones completely shattered. The foreleg that normally anchored his meteor hammer had been snapped in several places and wrenched into a very bad position. Will either of them be able to fight, or even stand again after this? Wondered Arkenson, anger building inside of him. There hadn't been any need to break either of his opponents so completely. Terra could have easily done much less physical harm to them if the gulf in power between him and them was so great. However, he hadn't merely defeated them, he had crushed them. Arkenstone realized what Terra had done. Terra Hart had passed judgment on these two stallions for daring to impede his mission. He had struck them not with the intent to defeat or disable, but to maim them potentially for life, assuming they lived at all. It was an even more extreme version of what Dawn had once done to Flash Spark. However, unlike Dawn, Terra clearly had no intention of ever feeling remorse for this act. Arkenstone couldn't move them in their current state. He had no way of knowing if any damage had been done to their spines. Until he managed to get a doctor to assist him, it was probably for the best to leave the two stallions as they were for the time being, so long as their lives weren't in immediate danger. Mr. Arkenstone. Arkenstone's ears perked up and swiveled at the sound of Flitter's voice. She was flying down the street towards him. Behind her were Big Macintosh and Dr. Stable, the former pulling a wagon. Excellent, said Arkenstone, turning to face them. He quickly explained to Stable and Macintosh the situation. Stable used his magic to scan both stallions and then carefully levitate them into the cart without aggravating their injuries. Flitter was distraught, weeping openly as she watched the doctor settle Storm into the cart. He alive, said the doctor, giving Flitter a reassuring smile. I can promise that much at least. Arkenstone noted that Stable had neglected to mention just what kind of life Storm would have beyond that point. Still, the doctor's tone wasn't completely grim, so there might have been hope yet. Are y'all gonna jump into that? Asked Macintosh, pointing his muzzle in the direction of the park, where the sounds of the battle still echoed. Yes, said Arkenstone, I doubt Dawn will last much longer. I'll delay as much as possible to give you and the others time to get situated at Sweet Apple Acres. Turning, he faintly opened his eyes as he regarded Macintosh. Once you're there, gather all the earth ponies you can and have them stand firm. Use their power to anchor the ground. Otherwise. I don't know if it'll be enough, said Macintosh. I don't know where Granny went off to. If she's not there, it'll have to be you, said Arkenstone solemnly. Go. Macintosh nodded. Moving with careful deliberateness, he pulled the cart around to take it back the way he came, trying to strike a balance between moving swiftly and avoiding any defects in the road that would cause it to jar his passengers and aggravate their delicate state. Stable followed along behind him, using his magic to smooth out the ride as much as possible. Flitter, said Arkenstone, his voice causing the mare to free in place as she was just about to fly after the others. Did you see what happened here? Why yes, said Flitter, her body quivering at the memory. I need you to tell me everything you remember, said Arkenstone, any detail might be important. All right, said Flitter. In a smooth motion, Red River whipped his weapon out of its sheath. The motion extended the spear's handle as he swept it in an arc in front of him, the motion actually releasing a harsh breeze that washed over the ponies in his immediate vicinity, drawing their attention to him. All of you, Red shouted to the ponies around the market, this is an emergency situation. You all need to get to Sweet Apple Acres as quickly as possible. Do what you can to make sure that every pony makes it there safely. Now. Even as he pronounced the final syllable of his message, Red released an incredible wave of killing intent that made it perfectly clear that he was not posturing or bluffing. Nervously, ponies pulled back away from him as Red focused the entirety of his attention on the one pony that hadn't heeded his warning, the massive stallion still advancing towards him. The crowds of ponies pulled back away from the two of them as they faced each other, many already heading for the farm outside the town limits. However, most of them hesitated, watching and wondering just what was going on. In the meantime, at Stormfront's urging, the weather ponies were scattering across town and carrying word to every pony not currently in the market. Even though Ponyville was a relatively small town, that still left several hundred ponies who needed to be warned and moved. An oppressive silence descended on the street as Red faced Terra Hart, his spear still stretched out to one side, angled slightly downward so that its shaft stretched over his shoulders. Terra came to a halt a short distance away from Red River. Hail warrior, he said, his voice dripping with formality, I am an agent of her radiance, here on a sacred mission to exterminate evil. I know who you are, Terra Hart, said Red River, his eyes narrowing, you are an agent of the cult Solar, here with the intent of committing the act of ecocide. You and yours have repeatedly ignored Princess Celestia's real wishes in favor of erecting a delusion in her image and worshipping it in her stead. You have persecuted, threatened, and attacked innocent ponies on the basis of mere appearances. While I stand here, I stand between you and the object of your malice and you will not advance past this point. For a moment, Terra actually looked taken aback by Red's words and tone. Then his eyes narrowed in anger. I see you for what you are now, he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to make the ground around him shake. My course is clear to me, blasphemer. You will not obstruct my mission. Either stand aside or be thrown aside. I will not yield to you, said Red grimly. Terra's expression hardened. Thrice I ask and done. Get out of my way. No. Slowly, Tara's eyes drifted shut. So be it. He inhaled deeply. To every pony in the immediate vicinity, it felt as though the ground suddenly tilted sharply in the direction of the massive stallion, as though they were on the verge of falling into a pit that he stood at the center of. Reflexively, their audience backed away further. In the blink of an eye, Red lashed out with his spear, thrusting straight towards Tara's chest. His other forehoof slammed down, actually embedding itself in the ground as he lunged forward. Tara's eyes snapped back open and he swept a forehoof upwards and outwards, knocking the thrust to the side. A short distance behind him, the wooden wall of one of the market stalls suddenly had a hole punched through it before the whole structure shattered like glass. Ponies screamed and scattered as the truth of what was going on finally sunk in on a visceral level. Unwilling to allow Tara a chance to seize any more momentum, Red retracted the spear and launched a barrage of lightning-fast thrusts, the spear seeming to be multiple places at once, appearing to twist and writhe like a living creature as it jabbed relentlessly at Tara's body. Tara reared up on his hind legs, his two forelegs working in tandem to parry Red's thrusts before any of them so much as touched his flesh. Even as he defended, Tara slowly fell back, retreating from the sheer ferocity of the attack. Even as Red pushed forward, pressing his attack, it was clear to him that he was outmatched. Though Tara was on the defensive, Red still clearly felt the vast gulf that seemed to represent the difference in their respective strengths. Still, he pressed on. If he let up even for the tiniest sliver of a fraction of a second, then Tara would go on the attack and the fight would be over. A whistling sound came from overhead and Tara looked up to see a flash of something metallic plummeting at him from above. As Tara looked away, Red took the advantage of the distraction, accelerating his next thrust so that the spear practically seemed to vanish thanks to its sheer speed. Without taking his eyes off the falling metal weight, Tara's foreleg snapped out and parried the attack automatically, knocking it off course so that the blade of Red's spear intercepted the weight of Stormfront's meteor hammer. Upon impact there was a loud ringing sound, like that of a gigantic bell that burst out from the weight. The wave of sound slammed into Tara and forced its way into his ear, causing him to reel back with a grunt of pain. He fell back down onto all fours. Storm pulled the meteor hammer back towards himself, wrapping its cord around his body several times. With each wrap, the weight of the hammer seemed to gather the surrounding air around itself in a swirling vortex that enlarged the overall size of the weight. Then, with a shift of his body, Storm launched the weight straight out and down at Tara like a striking snake, the white surrounded by a veil of twisting winds. At the same time, Red had pulled back his spear, taking advantage of Tara's momentarily stunned state to spin and rotate it fiercely. The two attacks came at Tara simultaneously. However, Tara made no effort to defend against them, his head lowered and his eyes closed. Both the spear and the meteor hammer struck home. The first thing Stormfront noticed was a sound like a cracking whip followed by the popping and cracking of bone. His eyes widened as he saw his right arm wrench around backwards, nearly every joint dislocating at once. At the same time, his arm twisted and Storm felt the bone snapping. At the instant of the weight's impact against Tara, the massive stallion had shifted and a rippling wave traveled back up the length of the cord to Storm, where the cord itself had somehow snapped his arm. Meanwhile, the blade of Red River's spear struck its target and shattered into pieces, also splintering the next foot or so of the shaft behind the blade. The red tassel was sent tumbling through the air, as Red pulled back the broken remnants of his weapon. Tara wasn't done yet. Before the meteor hammer could fall away from his body, he reached up with a foreleg and curled his fetlock around the weight before moving fluidly to wrap a short length of the cord around his arm. Tara gave a powerful yank. Storm screamed in agony as he was pulled straight down towards Tara by the arm that had just been broken. His fall resulted in him coming down right next to Tara, who turned and let out a mighty buck just as Storm was about to hit the ground. Tara's hooves connected with Storm's side, all but completely crushing the wing there and launching Storm into an alleyway, where he hit with a loud crash. Contemptuously, Tara uncurled the meteor hammer from around his hoof and let it fall to the ground. As expected from filth that would dare protect a demon, said Tara, turning to face Red. Now that your weapon has been disabled, I will give you one last opportunity to withdraw unharmed. Red River began to spin what remained of his spear around one leg, twirling it like a baton. I think not, he said. As it spun, the spear's shaft began to glow. The blade may be broken. The shaft may be shattered. But, in the end, a spear is still a spear. As long as I have that idea in my hooves, it doesn't matter whether it's a real spear or a twig or even a blade of grass. I still have a spear capable of piercing you. The spear spin halted as Red assumed an attacking stance once again, crouching down on one foreleg while the other hefted the shining shaft of the spear so that it was angled slightly downward. The light seemed to curl out of the wooden shaft, swirling about, taking form. The light formed itself into a massive phantasmal spear formed from glowing lines of hardened light. It was larger than Red should have been able to wield, its shaft too thick for him to actually wrap his fetlock around, but Red still held it, his grip actually still holding the original shaft at the center of the spear of light. An impressive parlor trick, observed Tara in a bored tone, but your dependence on weapons and sullying your art with concepts from outside sources will not amount to anything. Red's eyes narrowed and he pushed his 3 free hooves down into the ground, his entire body blurring into the motion as he thrust the glowing spear, which seemed to become a ray of light as it rushed straight for Tara's body. Tara's eyes widened and, at the last second, he threw himself to the side. The shaft of light rushed past him, cleaving a clean line through the ground as it went, until it impacted the side of a building halfway down the street, piercing straight through it as though its walls were made of paper. Red retracted his arm and the spear of light shrank down to its original proportions as he prepared to attack again. However, as Red took the first step to make his next thrust, the shining spear suddenly seemed to dissolve, leaving behind a broken shaft once again. Red's eyes widened as Tara's body blurred, crossing the distance between them in an instant. Tara's forehoof came down as he turned and slammed his shoulder into Red River's own shoulder and side. The bones at the point of impact shattered almost instantly and Red barely had time to cry out as he was thrown off his hooves and sent flying through the side of a nearby storefront where he impacted against one of the interior walls and found himself all but embedded there. Tara Hart snorted once and surveyed his surroundings. The last few ponies that had been there to watch the event had fled. He made his way to the alley to inspect the first of the opponents he'd taken down. Stormfront still lay there, his body twitching feebly. Tara stopped, idly contemplating whether or not to finish the Pegasus off. Stop. A grayish blur flashed downwards and Flitter landed between Tara and Storm, glaring at Tara with tears in her eyes. You've done enough, she said, leave him alone. Terra clearly disagreed. However, his objective wasn't here. Instead, he silently turned and went back to making his way down the now deserted street in search of his target. So that's what happened, Arkenstone muttered to himself as Flitter finished her story. She had talked as quickly as she could, clearly feeling the urgency of the situation. However, Arkenstone noted that the sounds of battle from the park still hadn't quieted down. Dawn was still fighting, but against an enemy like Terra Hart, he must have been nearing his limit. The Colt likely wouldn't be able to keep up the fight for much longer. The fact that he'd held on this long was incredibly remarkable on its own. Did that help? Asked Flitter worriedly. Can you beat him? It did help, said Arkenstone, giving the mare a reassuring smile, but I don't dare claim victory just yet. You've been a great help to me. Go with Storm and the others now. Flitter nodded and took off into the sky. Arkenstone began making his way toward the park, his nose and ears guiding him. His mind was carefully processing what he'd learned from Flitter's story. She'd told him more than she realized as Arkenstone recognized some of the mountain roots techniques in what Terra had done. It told him a great deal about the level of Terra's skill. Reap what you sow, perhaps one of the highest techniques in the mountain roots repertoire. The technique that had brought down Stormfront utilized an Earth Pony's ability to use physical objects and substances as a medium for their magic to its utmost. Terra had rebounded the force of Storm's attack, not merely deflecting the weight of the meteor hammer itself but sending the force of its impact traveling back up the cord and into the arm that had launched the attack. What was more, Terra had added his own power to it, the resulting force being enough to almost completely destroy Storm's arm. Empty ground, that was the technique that had disrupted Red River's attack. It was less advanced than the technique that had defeated Storm, but an excellent measure of Terra's power. Earth Ponies drew their strength from the land around them, drawing the Earth's power into themselves and refining it before turning it against their enemies. However, against another Earth Pony, the very act of drawing in power could be used as an attack of sorts. An advanced user of Earth Pony magic could focus and control precisely where she drew power from. Normally, given the vast potential of the Earth itself, this was a relatively pointless ability. However, a strong enough practitioner could use their power to temporarily draw all of the power out of the area in the immediate vicinity of an opponent who also wielded Earth Pony magic. Doing so disrupted the opponent's ability to draw power into themselves and, as such, would disrupt any attack or defense they had, just as Terra's use of empty ground had caused Red's spear to suddenly vanish. It only lasted for a brief period, less than a second even, but a skilled user would not miss the opening such a technique could create. More importantly, it took an immense amount of personal strength to completely draw the power out of just a few square meters of ground even for such a short time. Terra was strong. He also had knowledge of the highest arts of the mountain route. That much was clear to Arkenstone, and yet there was a fleeting sense of vulnerability, a chink in the otherwise impenetrable armor that surrounded the one known as Terra Hart. Arkenstone hadn't seized upon it yet. However, he knew he would have to if he were to have any hope of victory. Ultimately, the answer would only be discovered in the fight itself. Arkenstone didn't have time to stand by and calmly consider strategies or assess strength and vulnerability. Dawn Lightwing needed him. Also, there were certain actions on Terra's part that needed to be redressed. Setting his shoulders, Arkenstone fixed on the sounds of Dawn's fight and headed straight for it. It's time to enter the battle. Author's notes. And so commences the climactic battle of this story. I've been excited about writing this part of the story for the past couple of years at least. Now that it's finally here, I'm really excited to finally post it. I've put a lot of effort to make it into the single most epic battle yet. Next chapter, Dawn Shines. Shining Wind. Chapter 23, Shining Wind. Alright, I need every pony to get in closer. I'm starting to teleport now. Twilight looked around to confirm that all of her passengers were within the spell's range. Miss Twilight, one of the orderlies approached her, a young stallion named Gauze Roll if Twilight remembered correctly. Can you really take this many ponies? Pursing her lips, Twilight nodded, admittedly feeling a bit reluctant. Theoretically, it should have been within the parameters of her new teleportation spell. When she'd first learned about Terra Hart's impending visit back around Nightmare Night, Twilight had begun to consider spells that would be useful in aiding a mass evacuation of Ponyville. Naturally, that had meant mass teleports, the most effective way of moving ponies from point A to point B in the least amount of time while minimizing the risk of them getting caught in the collateral damage of the battle itself. Of course, there was the issue of making sure that such a spell actually was safer than the alternative. Twilight dearly wished she'd managed to move to the live test phase of her spell before being forced to use it. On top of that, she couldn't ask for a worse draw when it came to the first ponies to accompany her on such a teleport. Twilight had trained herself to shut down the spell in the event that something was in danger of going catastrophically wrong. Thankfully, her training in battle magic under Arkenstone had actually helped to hone both her sensitivity to the flow of magical energy and her reaction time so that she would be able to prevent anything from going seriously wrong. The nurses and orderlies would be fine, if a little singed, if something went wrong. The patients, on the other hoof, might end up even worse than they already were if they were exposed to the unraveling energies of such a powerful spell at close range. Twilight simply counted herself lucky that the most at-risk patients and those with the most delicate conditions had been given top priority when it came to the evacuation. It also helped that Ponyville Hospital was neither large nor crowded. There weren't too many ponies remaining and those who were still there had relatively minor injuries at worst. I can do this, thought Twilight. Compared to what Arkenstone is up against, this is easy. Thinking about him helped rally her heart. Twilight took a deep breath and settled herself to begin her spell. As she did, she called upon her hidden asset. A faint sparkle of light emerged from the base of her horn, slowly wrapping around it to form a ring of silver and gold. The Arcanasteel ring, a gift that Arkenstone had given her so many months ago, would help her see the spell through. The ring had numerous, perhaps countless, potential uses. However, those uses technically fell under two categories. Its first and primary role was to serve as a conduit to actualize Twilight's magic. Before she'd received it, it had been her brother's and it had actually been used by numerous former captains of the Royal Guard before that. It conjured armor from actualized magic, magic-made material substance, as opposed to magic-made material substances, which was the school of conjuration. Shining Armor and other Royal Guard captains used the ring to create their armor, as opposed to wearing an actual physical set. Said armor could be imbued with particular properties by the creator, only limited by their understanding of how to manipulate the qualities of actualized magic. The second category of uses the ring possessed was magic accumulation. Orichalcum was a powerful conductor of magic. When alchemically married with mithril, a metal that was magically resistant, the resulting alloy, called arcanasteel, had the unique quality of being at once conductive and resistant to magical energy. The mithril sigils engraved on the ring's outside created barriers that forced magic to flow through the more conductive channels of orichalcum, which helped to shape the discharge of magic channeled through the ring, which was what created the armor itself. The magic flowed to the inside of the ring, which was composed of the actual amalgam of mithril and orichalcum that was arcanasteel itself. The alloy soaked up magic like a sponge, accumulating it and keeping it circulating throughout the ring until needed. Its capacity was enormous. Twilight had been channeling her excess magic into the ring for months to build its charge but had yet to fully charge it. She used both those functions now. As the ring around her horn blazed with silver-white fire, Twilight used it to actualize her magic, not around herself but to cover each pony being teleported with a thin sheath of pseudo-armor, a far cry of what she could create for herself but more than enough to serve her purposes. At the same time, she drew upon the ring's stored power to supplement the magic she'd channeled out through the horn to build the actual spell itself. Because the magic stored in the ring was already outside of her body, she didn't need to channel it through her horn, which drastically reduced the stress casting such an enormously powerful spell would normally have on her horn's alicorn. As the spell proceeded, the magic from the ring joined with the magic coming from her horn and shrouded the ponies all around Twilight. The magical field blazed with blinding light and they vanished from the ground in front of the hospital. As Twilight had predicted, managing so much magical energy at once, even with the aid of her ring, was not an easy effort. The magical field shifted and intensified at random times and at random spots. Normally, this would result in light burns and singed fur. However, thanks to the armor of actualized magic she'd encased her passengers in, the ponies riding along the spell with her were untouched. They arrived at Sweet Apple Acres in an explosion of light and sound. The unrestrained energies of the unraveling spell could have potentially injured her passengers but instead simply stripped the armor away as it absorbed its maximum capacity for damage, leaving all the ponies Twilight had teleported along with herself unharmed. "Ya made it." Twilight looked over to see Applejack coming up to greet them. "I wasn't sure that fancy spell yours was gonna work. Good thing I came to make sure the field was clear for our landin'." "Thanks, Applejack," said Twilight with a cheerful nod. When the train had finally ground to a halt well past the station, Twilight had directed Applejack and Rarity to go meet every pony else at the farm. Applejack's job had been to make sure that Twilight's point of arrival was clear, as the consequences for any pony who might have been occupying the site of her intended destination would have been unpleasant. More nurses and orderlies joined those who had accompanied Twilight to take charge of the patients and escort them to the Apple's barn. "How are things here?" asked Twilight as she walked over to her friend. Applejack's face fell. Twilight suddenly noticed that she looked deathly pale beneath her coat and her eyes were red. The small trackways of matted fur where her tears had run down her cheeks also came to Twilight's notice. "Applejack, what's wrong?" Twilight braced herself for the worst. "It's Red Dot and Storm," said Applejack. "They tried to stop that monster and..." She let out a choked sob. "It ain't good, TWY." Slowly, Twilight moved to wrap her arms around Applejack's shoulders and hugged her tightly. "It'll be okay," she whispered. "I wish I could believe that," said Applejack, "but the doc ain't got much hope for either of 'em being up and about again, especially since they ain't got a proper hospital." Twilight frowned. That was a serious problem. Unicorn magic could do a great deal to treat injuries and aid in recovery. However, it required the assistance of a stable, clean environment in order to work best. The Apple family barn, which while definitely no cesspit and quite clean, by barn standards at least, was not a proper substitute for a hospital environment. "Come on, Applejack," said Twilight, slowly guiding her friend back towards the barn. "Let's see if there's anything we can do to help." Twilight sincerely hoped that there was, but felt that it wasn't likely. As she went, Twilight was assaulted by the feeling that she'd forgotten something or someone important. "Wait, where's Spike? Darn it, where did Twilight put those phoenix feathers again?" muttered Spike as he rooted through the trunk next to Twilight's desk. He'd been a bit late in getting the memo about what was going on in town, mostly because with Twilight gone to Canterlot, some pony had apparently forgotten that he still lived at the library. "Geez, do a little house-sitting and ponies completely forget you exist." Aha, at last Spike managed to uncover the bundle of glimmering red and violet feathers belonging to Oranos. When set to a letter, the feathers worked in a manner similar to Spike's own fire, setting the letter alight and sending it straight to the Phoenix, who would then take the letter straight to Spitfire. Letters sent this method were treated as emergency missives and given the highest priority, which meant that once she got it, Spitfire would probably head out from Cloudsdale on the double and put a stop to this situation. But Cloudsdale is still hours away by flight, thought Spike. What if she doesn't make it in time? But time was the one thing he couldn't afford to waste with doubts. Spike immediately got parchment to quill and set to work penning a quick letter that would hopefully bring Spitfire straight to town. He didn't know if Twilight and Arkenstone had come back yet, but it was best to play it as safe as he could. Finally, Spike touched the feather to the letter. The parchment and feather burst into a cloud of glittering fire that streamed out the window and headed to Cloudsdale. There, that's taken care of, thought Spike. Time to go join the others. As he made his way to the door, the young dragon froze as he realized something. The sounds of battle had disappeared completely and silence had replaced them. That's not good. Don's mind was blank. He'd given up on trying to think long ago, at least, it seemed long ago. It had probably only been a few minutes really, but it felt as though hours had passed to him as he continued with his deadly dance, a dance where his partner was determined to step on his hooves, and the rest of him as well. No longer guided by thought, Don's body moved by instinct, the years of training having ingrained themselves into his flesh and blood at a level beyond that of reflex. Even though he couldn't think about it, Don's body knew how to fight. He moved purely by feeling, his eyes staring blankly ahead as his body responded almost completely on its own to the movement of the air as Terra's attacks displaced it. The attempt to gain an opening by unleashing a tornado had proved futile. Terra Hart had bowled his way through the attack with just as much ease as he had everything else. Don had tried to ride the currents of the funnel in order to gain some altitude, only to find that Terra had somehow, once again, managed to climb into the air with him, moving as though the massive stallion weighed no more than a feather. And yet, even up there, when Terra struck, he might as well have weighed tons. It was almost as though Terra could somehow adjust his weight and lighten himself at will. Perhaps that was in the purview of Earth Pony magic on some level that Dawn wasn't aware of. However, this was neither the time nor place to think about it. Moving on automatic, Dawn had attacked and attacked and attacked, even as his body dodged countless return blows by papers with. Nothing worked. Battering rams of compressed air seemed to simply burst on contact or rebound upon their creator. A whirling, slicing blade of air felled all the trees within a certain radius of the two combatants but left Terra untouched. Lightning was either knocked aside or simply seemed to ground itself out whenever it came into contact with its target. Yet Dawn continued to attack whenever he could, desperately seeking some way to breach Terra Heart's seemingly impenetrable defense. A tree split in two as Dawn ducked beneath a pair of bucking hind legs. As Terra retracted his legs, Dawn launched himself upwards and backwards in a backflip that carried him between the two halves of the splitting tree. His wings released vacuum blades that cleaved the two halves away from the trunk where they joined. As Dawn's body came out of its flip, he used gusts of wind to launch the two trees at Terra's body just as the stallion turned around. As he turned, Terra simply swept out a foreleg, brushing aside the two massive chunks of wood and branches as though he were simply brushing off a cobweb and sending them crashing off to the side and moved to pursue Dawn again. Dawn's body immediately went into a roll as he swept his wings around in the motion, creating a swirling whirlwind that rushed through the grove of trees they were currently fighting their way through. The wind stripped countless leaves off their branches and brought them into a swirling cloud around the colt, obscuring his body as Dawn immediately moved to a new position. Meanwhile, Terra charged towards Dawn's original position, thrusting his hoof into the center of the leafy maelstrom. The whirlwind unraveled, dispersing the leaves. However, Terra's eyes widened when he no longer saw Dawn there. Silently, a single crescent-shaped blade sliced its way through the air and struck Terra full on in the side. However, the vacuum blade again failed to penetrate. Terra turned towards the source of the attack and was surprised to see Dawn closing in again. This time, Dawn came within a single step of Terra, an orb of swirling energy hanging off the tip of his outermost primary like a single ripe fruit. As Dawn closed in, he slammed his hooves down into the ground and used that motion to propel the wing and the orb of concentrated plasma on its tip straight into Terra's chest. The fruit metaphor held as the orb seemed to break and then splash over Terra, the energy contained within it washing over his body. To Terra's shock, he actually felt a faint tingle as the attack actually drove him back a pace. What? For a moment, Terra blinked in surprise and stared as Dawn began to fall back from the attack. Terra couldn't quite figure out what that feeling was. It almost felt as though a tiny portion of Dawn's attack had actually worked its way through the magic strengthening Terra body. But that was impossible. There is no way this demon could possibly have the power to inflict harm on me, thought Terra angrily. In his present state, not even a dragon's fangs or claws could draw his blood. That faint tingling must have been something else. It couldn't have possibly been caused by a slight trickle of electricity from Dawn's last attack actually affecting his body. Shaking off his surprise, Terra pressed forward. On the other side of the battle, Dawn was beset by an inkling. Even though he wasn't consciously thinking about it, Dawn's awareness had sensed something about that last attack. Gradually, Dawn was growing conscious of a certain sensation, an ebb and flow in the air between him and Terra. The motion of the air had a certain rhythm to it. Sometimes, it was drawn deeply in Terra's direction, only to be expelled back towards Dawn with surprising ferocity, always right when Terra attacked. Depending on the scale of the flow, the attack might be large or small. The rhythm of movement might speed up or slow down, but there was always a consistent beat there. As Terra actually backed away from Dawn for the first time in their battle, Dawn was suddenly conscious of just what that back and forth movement in the air was. It was Terra's breath. He was sensing Terra's breathing through the wind. What was more, thanks to that, he had a better idea of when Terra was attacking, whether the movements of the attack would be large or small, when Terra was making a feint or actually committing himself to a strike. A memory emerged from the depths of Dawn's mind, something Arkenstone had told him once. Breath is central to nearly all martial arts. It is the means by which we generate power, channel it and release it. A pony can mask their presence and their intent, but they cannot mask their breath. Breathing also teaches you their rhythm and intervals, marking the difference between action and inaction. If you can perceive that, then you can move as one with your opponent. If both of you move as one, then it is the same as neither of you moving at all. Then, if add your own motion to your opponent's motion, then you will be the only one moving. Remembering, Dawn allowed the entirety of his awareness to be drawn into the sensation of Terra's breathing, feeling every time the stallion drew air in and exhaled it back out. When Terra inhaled, Dawn's awareness actually flowed into the stallion and Dawn felt his power. It blazed like a miniature sun, surging and violent. It was larger and fiercer than the compact, contained star that Dawn remembered sensing inside of Arkenstone, but somehow less refined. As Dawn focused on this new dimension of awareness, the battle progressed. However, the colt now moved with greater ease than ever, slipping between openings in Terra's attacks he wouldn't have noticed earlier, moving in sync with his larger and stronger opponent. As he did, his body's movements became less frantic and abrupt. He'd slip forward directly into Terra's space 1 second and slink out through the side at an angle as Terra tried to strike him the next, moving smoothly and fluidly, his movements becoming more efficient and easier with each passing moment. Dawn's sense of his own body seemed to bleed away as he became immersed in the fight itself. Terra's frustration was slowly growing. The fight was dragging on and the colt should have been tiring with each passing minute. However, no matter how hard he tried, Terra simply couldn't find a way to end the battle. If anything, Dawn seemed to be a more difficult target now than he had been at the fight's beginning. Whenever Terra attacked, Dawn's form seemed to simply flow around his hooves without being touched and slip away at some unexpected angle. If Terra could touch Dawn, whether with his hooves, his barrel, or even the tip of his tail, then he could launch a full-force attack through that point of contact. But Dawn Lightwing seemed to have become an intangible phantom. It grated on Terra's nerves. A demon should not have been so capable. The fight should have been over long ago. The creature calling itself Dawn Lightwing and masquerading as a pony was meant to be stamped out. Terra was older, stronger, and far more experienced. More importantly, he was righteous and he was just. Everything was on his side and yet the battle dragged on with no signs of conclusion. Though Dawn's attacks seemed incapable of harming Terra, Terra's own strikes seemed just as incapable of reaching the colt's body. It was a stalemate, but one that Terra was determined to break. Whatever else might come, Terra Heart was certain that he could outlast Dawn Lightwing. Sooner or later, the body that the foul demon had hijacked would reach its limits and be reduced to a helpless state. Then it would be a simple matter to end it. Then things began to change. As Dawn slipped around yet another barrage of punches from Terra's forehooves before falling back from a shoulder check, Dawn's wings flared, slashing through the air like knives. Taking flight directly over Terra's back, Dawn directed several vacuum blades downwards, aiming, not at Terra, but the ground around him, etching deep lines into the ground. Once again going into a rolling motion, Dawn directed a surge of R down into the gouges he'd just cut out of the ground. To Terra's shock, the ground beneath his hooves lifted up into the air, then, with another burst from Dawn's wings, inverted, while Terra was still on it, thus pinning him beneath the chunk of earth as it fell towards the ground. Growling, Terra reared, planting his forehooves into the dirt at the bottom of the hole and bucking upwards with his hind hooves. The chunk of earth above him shattered, throwing clods of dirt in every direction. Bounding out of the hole Dawn's attack had left behind, Terra was surprised to find Dawn waiting for him. In fact, as Terra moved towards the colt, Dawn actually flickered and moved even closer still, now right in front of Terra's chest so that the colt stood just beneath the stallion's chin. Getting an even better feel for the flow of Terra's breath, Dawn had actually reached the point where he found his own rhythm starting to match Terra's. He was anticipating Terra's moves and even realizing how to disrupt them. He also realized something else. As he stepped right into Terra's space, coming right up to the stallion's chest, Dawn halted scant inches away from his opponent, his breath perfectly in sync with Terra's, feeling almost as though he had become one with the very pony he was fighting. At that moment, Dawn attacked. It was nothing more than the most basic of his techniques, a burst of compressed air from one wing at point-blank range. The attack slammed into Terra's chest and, instead of scattering or rebounding, actually knocked Terra Hart back. Terra's breath escaped with a loud huff as his hooves dug grooves in the ground, threatening to send him plunging back into the very pit he'd just jumped out of. It was shocking to the stallion. It had been years since he'd last actually felt pain in battle. The situation was both shocking and novel. How? There is no way this creature should be capable of something like that. Dawn, on the other hoof, felt exultation rush through him at the realization that he'd finally managed to get through Terra Hart's seemingly impenetrable defense. However, as he moved to press the attack, he stepped forward and found his foreleg buckling, threatening to collapse out from underneath him. Dawn pulled back and realized his hind legs were behaving in a similar manner. In fact, all his limbs, even his wings, had begun to quiver. The strain of the battle was, at last, catching up to him. Ironically, his embrace of the very principles that had allowed him to perform so well to this point were also what had led him to ignore the growing strain on his body until it was almost no longer capable of moving under its own power. The feeling was beginning to drain out of his extremities as Dawn tried to summon up what little strength he had left in order to find some way to press the attack. Whatever he did would ultimately be his last effort, so Dawn had to make it count. Another memory rose up in his mind as he tried to settle on a course of action, a memory of a different discussion with Arkenstone. True mastery of the Gale King will emerge when your separate techniques become one and the same. At the time, as well as more recently, Dawn had wondered what such a unified technique might entail. He believed he'd approached it during his most recent training sessions, but, ultimately, he had yet to grasp that technique's true form. However, now, in this blank state, existing between thought and thoughtlessness, where his body and mind had achieved an almost perfect union, Dawn might have had the answer in his grasp. Though his body was on the verge of collapse, that numb sensation was actually affording Dawn a greater sense of clarity than ever before, very much like the sense he'd gotten when he'd faced the assassin, Willow. In those circumstances, to pierce the veil of Willow's fog, Dawn had shed each of his senses and, in doing so, had managed to reach a level of perception that surpassed them. Now his senses were fading as a result of his own exhaustion. But it was affording him a similar clarity. Because of that, this would be his best chance to reach for that level of mastery. As he recovered from the blow, Terra froze when he noticed the trembling in Dawn's limbs. The colt's body was finally giving out. Terra's lips curled up in a triumphant smile before he forced the expression back down. There was no place for such emotion on the battlefield. He needed to focus the entirety of his being on what needed to be done. Sufficiently grim-faced once again, Terra began to march steadily toward the exhausted colt. The end, at last. High above the battlefield, Scootaloo hovered, watching with worried eyes as Dawn's battle with Terra Hart progressed. Dawn had not been kidding about how dangerous it was to get close. The two of them, simply by exchanging blows, had left a swath of destruction behind them leading from the schoolhouse to the park, even tearing apart a few unfortunate houses along the way. Once or twice, she had tried to swoop in closer to better see what was going on, only to be forced to pull back as a burst of wind from one of Dawn's attacks threatened to send her flight spiraling out of control or a barrage of debris from the impact of Terra's hooves threatened to perforate her body. When Dawn had created a tornado, Scootaloo had been forced to dodge a few boulders that had been bigger than she was. However, even at this distance, she could tell that things hadn't been going well for Dawn. She'd watched as he'd launched attack after futile attack, only to have them break against Terra's body. The stallion was a rock in all but the most literal of senses. Nothing Dawn did seemed to get through. However, though he should have simply been playing for time, Dawn continued to attack. Scootaloo noticed something else as well. As the battle progressed through the park, gouging the earth and shattering trees, she noticed that Dawn's movements were gradually getting smoother and more fluid. He'd often complimented Scootaloo on her grace after watching her go through the forms. But now, as she watched, Dawn appeared to be just as graceful. With each exchange, efficiency increased and wasted motions were trimmed away. Dawn was learning, teaching himself how to move more effectively as the battle progressed. It didn't seem to be helping him to find any weaknesses in Terra's defense though. Then it happened. After pulling that crazy trick of cutting out, pulling up, and flipping over the chunk of ground Terra had been standing on, Dawn had landed an attack and had actually driven Terra back. Scootaloo's heart soared as she dared to hope for the first time that Dawn might actually manage to turn the battle around and win against this seemingly unstoppable monster. But it wasn't to be. Just as Dawn looked as though he were about to press the attack, he stumbled, first forward, then back. His body began to droop and, in this brief pause in the battle, Scootaloo saw for the first time just how tired Dawn must have been. His coat was matted all over with sweat peppered with patches of dirt and dust punctuated by spots and streaks of red where small rocks and other debris had scored his body during the fight. His mane and tail were both ragged and scraggly, hanging in uneven strands tangled around one another. The feathers on his wings were in disarray, having been worked harder than they'd ever been worked before. His eyelids were half closed, as though he were on the verge of falling asleep where he stood. No, whispered Scootaloo. She saw Terra pause as he recovered from the attack. She knew that the stallion had seen what she had seen. The fight was almost over, and Don was not going to be the winner. Then, to her shock, she saw Don's posture seem to go entirely limp. He was still standing, but his wings now hung, motionless, by his sides, not folded against them, but hanging down limply. His entire body seemed to relax and Don's eyes fell all the way closed, his head lowering as though bowing in submission before his enemy. It looked as though Don was bowing to the inevitable and silently allowing Tara Hart to bring this fight to an end. No, yelled Scootaloo, immediately going into a dive. There was no way she could even remotely hope to fight a monster like Tara. But she had to do something. There was no way in Tartarus that she would allow that jerk to kill Don if there was something she could do about it. Don was too important to her to be allowed to die like this. Then, to her utter amazement, Don moved, and everything went white. Don allowed his body to relax, releasing the last of the tension that had accumulated over the course of the battle. His eyelids were so low, they might as well have been closed for all the difference that they made. He relaxed to such a degree that he didn't even notice as a single strand of drool began to drip down out of his mouth. He simply continued, relaxing everything, releasing everything. Tara approached, moving step by deliberate, ponderous step, possibly taking his time, savoring his victory. It didn't matter. Don wasn't even really thinking about it. His consciousness had spread so completely throughout his body and the air around him that he almost felt omniscient. His own breath moved in perfect sync with Tara's own, the two of them breathing as one, in complete unison. That had been the key to getting past Tara's defense. Perhaps Don could have broken through with brute force if his power had been greater than Tara's by an order of magnitude, but that wasn't the only way to pierce such armor. If you became one with your opponent in consciousness, then his body failed to recognize your attack as an outside force and would not reject it. It wasn't easy, but it was surprisingly simple in practice. Don felt as though he understood Arkenstone's words a little better. Now was the time to try something else along with that. As Don relaxed his body, his magic still flowed through his wings, agitating the air between his feathers, producing a faint buzz as a charge slowly built up. At the same time, his control extended to the air around him, stirring it into motion and drawing it in towards him. Finally, his body built up its strength for one last explosive effort as he prepared to unleash his final attack, possibly the final attack of the battle. Tara Hart approached, his eyes focused entirely on his target. It was strange to see Don Lightwing in such a passive state after the intense battle they had been through. Tara had expected the Colt to collapse, possibly beg for his life or bandy about words to try and undermine Tara's conviction. Part of Tara had been hoping for that. It would have made exterminating the demon all the more satisfying. Instead, the Colt looked as though he had fallen asleep on his hooves. Perhaps Don had passed out standing up and was actually unconscious at the moment. In spite of it being a rather unsatisfying conclusion to this troublesome battle, Tara felt it was probably for the best. Don Lightwing was best disposed of before he could threaten any pony or anything else. As he got closer, Tara's ears picked up a faint, but familiar, buzz. Lightning. He'd grown quite used to the sound during their fight given that Don had attacked with lightning several times over. However, the Colt should have been too weak to muster such an attack. Looking more closely at his opponent, Tara noticed a faint, bluish-white shimmer dancing around the primaries of Don's right wing. The shimmer was growing in size, seeming to feed off the air around it and becoming something like a fine white mist that hung about Don's wing. What is the demon up to now? It was time. Don could feel that everything was right. He moved. His right wing snapped open and swept upwards like a blade, its motion cutting through the air in front of him. The accumulated electrical energy seemed to merge with the edge of the vacuum itself, though something like that should have been beyond the laws of physics. At the same time, the muscles of his entire body rippled as he lunged into the motion. Even the act of bracing his hooves against the earth helped add power to the motion. All the while, a single clear image formed in Don's mind, an image that was translated into reality as the curved edge of a blade of white seemed to carve its way into the world in a blinding flash, rushing straight for Tara Hart. He wasn't certain if the roaring in his ears was an actual sound caused by the technique or it was simply his own body protesting its overexertion. Meanwhile, everything in front of him was swallowed up by the shining wind. Tara Hart couldn't understand what was happening. He hadn't even really perceived Don's movements as an attack until it was too later. However, what he did perceive was the sense of threat. For the first time in years, decades even, Tara truly felt as though he was about to die. His will was unyielding, his power was drawn from the earth itself. There was no force that any pony who was not also a master of the mountain route could bring to bear that should have been able to harm him. However, at that moment, he knew that, if he did nothing, he would die. It was an attack that completely surpassed his understanding and it had come when his guard was lowered, when he had been absolutely assured of his victory. In that shining instant, the battle between Tara Hart and Don Lightwing came to an end. Arkenstone smiled as he observed the battle. His eyes couldn't see Don's final attack, but he could sense its power. His nose picked up the hint of ozone in the air, along with another scent, charred flesh. I hope Don didn't burn himself. He had arrived only moments ago, ready to jump into the fray, only to pause and find himself waiting as he noticed that Don was still able to fight, still able to avoid Tara's strikes and even strike in return. Though he still held no hope for the Colt's victory, he didn't want to actually intervene until it was absolutely necessary. Something told him that Don needed every minute of this battle. His movements were improving right up into the very end, thought Arkenstone. Over the course of the fight, the Colt had been collecting a wealth of experience and had been unconsciously using that to improve his own ability. Arkenstone felt proud. Though Don couldn't really be called his student, Arkenstone felt a certain degree of pride for having provided the Colt with a few gems of advice in the past, especially considering how far Don had been able to take that advice and make use of it. He also noted another familiar scent in the vicinity. Scootaloo was also close by, hanging in the air and watching the battle with her own eyes. That was good. Even as an observer, there was a great deal she could gain by seeing her teacher put the skills he was passing on to her to use. Arkenstone settled back and waited for the fight's end to come. What was that? Gasped Fluttershy as she saw a flash of bluish-white light cut through the skyline over the park. It was as though a shining wall had been erected for the space of a few seconds before vanishing just as quickly. That was the little cub's doing, I'll wager, said Scan with a smirk, his own eyes fixed on the direction of the distant park. That looked like something he might do. If so, that was one of the more impressive things I've seen, commented Rarity as she levitated a pair of binoculars up to her eyes. To think that our dear little Colt was capable of such a display. She reached out with a forehoof and gently patted a shivering Flaxseed's shoulders. Of course he is, chirped Pinkie brightly as she bounced around. I'm not getting any saddy-batty feelings from my Pinkie sense, so everything must be okie dokie hunky-dory. If you say so, said Fluttershy, seeming to shrink in on herself slightly. He'll be fine, said Caramel, gently nuzzling Fluttershy's shoulder. He's strong. Why yeah, said Fluttershy, gently ducking her head against her cold friend's shoulder. However, her heart wouldn't stop thudding alarmingly and her stomach felt heavy with dread. Dawn, please be all right. Everything felt strangely distant to Dawn. He couldn't feel anything very well anymore. It felt far away, as though his mind and body had become separated. He would have wondered what happened, but thinking was hard. It was difficult to piece together anything that could even be called a coherent thought. The light from his previous attack faded from his eyes and Dawn noticed that the world seemed to have been turned sideways. Had he been more conscious, he would have realized that, actually, he was the one who had turned sideways and fallen onto the ground. But, at the moment, his mind just couldn't grasp the idea or anything else either. At the moment, Dawn couldn't remember what he'd been doing, why he'd done it, or how he'd ended up like this. Everything felt blank to him. Right now, all he could do was lay and stare. Then, motion. Something moved into his field of vision. Dawn's eyes couldn't really focus on it, perceiving nothing more than a dark brown blur in front of him. Dawn's ears picked up a faint rumbling sound, some pony speaking maybe, but couldn't make sense of it. Wah what? It was the first coherent thought he was able to assemble. He latched onto the word and began to slowly pull himself back towards something resembling a state of alertness. He was tired, so tired, but there was a sense of overwhelming danger that demanded his attention, that insisted that now was not the time to pass out. Fighting hard, Dawn tried to make sense of what was happening in front of him. He blinked, though the motion was less a blink and more of a slowly closing and opening of his eyes. When he did so, he finally managed to get his vision to focus on the incoherent blur in front of him. It was a stallion, a very large one. His body was imposing, seeming to have been carved from the side of a mountain. His gray eyes glowered with deep, righteous anger down at Dawn's unmoving form, as though Dawn had did something to insult him. Slowly, Dawn's mind began to piece together just what had happened and he began to remember. Now he remembered who the stallion was. Terra Hart, that was right, the stallion had come to Ponyville to kill him. They had fought and Dawn had managed to unleash his strongest attack yet. Doing so had completely drained all remaining strength from his body. His heart sank when he realized that, if he was seeing Terra now, then his attack had failed. Terra had not been defeated. Now Terra was standing and Dawn was helpless before him. It would be the work of less than a second for Terra to kill Dawn and there was nothing Dawn could do to stop the stallion. Then something else flashed across Dawn's field of vision, something orange. At once, his heart was flooded by a sick sense of fear and dread. No, Scootaloo. Terra grimaced as he settled his weight carefully on his left hind leg. For the second time that day, he had been forced to actually dodge an attack. It had been so unexpected that Terra had also sustained an injury for the first time in years. Dawn Lightwing's attack seemed to have completely ignored the Terra's magical defense and had cut into him. The blade of Shining Wind had avoided hitting anything vital. Furthermore, the cut had been cauterized at the same time it was made, thus keeping the wound from bleeding as well. The consequence was an angry black and red line along Terra's flank, running just under his cutie mark. It burned something fierce and ached terribly, but pain was something Terra could deal with. Humiliation, however, was a different matter. No matter how Terra looked at it, no matter how he tried to reason or justify it, Dawn Lightwing had managed to harm him. The demon had unleashed a power that Terra had been completely unaware of and had struck when his guard had been lowered. Somehow, that mysterious attack had actually managed to do the impossible and score a mark on Terra's body, which should have been stronger than even Mithril at this point. He had to have cheated. There was no way the Colt could have accomplished such a feat through actual martial prowess. He could only have drawn on his supernatural power as Nightmare Moon's demonic servant. Disgusting beast, thought Terra with a dismissive snort. However, Dawn Lightwing now lay helpless before him. The Colt's body was motionless, his foul eyes staring ahead sightlessly, as though his mind could no longer comprehend what was happening. This fight is over, said Terra, creature of nightmares, your end has come. Stop. A blur of orange and fuchsia swooped down from above and a Pegasus filly slammed her hooves into the ground, planting herself firmly between Terra and Dawn. Don't you dare touch him, she growled, pawing her hoof against the ground as her wings flared. Terra looked at her impassively. It will be over soon. It may be frightening, but you will be free from his thrall once I'm done. Once again, Terra began to advance. No pony is in his thrall, shouted Scootaloo. You cultists are always calling him a monster, but you're the ones going out and hurting ponies. Dawn's helped so many since he came here. He doesn't deserve this. I am sure that he has made you believe that, said Terra, but that matters not to me. I will complete my mission. I am afraid that I will have to be a little rough with you, child. When you return to your senses, I am sure that you will understand. Scootaloo braced herself, preparing to attack. From watching Dawn's fight, she knew it was a futile gesture. Nothing she was capable of would even make some pony like Terra Hart flinch. But she had to do something. She wouldn't be able to live with herself if she just let this stallion come and kill her colt friend without trying to do anything about it. A whistling sound came from above. At the sound, Terra froze, his ears shooting upright. For the third time that day, his instincts told him to dodge or he would be killed. Terra jumped backwards as fast as he could manage. Scootaloo blinked and flinched back as a massive black sword, as long as Ponyville's clock tower was tall, crashed down point first in front of her. The impact threw dust, dirt and stones into the air, but none of them came flying at Scootaloo directly. Had Terra attempted to continue his advance, he would have been impaled by the massive blade. Dawn probably wouldn't be happy with you if he were in a position to express his feelings, said a wry voice from behind. Looking back, Scootaloo's eyes went wide for a moment before she let out a relieved sigh. Arkenstone. However, I cannot fault you for wanting to protect someone so dear to you, continued Arkenstone, giving her a warm, encouraging smile as he approached, moving with a slow, relaxed gait, as though he hadn't just chucked a sword the size of a building like it had been a javelin. As he passed Dawn, Arkenstone paused and smiled down at the colt, gently reaching with his hoof to ruffle Dawn's ragged mane. You did well. I am most impressed by your growth. I would say that Red, Storm, even your master, were he here, would all be very pleased by your accomplishment. While he spoke, the gigantic sword blade began to crumble away, revealing the shaft of a lamppost embedded in the ground. A faint grunt accompanied by a slight twitch of Dawn's body was all the acknowledgement that he was able to give. Arkenstone chuckled. It's all right, rest now, you've done more than your fair share this time. I will take it from here. The only indication Dawn gave that he understood Arkenstone's words was the closing of his eyes as he allowed the last vestiges of his consciousness to slip away. Is he okay? Asked Scootaloo. He will probably need a transfusion of magical energy, most likely from another Pegasus, said Arkenstone. Wing exhaustion is a Pegasus body's response to the overuse of their magic. It forcibly shuts down the flow of power through the meridians to keep any more energy from being lost. However, Dawn overrode his limits. As a consequence, he went well past that point today. If he doesn't receive treatment soon, his meridians might shut down permanently. What should I do? Asked the filly, staring up at Arkenstone with worried eyes. One of the doctors should be able to manage a transfusion from another Pegasus, said Arkenstone. You would be fine as a donor. It isn't like blood types. However, you should get him to Sweet Apple Acres as soon as possible so that can be taken care of. We have time, but not a whole lot of it. Okay, said Scootaloo, bracing herself. Dawn was usually the one who carried her. Now that it was the other way around, she found herself wondering if she could do it. You'll be fine, said Arkenstone. Take him and go. You don't want to be here when we start. I cannot allow that. In front of them, a shadow emerged from the veil of dust that seemed to swirl about the group like a miniature storm. Tara Hart strode through and stood before Arkenstone, glaring balefully at the newcomer. You do not have any say in the matter, said Arkenstone. This foolishness ends here and now. On that, rumbled Tara, we agree. I will put an end to this ridiculous farce myself. We do not agree, said Arkenstone. We have only just met, but I have already had my fill of you. One of his ears swiveled to face towards Scootaloo. Go. Scootaloo nodded and gently levered herself under Dawn's body so that she could lift him onto her back. Giving her wings an experimental flap, she checked to make sure she had full movement before trying to take off. Her first effort was ungainly, but she found that the weight wasn't overwhelming and was soon gaining altitude without jostling her passenger. Applying her magic to steady the flow of air as she moved helped maintain her stability. Tara snarled and took a step to pursue. However, Arkenstone used a forehoof to pry a rock free from the ground. With a flick, he sent it flying like a bullet at Tara. As the stone flew, power crackled around it and it transformed into a sword nearly a meter long, slicing through the air, spinning end over end so quickly that it almost seemed like a circular saw. Tara quickly sidestepped the attack as the sword rushed past him, flying all the way to a gazebo occupying the center of the park. The blade made contact and, despite its relatively small size, cleanly sliced the structure in two. You are like those deluded fools I encountered in town and that inane mare I once called my teacher, growled Tara. Your will is too strong to be twisted by the demon's power, yet you continue to aid him. You are a filthy heretic who deserves death. The only heretic here is you, said Arkenstone, a rumble of anger seeping into his own voice as he started to walk towards Tara. I know who you are, Tara Hart, cardinal of the cult Solar. You have hurt and nearly killed good ponies today. You threatened a child on the basis of a false doctrine, the delusions of ponies long dead and even longer shamed. You are a blight, a twisted perversion of everything that Princess Celestia stands for. As Arkenstone walked, the dust swirling around the two of them began to converge upon the beige stallion. As it approached his skin, the particles of dust seemed to join together, power crackling across as they locked together in something that resembled scales, turning a pitch black color as they adhered themselves to Arkenstone's skin. Bit by bit, piece by piece, it came into shape, the black scales melding together into smooth plates, forming champron, petrol, flanchard, and more. From the top of his head to the tips of his hooves, Arkenstone was completely encased in black armor, decorated by gold highlights consisting of blade-like plates that projected outwards, as though it were forged from the blades of swords meshed together. It appeared as much a weapon in its own right as it did a defense. The plates of the champron almost completely encased Arkenstone's head, even covering his eyes, leaving only his mouth visible as he continued to advance on Tara. Pray, cultist, pray to that twisted bastardization of Princess Celestia you have conjured in that deluded mind of yours. Pray for her mercy. It is my hope that she grants it to you. For you shall receive none from me. Author's notes. I've waited almost 2 years to write those lines. Next chapter, Jeeves, bring me my best opener. I've got a special con for today. A Catastrophe of Two Ponies. Chapter 24, A Catastrophe of Two Ponies. Celestia sighed as she prepared for the next pony to bring their grievances forward. The day court was every bit as tedious as it always was. It was the usual selection of nobles airing petty grievances with each other or with commoners that they believed had slighted them. Occasionally there was something more interesting, like a researcher asking for a grant or a business pony presenting an interesting conundrum. But for the most part, Celestia was forced to play mediator for arguments that ponies seemed unwilling to settle unless she provided the final word on the matter. All of that ended when the doors to the throne room slammed open and a wide-eyed Luna came rushing in at a gallop, a very flustered steward following in her wake, clearly upset about this interruption to the routine. Tia, shouted Luna, look to Ponyville. Celestia shot to her hooves and immediately rushed to find the nearest vantage point that would allow her to view the small town. She had to leave the throne room itself and find a balcony hanging off the side of the castle that overlooked the whole valley. Behind her, her guards closed ranks to keep the audience and petitioners from following her. As she reached the balcony, Celestia looked at the distant town, her eyes trying to discern what had Luna so agitated. At first, it was difficult because the town seemed to be surrounded by a shimmering haze, the likes of which normally occurred during summer heatwaves but were much rarer during Equestria's, intentionally, mild springs. That isn't heat, she realized, it's power. It was the kind of effect that could only be produced by a convergence of pony magic, in enormous quantities. It was power enough to actually disturb the air around the town to such an extent that the light of her sun was warped and bent. Furthermore, the effect was enormous, encompassing the town to such an extent that the effects were visible from here in Canterlot. Under normal circumstances, it would have taken dozens, if not hundreds of magically active ponies to produce such an effect. Silently, she went through her memories. She wouldn't be surprised if this amount of power involved Arkenstone in some way. If anything, he was probably one of the sources for this effect. But even he wouldn't have been able to cause a disturbance this large on his own. That meant that there had to be another pony, at least, who was close to matching him in power. She remembered the intelligence that Cadence had gathered from her interrogations of the captured cult solar members, putting it together with Shining Armor's deductions that whatever the cult was planning would be coming to a head sometime around the middle of spring. What was happening was fairly clear then. Princess, your court, said her steward, who had followed her to the balcony. Is cancelled, said Celestia, cutting him off. This is an emergency situation. Summon Shining Armor at once. It took a few minutes after the steward scrambled off to carry out her orders, but Shining appeared in a flash of rose-colored light right next to her. You called, Your Highness. I am going to Ponyville, said Celestia decisively. I will fly there myself. I'll need 10 minutes to assemble an escort for you, said Shining. You have 5, said Celestia, her tone becoming curt. If they are not ready by then, I will head out myself, with or without assistance. Shining clearly wanted to protest, but he knew that Celestia was more than willing to follow through. The only reason she was willing to wait at all was probably so that the guards would be on hoof to handle the aftermath of whatever was happening in Ponyville at the moment. It will be done, he said, teleporting away in another flash, leaving Celestia to stew and wait. It's no good, said Dr. Stable as he looked up from the storm front's broken body. Under these conditions, the best I can manage is basic first aid. You can't even set their bones? Asked Twilight. Stable frowned and turned his attention back to the 2 mercenary stallions lying on stretchers near the barn's entrance. Not under these circumstances. These aren't simple breaks. I believe there may have been some severe fragmenting from the impact. Even now, bone shards might be perilously close to important veins and arteries. I would need to perform a full-depth scan in order to assess where they are, which isn't possible in an environment like this. Furthermore, I may very well have to use surgery to move them safely. Applejack and Flitter both got a little paler. Flitter looked close to fainting, whilst Applejack was doing her best to keep from grabbing Stable by the collar of his overcoat and shaking him back and forth while demanding he do something. Twilight nodded in understanding. A full-depth scan used magic to map the inside of a pony's body so that it could be examined by imprinting the image resulting from the scan on a photographic plate. However, the scan was susceptible to outside interference, particularly from ambient environmental magical energy. Under these circumstances, Dr. Stable would be lucky if he got anything more than a blurred outline of the patients. As for surgery, while it could be performed in the field, it could only be done very roughly and required a certain degree of training and experience to perform safely. While Dr. Stable was an excellent doctor, he was trained to work in a fully functioning hospital and a clean environment. Wait, thought Twilight, what if I could provide that? In her mind, she carefully began to run through her options. It would be harder, more difficult than even the mass teleport she'd managed a few minutes ago. But she thought it might be just within her means, especially if she was able to appropriately apply her ring to the task. It would be tricky for sure, but she thought she could manage it. I have an idea, she said. We need to clear a space. What are you doing? Asked Stable, looking at Twilight inquisitively. Twilight was already issuing instructions to Applejack, Flitter, the nurses and orderlies, getting them to move supplies and patients out of the way to clear as large a space as was possible around the area near the barn's door. Once that was done, she had Red River and Stormfront move to the center of the space. I'm going to give you what you need, said Twilight in answer to the doctor's question. Pick out the nurses you're going to need for this operation, along with all the supplies you might need. Dr. Stable looked skeptical, but he figured it was better not to doubt Twilight's words. He began to issue orders of his own, having his staff gather all the supplies and tools for a surgical operation. Fortunately, some of that had been brought over from the hospital. Once he was ready, he nodded to Twilight, who fell into a trance of concentration as she began to prepare her magic. Once again, the silvery gold band of the Arcanastial ring emerged at the base of her horn, glowing silver white. This time, Twilight made sure to tap as much of the ring's accumulated energy as possible. It was likely that she would need every ounce of magical power she could spare if she wanted to go through with this. Once again, Twilight used the ring's properties to actualize her magic to create armor. However, the armor, in this case, covered a much larger area than any she'd created in the past. Rather than projecting the armor around herself, she instead projected it to enclose the space around her, the doctor, his staff, as well as Storm and Red. The shape was a basic cube. The parameters were designed to filter out magical, biological, and chemical interference while still providing air to breathe. In the center of the space, she also created a raised rectangle to serve as an operating table. It all took shape just as she envisioned it. As Twilight had expected, trying to cover such a large amount of surface area and enclose an even larger amount of volume with actualized magic was far more difficult than armor that only had to cover a pony's body. It actually didn't drain as much magic as she thought it would. However, as soon as she finished, Twilight noticed that the artificial operating room was already on the verge of becoming undone. If she let her focus falter for even a second, the whole thing would dissolve and they would be right back to square one. If she couldn't keep this up for the duration of the operation itself, things would be even worse if she gave out in the middle of the procedure. Elle can't afford to fail. Remarkable, said Stable, oblivious to Twilight's fragile state. You actually managed to create such a space here. This is perfect. We'll begin at once. He immediately set about getting to work while Twilight put the entirety of her focus into maintaining their shelter against the elements, sweat already beginning to gather on her brow. From the outside, the operating room looked like a strange white block that had been erected right in front of the bar doors. Applejack and Flitter stared in awe at the structure. Do you think they'll be all right? Asked Flitter, glancing nervously at Applejack. I hope so, said Applejack. This ain't exactly my area of expertise. But I think TWI knows what she's doings. We can trust her. A large red figure leaned around the side of the cube. AJ, I'm gonna need her help, said Big Macintosh, waving his sister over. Trying to calm her nerves, Applejack went over to her brother. What's up? She asked. We met Arkenstone in town, said Macintosh. He said he's gonna get in the fight. If he does that, there's gonna be trouble, even though we're all the way out hereabouts. Applejack nodded. What do y'all wanna do about it? We can try evacuating farther away, but we can't move the injured and Twi's in the middle of some real delicate stuff. Macintosh chewed his lip. We ain't going nowhere, but I need every earth pony I can get my hooves on. We're gonna need to try and stand firm and hold this spot in place. Stand firm, exclaimed Applejack, her eyes bulging. I haven't practiced that fair a couple years now. She was embarrassed to admit it, but Applejack had never really taken to Granny Smith's lessons the way Big Macintosh had. She supposed she could do it if she tried hard enough. Even if you didn't practice all that much, it wasn't the sort of skill you forgot. But, I'd be surprised if any pony round these parts actually knows how to do that. It's simple enough, said McIntosh. If I take the lead, I think I can show 'em all how it's done. We need to pool as much every pony's power as we can. Applejack nodded. I'll get Bloom. She's been practicing that a lot after Red taught it to her. That'll be a big help, said McIntosh with a sigh. I can do what I can, but I ain't as good as Granny was. They both sagged for a second. Granny Smith, being the eccentric mare she was prone to wandering off at odd times and returning at even odder times. But under these dire circumstances, there was something terribly ominous about her absence. The two siblings dearly hoped that she was all right. Britain on it ain't gonna get a thing done, said Applejack sharply after a second. We best get to it. McIntosh nodded. And soon, he said, the sense of urgency he'd been feeling increasing as, ever so slightly, the ground beneath their hooves began to tip. The earth groaned. The earth cracked. Deep beneath the ground, things shifted and crumbled. The trees creaked, their wood groaning with strain as though they were beginning to all lean together, all of them leaning towards a single point where two ponies stood silently facing one another. Had any pony been near them, it would have felt as though the world itself had shifted. These two ponies now stood at the center of an abyss, seeming rewrite the laws of physics so that no matter where anything had been in relation to them, where they were now was the direction defined as down. With each successive breath, it seemed more and more like the world itself was being drawn towards them, as though they had become the center of all existence, pulling it inexorably towards them. One of them, a dark brown stallion with a pale green mane, glared at the other with angry gray eyes. With a presence like yours, I had assumed you to be a fellow master. However, if you are borrowing tricks from unicorns and polluting your art with outside concepts, I cannot help but be disappointed, said Terra Hart, Cardinal of the Order of Celestial Light. The stallion across from him was normally a beige color with a dark brown mane. However, said Stallion's body had been covered entirely by plates of black armor with gold highlights. Jagged and blade-like, they gleamed in the afternoon sun, which only served to make their edges look all the sharper. The armored stallion merely smiled at the taunt. Your attitude betrays your ignorance, retorted Arkenstone, Knight of the Dancing Blades. I had thought the cult solar promoted a better understanding of the harmony between the tribes. Terra snorted angrily, the force of his exhalation actually blasting a wave of dust away from the earth. I will not justify your foolishness with anything further, he said, especially since you insult the order so brazenly with that name. Beaten dogs ought not to bark so loudly, said Arkenstone. I was not beaten, snarled Terra, that demon was at my mercy. Perhaps, at the end, said Arkenstone, I admit that he lost the fight. However, for the briefest of moments, he surpassed you, didn't he? Terra stiffened, flinching as the sharp movement agitated the blackened cut seared along his left haunch just beneath his cutie mark. He didn't. But he did, said Arkenstone. It was only an instant, but in that instant, he pierced your defense and managed to leave his mark upon a pony who should have been, by all rights, invulnerable. It was because, in that instant, he actually transcended the limits of body, mind, and spirit and reached the plane of true mastery. Ridiculous, hissed Terra, his breathing quickening. You're lying. Such a thing isn't possible, not for a demon. You're right about that, said Arkenstone, his smile widening. Such a feat is indeed beyond demons. That's what upsets you, isn't it? If you were to actually acknowledge what Dawn Lightwing had done, you would have to acknowledge the truth. Shut up. You would have to admit to yourself that Dawn Lightwing is no demon, that he is a real pony. Shut up. And if you acknowledge that, you would have to acknowledge an even worse truth, the truth that you are here on the basis of a delusion, that everything you had done up to this point, all the harm you'd inflicted, all the pain you'd caused, was in service to a lie. Shut up, roared Terra, his body blurring into motion, his hoof flashing out as he closed the remaining distance between himself and Arkenstone in an instant. Even though Terra was coming straight at him, Arkenstone didn't seem to react. Instead, his tail flicked idly. Around his body, no fewer than 6 ebony blades, their edges outlined in gold, appeared in the air around him. They were visible for the blink of an eye, but accelerated so quickly that they simply seemed to vanish back into thin air as they lanced out to intercept Terra's charge in the space directly in front of Arkenstone, converging on the incoming stallion. This time, Terra made no attempt to dodge the blades, instead, his hoof swung out to meet them directly. In the next instant, the two stallions vanished in an explosion, dust and dirt that rocked the earth around them, sending rippling tremors that made trees sway and groan, made buildings shudder, and shattered windows throughout Ponyville. The impact rocked Ponyville to its foundations. Holy horse apples, sweet Celestas and shaven fetlocks, yelled Applejack, her hat flying off her head as the first of the tremors reached Sweet Apple Acres. AJ, snapped McIntosh, whipping his head around to glare at her. Language. This ain't the time to be prudish. Applejack snapped back, sweat running down her forehead as her hat landed on the ground behind her. We're in deep pig slop now. Biting down on the stalk of grass projecting from his mouth, McIntosh fought back an angry retort. For all that it annoyed him, Applejack was right about the situation. It was bad. They'd rounded up every Earth pony from town, save those that were members of the hospital staff, or hospital patients, for that matter. Even with McIntosh using his magic to help coordinate their efforts, the other Earth ponies, Applejack included, were just too inexperienced to mesh their magic together fully. They'd managed to hold back the first of the tremors, but they could all feel the growing tension in the earth itself. Those two stallions were only just warming up, and once they really started going all out, it would be little different from unleashing an earthquake in the middle of Ponyville. The meager protection that they'd managed to scrape together thus far wasn't going to cut it. This ain't gonna do it, said Applejack, an edge of panic creeping into her voice. What are we gonna do, Mac? Asked a worried Apple Bloom, looking up at her brother. McIntosh sweated as he looked for the words to rally his sisters and the townsponies. Trying to think of what might raise ponies' spirits, he looked towards the one pony who specialized in raising ponies' spirits. Pinkie Pie gave McIntosh an enigmatic smile. It'll be okay, Mackie, she said with an easy grin, reaching over to gently pat Coco Pommel's shoulder as the apprentice designer sweated next to her. That's what my pinky sense tells me. Beside her, a worried Mayweather simply stared straight at the town, her bright yellow coat looking strangely pale. It sure is shootin' is gonna be okay, called a familiar voice, drawing every pony's attention as a wrinkled green mare strode confidently into her midst. I didn't raise no quitters, and I know this town ain't gonna quit on us either. Granny, cried Applejack and Bloom in unison. Where've ya been? Demanded Macintosh. None, oh Guff, said Smith curtly, giving Macintosh a sly smile, we've got a job to do. Granny Smith paused to take a deep breath before booming out in an authoritative voice. Listen up Everypony, cuz I'm only gonna say this once. Once she was sure she had every pony's attention, Granny smiled and continued at a more reasonable volume. If we're gonna hold back these tremors, we're gonna have to think like trees. Our magic is like roots, y'all sink 'em into the earth and hold fast. She looked around, smiling at the assembled earth ponies. I know a lot, oh y'all are worried. Y'ave got homes, y'ave got things y'all value. I'll be honest, they probably ain't gonna come through this in one piece. But what matters is already out here with us, the ponies we love, our neighbors, our friends, our families. If we don't protect them, then it ain't gonna matter if a single plank or nail survives back in town. We ain't got time to worry about that, y'all need to focus on what needs protectin'. Taking another deep breath, Smith gave one last encouraging smile to the ponies around her. Now it's time to do this here thing. I'll show y'all how. Stepping into the center of the group, Smith closed her eyes and reached out. Every earth pony felt her presence. It reached down into the earth like a massive taproot, sending out smaller roots off to each side, meshing together with the power of other earth ponies. She drew them together and wove their power into a network that spread across the entire farm. Together, the earth ponies sank their will into the earth. Together, they held firm, which was just as well, because the battle outside of Sweet Apple Acres was picking up steam. Terra's hoof met Arkenstone's blades, which crossed together right in front of him. Shifting his posture, Terra changed the angle of contact so that his hoof collided with the flat of one of the blades, knocking it into the other blades and sending them off course. The blades bit into the earth, splitting the ground, cutting lines through dirt and stone that went on to slice nearby trees in two. His first obstacle out of the way, Terra surged forward through the cloud of dust created, his hooves feeling the presence of his enemy in contact with the ground. He slammed his attacking hoof down into the ground, focusing the force of impact up from all four of his hooves and channeling it along his spine before directing it out his shoulder as he slammed that part of his body into the area where he knew Arkenstone was. Arkenstone met Terra's attack head-on, colliding his armored shoulder with Terra's unarmored one. The jagged edges of his armor bit into Terra's skin, in spite of the magical reinforcement Terra was using on his flesh. However, the surge of kinetic energy rushing out from Terra's attack met Arkenstone's and pushed the bladed edges of the armor away. Arkenstone shouldered the full impact of the blow with his armor. His hooves dug into the ground and a shockwave seemed to blast out behind him, ripping apart the ground, including one of the cobblestone paths through the park, toppling a couple of lampposts as well. Arkenstone took a deep breath, sounding almost relaxed, in spite of the fight's intensity. Lifting up one forehoof, he slammed it back down into the ground. Terra's instincts gave him the briefest of warnings as he leapt back. Where he had been standing were countless rocks and pebbles, the remnants of the larger pieces of stone that had been underneath the two earth ponies and had been shattered in that last exchange. A thicket of black blades erupted upwards, practically filling the space that Terra had been occupying, throwing more dust into the air as they went. Terra backpedaled frantically away from the attack. Arkenstone barreled through the seemingly solid mass of blades, shattering them like they were made of cheap glass. The fragments of those blades seemed to mix and mingle with the dust already in the air, drawing it into themselves before growing and extending into new blades that then seemed to leap of their own accord towards Terra, flying point first like spears. With a growl, Terra planted all four hooves into the ground, embedding them into the earth nearly all the way up to his fetlocks. Drawing in as much power as he could, he lunged forward to meet the attack head-on. Rearing up on his hind hooves, he used his forelegs to bat away the incoming projectiles, often breaking them to pieces in the process, aiming for the flats of the blades to avoid cutting himself on the edges that he knew would be able to bite into him, even with how much power he had already drawn into himself. He wasn't quite fast enough. Terra had focused his attention on the blades coming straight at him. However, there were others coming at him from outside angles. They weren't as dangerous since they weren't at risk of hitting any of his vital points, so Terra prioritized them less than the blades that were coming straight at him. The ultimate consequence was that a small number of blades cut into his flesh, striking glancing blows that sent thin ribbons of blood dancing through the air. Having escaped the barrage, Terra dropped, slamming his forehooves into the ground with earth-shaking force and bracing himself as Arkenstone closed in. Terra's eyes widened when he saw that Arkenstone was wielding yet another sword in his hoof, this one twice as long as either of them. He brought it straight down in a single stroke that nearly cut Terra in two. However, Terra managed to avoid the attack by leaping to the side at the last possible second. He actually felt the blade's edge clip a few hairs from the ends of his tail and saw the cut actually extend past the reach of the actual blade out of the corner of his eye. The cut drew a line across the ground, reaching all the way to one of the park's public restrooms and splitting it apart. Lifting the blade up out of the ground, Arkenstone swept it sideways at his opponent. Terra danced back, his body skipping across the ground like a stone off the surface of a pond, taking him well out of the way of the sword's stroke. However, Arkenstone simply reversed the motion of his swing and released the giant sword, flinging it straight at the dark brown stallion, who dropped his body to avoid being impaled and then grunted as the sword cut a line down the entire length of his body in its passing. The sword continued its flight, slamming tip first into the ground outside the park and digging a long, narrow trench. Terra went back on the offensive. As quickly as he'd retreated, he now advanced at an angle, actually cutting across in front of Arkenstone, who had been expecting Terra to come straight at him. For a moment, Arkenstone paused as his nose and ears tried to regain their fix on his enemy. However, Terra didn't give him the time he needed. Once again, Terra slammed his forehooves down, this time channeling the entirety of the motion's power through his body, putting every single muscle along with way into the motion to further magnify the attack's power as he kicked out with his hind legs in a terrific buck. His hooves slammed right into Arkenstone's side, heedless of the blade-like edges of the blind stallion's armor. The focused force of the strike shattered those edges along with the armor itself upon contact. Arkenstone's armor seemed to break apart like brittle fragments of eggshell as he himself was thrown through the air on a path which paralleled that of the sword he had just thrown. Luckily, the side of his body that hadn't been damaged by Terra's attack was what came down when Arkenstone hit the ground, the unbroken armor breaking off and seeming to strip away as Arkenstone bounced into a roll, managing to twist his body so that he was facing back the way he came, sinking into a crouch. As Arkenstone had expected, Terra had immediately turned in pursuit, coming hard on the heels of his own strike as he closed the distance between them with blinding speed. Terra's eyes widened as he closed. The dust that had been thrown up by Arkenstone's landing was coalescing about the blind stallion's beige body, surrounding it with black and gold again as Arkenstone's armor reformed before his very eyes. Arkenstone met Terra's next attack head-on, slamming his champion into Terra's unarmored head even as all four of Terra's hooves smacked the ground in unison, channeling all that force into the most powerful strike a practitioner of the mountain route could bring to bear. On certain levels, a pony's body was unsuited to the martial arts, particularly hoof-to-hoof combat, in sometimes unexpected ways. Quadrupeds faced challenges that were not an issue to bipedal species, like minotaurs. When a biped punched or attacked with its arms, it still had both its legs on the ground. While, to some, that would be a naturally unsteady posture, for bipeds, it presented no real issue at the basic level. The fact was, a biped could strike without sacrificing the base stability of their stance. However, for quadrupeds, like ponies, who spent their lives upon four legs, their posture led to different problems. Lifting one's hoof to strike meant that the attacking pony had one less hoof to stand on and had, as a consequence, weakened their stance. A pony rearing up to strike with both of her forehooves or turning around to buck with both of her back legs weakened her stance even further. If she took an attack from an unexpected angle while in such a position, she was easily at risk of being thrown off her hooves. Furthermore, for martial arts like the mountain route, where power was drawn from contact with the ground, lifting one or more legs to attack meant reducing the number of points in contact with the ground, which meant that a certain amount of power was lost from the overall attack. Depending on the technique being used, part of that power could be made up by the motion of the technique itself, such as for a perfectly executed buck, but that would not match the power that might be generated if a pony could somehow paradoxically execute a buck without breaking her rear hooves contact with the ground. The second advantage that bipeds had over quadrupeds in martial arts was in the generation and transference of power. Bipeds augmented the power of their forelimb strikes by rotating their body and using the spine as a fulcrum, adding centrifugal force to the strike. For ponies, such a motion was awkward and ran counter to their natural posture. The ponies who could execute such techniques were primarily limited to pegasi, who could perform what would normally be an almost impossible motion thanks to their ability to freely alter their orientation via flight. However, for most other ponies, power was instead transmitted along the length of the spine, which was the secret to a particularly powerful buck or Terrahart's shoulder strike. The former was still burdened by the fact that two hooves were no longer in contact with the ground. The latter required that the energy of the attacking pony be diverted at a slight angle in order to channel it out the shoulder. Either way, some of the power of the technique ultimately went to waste. However, the ultimate strike of the mountain route, affecting the rather underwhelming name of the 4-point strike, addressed both of those issues. In the school of the mountain route, it was often the final technique taught to the art students, not because of its incredible destructive potential, but rather because it was a double-edged sword that required a full understanding of the fundamentals of the mountain route itself in order to execute safely. Done incorrectly, the technique was just as capable of killing the wielder as it was the wielder's enemy. The first issue was addressed by altering how the attacker struck. Rather than lifting a hoof off the ground, the attacker instead stepped down with all four hooves simultaneously, putting the full power of all four of her legs into the motion. Because of that, the full power of the user's capability was channeled into the strike itself, with none being lost to a lack of stability. The second issue was addressed by not offsetting the point of impact. Rather than shifting the flow of power off to the shoulder, the user instead channeled it out through the one extremity that had the dual qualities of being perfectly in line with the spine and not being used to support the attacking pony's stance. The head. Thus, the 4-point strike was, in appearance, a slightly unorthodox headbutt. However, it was a technique designed to channel the full destructive potential of a pony's body, along with all their magic, into a single strike. Once again, Arkenstone's armor, which had only partially reformed, shattered under the force of Terra's attack, skin of Arkenstone's head meeting Terra's own as Terra's strike broke through the armor unimpeded. A ripple went along the armor forming along Arkenstone's body, causing it to break apart once more. The plates settling across his haunches blasted into scattering fragments that sprayed out behind Arkenstone in a hail of shrapnel. The barrage of fragments tore into a row of houses just behind the knight, shredding walls into pieces and bringing some of those houses down with an ear-splitting crash. Arkenstone's eyes opened slightly, giving Terra's gray eyes a view of his featureless white orbs. However, in Terra's peripheral vision, he saw the fragments of armor that had been forming over Arkenstone's shoulders, which had been broken back into a black dust by the impact of the attack, turn into twin black whirlwinds that then extended into a new array of spinning blades that now slashed at Terra from either side, threatening to sever his head. Terra pulled back, barely managing to yank his head out of the way as the blades meshed together like the teeth of a pair of gears between him and Arkenstone. Once again, the line of the cuts extended far beyond the edges of the blades, gouging new lines in the earth, forming an X-shaped mark in the ground between Terra and Arkenstone. "Wah, what?" gasped Terra, staring in shock at his opponent. That blow should have completely smashed Arkenstone's skull. Instead, Arkenstone didn't even look dazed. A cut had opened on his forehead and was now bleeding down his face, but that was the extent of the damage. "My version of reap what you sow," replied Arkenstone with a smirk as the blades crumbled back into dust. Already, his armor was reforming yet again. "It's good for you that you struck before I'd finished rebuilding my armor, or you would have received the full force of your strike in return." Terra, unwilling to let his adversary get the upper hoof, surged forward, determined to keep Arkenstone from reforming his armor completely. Once again, all four of his hooves hit the ground as he thrust his head towards Arkenstone again. Instead of meeting him head-on, Arkenstone instead sidestepped the strike. Terra turned to attack again and Arkenstone turned with him, circling around each other until they had switched positions. Arkenstone slammed his armored hooves into the ground, throwing up a spray of dirt and stone. His power surged through the debris, which suddenly became a literal wall of swords that then seemed to surge upwards and collapse over Terra like a wave. Terra threw himself away from the barrage of swords, jumping backwards. From behind the blades, Arkenstone swiped his hoof along their hilts, the action sending them surging after Terra in an action that was eerily reminiscent of water cascading over the ground. Terra fell back, swatting the swords away when he had to. The literal tide of weapons forced him back into the ruins of the first house that had been torn apart in the aftermath of the previous exchange. The blades hacked through what remained of the walls, gouging out chunks of wood and slicing through supports. The remainder of the house began to collapse. To Terra's slowly growing horror, the attack didn't end there, as the fragments of the house now buzzing through the air like angry hornets crackled with the power of Arkenstone's magic and became blades as well. From the collapsing walls and ceilings, still more swords emerged, all of them thrusting at Terra as he continued to backpedal away from the onslaught. Desperately, Terra threw himself out through the wall, only to find that the debris that had been thrown into the air as a consequence of the house's collapse had now become blades as well, plummeting towards him in a rain of swords. Unable to do much else, Terra threw himself into the next house along the line and saw the cycle repeat itself over again as the swords created from the pieces of the previous house cut into and through the next house, turning the pieces of the second house into swords as well. It was horrifying. Terra, initially disdainful of Arkenstone for having turned to magical concepts from other tribes, had never conceived that an earth pony could fight in such a fashion. Arkenstone's power was like a malevolent virus, spreading across the battlefield. Everything it infected became a new sword for Arkenstone to throw at him, each one humming with intense, focused killing intent, as sharply honed as the edges of the blades themselves. Every one of them was capable of piercing the magical reinforcement of Terra's body and biting into his flesh. Some spun end over end through the air, others hurtled themselves at him like arrows and spears. The chain of attacks seemed unending as it chased Terra through one house and then another. How can he be so powerful? Marveled Terra. Finally, he found an escape, throwing himself into the street and out of the seemingly endless line of attacks, leaving what remained of the houses he and Arkenstone had just torn through to collapse in on themselves. The blades dissolved into useless fragments as well. However, Terra found no respite. Even as he had been evading Arkenstone's continuous attack, Arkenstone himself had been pursuing by running down the street that ran parallel along the row of houses. When Terra emerged out into the street, Arkenstone was already there. At some point he had ripped a post from a white picket fence around one of the yards. Inhaling sharply, Arkenstone seemed to take in the object's scent before power crackled around it. The fence post became yet another massive blade that Arkenstone swung sideways at Terra. Rather than avoid the blade, Terra closed in, stepping inside the radius of the swing and catching Arkenstone's arm with one foreleg. The jagged edges of the armor bit into Terra's skin, but didn't cut deep. Terra slammed his shoulder into Arkenstone's chest and kicked off his remaining hooves, launching the two of them across the street and into one of the houses the other side, breaking down the wall beside the door. Arkenstone hit first. This time, however, his armor did not break upon impact. They hit the floor, Arkenstone back first with Terra on top, already raising his hooves to press the attack, actually intending to pummel Arkenstone with rain of stomping strikes with all four of his hooves. Arkenstone didn't give Terra the chance, kicking upwards with all four hooves. They slammed into Terra's barrel, impacting his ribs and stomach. The force of the attack propelled Terra upwards, sending him flying through the ceiling of the first story, then the second story, through the attic, and finally, through the roof of the house itself. Terra turned his motion into a graceful backflip. Angling himself so that he was facing straight down, he kicked out with his back legs, seeming to push off of the air itself. He accelerated drastically downwards, following almost the exact same path down that he had taken up. His hooves crashed through the roof, then the floors of the house, further widening the holes he'd made during his ascent, as he descended back down towards Arkenstone, who was still on the first floor of the house. Arkenstone had already created yet another array of blades, angled upward. Whether he had been planning on firing them up after Terra or had been waiting for Terra to come back down was unknown. However, Terra's sudden descent didn't seem to disrupt Arkenstone's movements in the slightest as the blades themselves lunged forward to meet the descending Terra. The entire house exploded outwards from the impact of the two stallions meeting, taking out the walls of the houses adjacent to it. From the center of the explosion emerged what seemed to be a miniature hurricane as Terra Hart and Arkenstone continued their fight, this time at close range as they exchanged flurries of strikes and blocks. This close in, Arkenstone had no room to bring his swords into play as Terra kept the fight close, knowing that allowing any opening to form between them would be fatal. However, Arkenstone made no attempt to disengage from infighting and met Terra, hoof for armored hoof. Scootaloo grimaced and grit her teeth as she fought to maintain altitude. She'd figured it wouldn't be too bad to carry Dawn. He'd carried her plenty of times in the past. However, as she flew, she grew conscious of one very important fact. Dawn was heavy. She supposed it was a consequence of his continuous training having developed some very dense musculature. It made sense, but that didn't change the fact that it was difficult to remain steady while trying to balance the burden of the unconscious colt on her back. Still, she was almost there. Once she reached Sweet Apple Acres, she wouldn't have to worry about carrying him anymore and could actually worry more about helping him. He still needed that magic transfusion to boost his internal reserves. Looking down, Scootaloo noticed a purple and green figure making his way down the path to the farm. Spike, what's he doing out here? He should be at the farm already. Much as she wanted to fly down and satisfy her curiosity, Scootaloo remained focused on her primary task and carried on towards Sweet Apple Acres and the barn that was being used to house the patients from the hospital. It made sense to go there after all. Dawn would probably be hanging out in the hospital, again, when all was said and done. Landing was a tricky task. The extra weight of Dawn's body made it hard to work out how much effort she needed to put into slowing down before her hooves hit the ground. Scootaloo stumbled as she touched down, but managed to avoid going into a tumble and kept Dawn safe on her back. Please, she shouted, seeing some nurses already coming out to meet her, help. Author's notes. Next chapter, the bottle's epic conclusion. The Raising. Chapter 25, The Raising. Huffing and blowing, Spike finally passed through Sweet Apple Acres gate. It had been a hard run for the young dragon. His forelegs weren't yet quite developed enough to allow him to run on all fours, but his body was starting to get rather top-heavy, which made retaining his balance while running a tricky business. It didn't help that he'd barely gotten outside of Ponyville itself when the ground had begun to shake and jump beneath his claws. He thought that the fight had ended from the temporary silence that had descended just as he'd left the library. However, the fighting had started up again, this time even more intense than before. That must be Arkenstone, thought Spike as he ran. He hoped that Twilight's colt friend could handle things, or at least buy time until other ponies who could handle the situation had arrived. Spike had gotten so caught up in finding Aurano's feathers to send a letter to Spitfire, he'd temporarily forgotten that he should have sent a letter to Princess Celestia as well. However, he'd barely gotten halfway to Sweet Apple Acres when he belched out a letter from the princess saying that she was on her way. That was reassuring, though not quite reassuring enough. Even flying directly from Canterlot was going to take some time, an hour or more at the very least. Depending on how things went, the battle could be well over, for better or for worse, by the time Celestia arrived. Right now, he could only hope that Arkenstone would win the fight. Can you hurry up? Demanded Scootaloo, her wings buzzing with anxiety as she watched the nurse checking over Dawn. If you can't be patient and wait, I'll need you to step outside, snapped Nurse Triage as she continued to carefully feel along Dawn's body with her hooves. The colt was still alive but clearly unconscious. What troubled her was that there seemed to be no visible response to any external stimuli, even involuntary ones. It worried Triage as this was closer to a coma than simple unconsciousness. You said he needed a transfusion, remarked Triage, looking up at Scootaloo finally. Nodding frantically, Scootaloo said, that's right. That's what Arkenstone said. He said this is even worse than wing exhaustion. That matches up, mused Triage. This might be a little tricky. Can you do it? Asked Scootaloo. I think I can, said Triage. It's a fairly simple spell. But to be honest, I'd trust the doctor more. It's not something I've had any practice with. Most ponies aren't even capable of pushing their bodies to this extent. I've only learned about the spell in theory. I've never actually had to use it. Then what about the doctor? Asked Scootaloo. He's occupied, said Triage, glancing inside the barn at the white cube where Dr. Stable was currently trying his hardest to save Red River and Stormfront after their encounter with Tara Hart. Then you're the only pony we've got, said Scootaloo, tears welling up at her eyes as she gazed pleadingly at the nurse. Please. Dawn can't stay like this for too long. All right, said Triage in as placating a tone as she could manage, I'll do it. Taking a deep breath, she steadied herself. Okay, this is a bit tricky. I need you to stand above Dawn. Nodding, Scootaloo did as she was told. Dawn was currently lying on his back, his wings spread out beneath him. Standing over him, Scootaloo took a deep breath and looked down at her cold friend's unmoving body. Okay, Dodd, now what? This is the tricky part, said Triage. I need you to lower yourself down so that you can touch your wings to his. The outlets and inlets for Pegasus Meridians are located along the wings. I'll need to have you channel your magic out of your wings while I guide it down into his. We need to be careful because Dawn has other injuries. Don't put any pressure on his chest. Slowly, Scootaloo bent her legs down, lowering her body as much as she dared. She felt the hair of her coat brushing against Dawn's coat and stopped. Moving slowly, she lowered her wings and rested as much of them as she could against Dawn's. All right, she said, I'm ready. Triage swallowed and nodded. Okay, good, hold it there. I'm starting the spell now. Her horn glowed and her magical aura washed over Scootaloo's wings before stretching across to Dawn's wings as well. Connection established. Start channeling your magic now. Scootaloo did as she was told, taking a deep breath and reaching out with her magic, sending it out through her wings. Instead of blending into the air around her, she instead felt the magic begin to flow away from her wings, being pulled away like water down the drain. The pull was incredibly strong and Scootaloo could feel every ounce of magic she released being sucked down into Dawn's wings. She began to sweat as more and more of her magic was being taken. Just how much did he use? Done, said Triage. The magical connection vanished and Scootaloo sighed in relief as the force that had been siphoning her magic away vanished. Carefully, she stepped off from Dawn, feeling lightheaded and dizzy. Easy now, said Triage, coming to Scootaloo's side and supporting her. Lay down and don't try to move for a bit. Okay, Scootaloo felt a bit hazy. Lying down sounded like a good idea. Rest for a little bit. I need to see to the rest of Dawn's injuries, said Triage. "Okay," said Scootaloo, her eyes drooping as she watched Triage turn her attention back to the colt. Arkenstone and Tara Hart tore a swath of destruction through Ponyville. Even though the two stallions fought hoof to hoof, clashing against one another in a fierce melee, their movement across the town sent them tearing heedlessly through buildings, smashing through wood and plaster with contemptuous ease. A hoof stamped down, cracking the ground and causing a nearby house to collapse. A deflected blow released a shockwave that tore up a line of fencing. A razor-edged sword, moving so swiftly that it might as well have been invisible, sliced through a lamppost. The path left behind by the two battling stallions was covered by rubble. The air around them was choked with dust. The ground was littered with cracks and crevasses opened by the immense force of their hoof steps. Even though they were fighting just as fiercely as they had in the beginning, the battle was beginning to take its toll. Tara's body was covered by numerous cuts and lacerations, many of which leaked blood that scattered in scarlet ribbons around his body as he moved. The worst of these wounds was an ugly, black line across his hindquarter, running directly beneath his cutie mark. It was deeper than any of the other cuts on his body. However, fortunately for him, the cut was also cauterized, which kept it from bleeding as Tara moved. But the injury still ached fiercely and Tara had to resist the urge to grunt in pain every time he put his hind leg down wrong. His forelegs were also in bad shape. Trading blows with Arkenstone's hard armor, which sported numerous sharp edges, had left Tara's forelegs crisscrossed with numerous cuts and several severe bruises as well. Though the magical reinforcement of Tara's body kept the edges from cutting too deeply, it still left his forelegs sore and covered with blood. Arkenstone's injuries were less readily visible. Though his armor ablated most of the force of Tara's strikes, it wasn't always a perfect form of protection. As a result, some of the impact of Tara's blows had made it through. Though it didn't show on the outside, Arkenstone's skeleton sported numerous small fractures through his bones that sent jolts of pain through his body with each step he took. With each successive blow he took, the network of cracks through Arkenstone's bones spread a little farther as he used the entirety of his own body to disperse the remainder of the impact, which kept any of his bones from outright breaking, but left him feeling a little more fragile with each subsequent exchange. On top of that, he was sporting a nasty headache courtesy of the headbutt he'd taken from Tara earlier. Tara kept the fight close, clearly intending to keep Arkenstone from using his blades by keeping the battle hoof to hoof. However, Arkenstone wasn't going to abide by that plan. Instead, as they crashed through the side of another building, Arkenstone channeled his magic through the splinters of wood that flew through the air, transforming them into swords directly behind Tara, slashing at his croup and haunches. Tara bucked out with his hind legs, breaking the swords before they could actually cut into him. However, Arkenstone surged forward, ramming an armored shoulder into Tara's chest. The impact sent Tara skidding back, but he reacted almost immediately, slamming his own hooves down and coming right back at Arkenstone's body. Arkenstone planted his hooves into the wooden floor, using the jagged edges of his greaves to anchor him into place as he took the force of Tara's return shoulder strike. The force of the collision between the two of them shattered the floor, causing it to crater around them. The armor covering Arkenstone's body shattered at the point of impact. However, the fragments of broken armor quickly dissolved into a black dust as Arkenstone reached out with his forehoof, curling the fetlock around the dust which had formed itself into the handle and hilt of a massive sword. Swinging, Arkenstone brought the sword down at Terra, who skipped to the side of the blow, which then went on to cut a line through the remainder of the house. Having avoided the strike, Terra surged in once again, aiming to crush Arkenstone before he could rebuild his armor. However, the fragments of wood thrown up by Arkenstone's attack also became swords which tumbled towards Terra from a variety of angles. This time, rather than try to stop and deflect them, Terra bowled right through the blades, crushing the ones directly in front of him and suffering only glancing blows from the rest. Arkenstone clicked his tongue in frustration now that it was his turn to fall back from a flurry of strikes. He's beginning to figure it out. Arkenstone's magic was based on scent. Scent is produced by particles that are inhaled through the nose, particles that are first carried through the air. By using those particles as a medium, Arkenstone could connect them like the links of a chain, sending his magic into objects connected to that scent. The magic then manifested thanks to the strong image Arkenstone carried inside his mind and will, transforming those objects into blades that struck out at his enemies. The items he normally based that magic on were pine needles which he carried concealed in the hairs of his tail. The needles had the advantage of being quite fragrant, light enough to be carried by a decent wind, as blades he could control them freely, almost as an extension of his will. Furthermore, when those blades struck outwards, they spread the pine needles scent along with them, spreading the scent into anything they cut into. That spreading scent created even more connections, allowing Arkenstone to form even more blades from the objects broken apart by the original swords. On top of that, Arkenstone could channel his magic into objects directly by grasping or touching them. The larger the object, the larger a blade he could manifest. To Arkenstone, the resulting blades, while massive, carried no more weight than the object that originally formed them, while, to his opponents, the blades struck with the power and weight of their apparent size. However, the technique had its limitations. The heavier the object used as the basis for the sword, the harder it was to manipulate. Pine needles, tiny pebbles, and small splinters were fine, but simple rocks and fragments of wood and plaster were almost impossible to control remotely using his magic. The most Arkenstone could generally do was modify their trajectory slightly and induce extra acceleration. The resulting blades might have been more powerful, but the trade-off was that he couldn't manipulate them at the same level he could the smaller and lighter ones. Terra had apparently realized that. He now understood that, if he knew the basic trajectory of Arkenstone's blades, then he could anticipate their attacks and either intercept or avoid them more effectively, thus eliminating the need to divide his attention to keep track of the individual blades. With that out of the way, he could make his primary focus avoiding and parrying the blades Arkenstone had more control over and chipping away at Arkenstone's armor. However, there was another tool in Arkenstone's arsenal, the dust. Composed of fine particles drifting in the air, the dust was practically a ready-made medium for Arkenstone's magic. Able to serve as the base for weapons as well as the connection needed to manipulate them, it was an almost endlessly versatile tool. The issue was the majority of it went into the fashioning of his armor. To make matters more difficult, what extra remained in the air was frequently dispersed by the shockwaves of their continuing clashes. Terra had noted this and clashed with Arkenstone as often as possible to keep him from amassing enough dust to create any substantial weapons. It also served to slow the rate at which Arkenstone could restore his armor when it was broken. I may have played my cards a bit early, mused Arkenstone as he spun about, whipping his tail at Terra. The armor across his croup extended out along his tail, forming something like a bladed chain. Terra was forced to duck before the whip-like motion of the weapon beheaded him. Arkenstone whipped his tail about more, sending the weapon slashing about in unpredictable movements that drove Terra back. Meanwhile, Terra grit his teeth in frustration as he retreated from this latest fusillade of blows, forced to jump, skip, and twist to keep from getting tangled in the bladed segments. He had never faced an enemy who fought the way Arkenstone did, much less an earth pony who wielded the magic of their kind in such a fashion. In the past, Terra had fought and beaten earth ponies, Pegasi, and unicorns. He had faced numerous lesser martial arts and endured the absolute pinnacle of battle magic. In spite of his teacher's warnings, he had yet to meet any foe whose power could match that of the mountain root. All of his experience had taught him that, compared to the might of the purest expression of earth pony magic, anything else fell short. Harmony between the tribes was all well and good, but, as far as Terra was concerned, that extended merely to social affairs. When it came to practicing magic, it was best that each tribe stuck to what they did best. Trying to incorporate concepts and ideas from other forms of magic simply muddied things and reduced a given magic's overall effectiveness. It was the same with weapons. Depending on an object for attack and defense instead of the strength of one's own body, will, and magic was essentially an admission of weakness. At their base, weapons were lifeless steel and wood. Their strength was arbitrary, going only so far as the materials they were composed of, while a pony's body was capable of endless improvement. In the end, weapons and foreign magical concepts were both crutches, gimmicks that ultimately weakened those who relied upon them. And yet, Arkenstone was different. He used his magic to bind the matter around him. His armor was a powerful protection, yes, but it was more than a mere defense. In his strongest state, Arkenstone literally cloaked himself in his own power, hardening and sharpening his body into a living weapon. The blades he struck with, even the ones that he couldn't control and manipulate directly, all carried the full weight of his killing intent, each one capable of biting into even Terra's reinforced flesh. When the fight between them had begun, Terra had expected Arkenstone's blades to be easily broken and blocked, only to find out that they were infinitely more formidable and that Arkenstone was stronger than any enemy he had ever faced before. What made matters even worse for Terra was the reason behind their fight. Arkenstone was fighting to protect Dawn Lightwing, a demon, the servant of Nightmare Moon, who openly bore the mark of his true nature in his eyes. Even though Arkenstone was blind, a warrior of his caliber couldn't have possibly been unaware of Dawn Lightwing's true nature. However, he still fought in defense of the Colt, attacking with an unrivaled ferocity, his blades seeking to pierce and carve the flesh of one who had come to bring justice and deliverance to Ponyville. Terra stood on the side of right. The will of her radiance, stewardess of the sun, and mother of all was behind his cause. That knowledge filled him with a boundless fervor that drove him on. His will did not falter. He could not be swayed from his course. In the end, the rightness of his cause would see him through to the end of this grim endeavor. And yet, his foe still stood before him, taking Terra's blows and striking back in equal measure, his fervor seeming to rival Terra's own. To make matters worse, Terra's body had been marred by the demon's power. The cut burned beneath his cutie mark ached and stung with every movement, reminding Tara with every pang that Dawn Lightwing had struck and wounded him, even though such a thing should have been impossible. Every sting of that wound reminded him of Arkenstone's taunts at the beginning of the battle. I will not give in, thought Tara resolutely. I will see this task through to the end. I will return to the Holy Father with victory in hoof. Then, together, we will see nightmare moons will purge from this world once and for all. Blades flashed, hooves clashed. Armor rang, cracked and crumbled. Again and again, the two stallions clashed together, one driving the other back for a brief moment before he rallied and returned to the battle. Their battle seemed to meander all across Ponyville. Any object or structure in their path was ripped apart. The force of their blows sundered the earth, opening cracks, collapsing entire buildings dozens of meters away. The whole of Ponyville rocked and trembled as though shaken by a continuous earthquake. With each second, every minute the battle progressed, the shockwaves spread farther and farther, spreading throughout the surrounding countryside. In the Whitetail Woods, deer and other animals fled. Even in the mysterious Everfree Forest, the monstrous creatures that called it home fell back away from its edge, their instincts telling them that straying too close to the mysterious disturbance in Ponyville spelled death. Amid all this turbulence, there was a single place that remained stable and undisturbed. Held fast by the power of all Ponyville's available Earth ponies, Sweet Apple Acres remained an island of peace during this troubled time. Applejack sweated and panted. She'd never drawn this deeply upon her innate Earth pony magic, never tied or bound herself so tightly to the earth, feeling as though she'd taken root like a tree herself. Her body was getting stiffer with each passing second. She wasn't the only one. All the Earth ponies around her were showing signs of strain as the battle in town dragged on. The growing pressure in the earth was a mounting threat that only grew with each passing moment. Her mind found it almost impossible to grasp the notion that it was two individual stallions fighting one another. It had a feeling more like a cataclysm than a brawl. A wry chuckle wormed its way out of her lips as she remembered all the stories Granny Smith used to tell her and Macintosh when they were little, stories about the Celestial Knights. They were stories of ponies that could take on entire armies by themselves and win, ponies that could split open mountains, ponies that could set the sky on fire. Applejack had always felt that such stories were mere products of fantasy. Even when meeting Arkenstone and learning that he actually was one of those legendary knights, Applejack couldn't reconcile the image of the polite, soft-spoken stallion with the image the stories inspired. But now she understood that the stories of the knight's capabilities were a surprisingly sober truth. Applejack couldn't afford to lose focus, so she kept her eyes glued to her own hooves as she continued to force herself to breathe, drawing the power of the earth into herself, shaping it with her will and sending it back out, binding her power with that of all the other ponies doing the same. Together, they held back the unrelenting pressure of Arkenstone and Tara's battle. Had Applejack or any of the others looked up from their task for a moment, they would have seen something that would have inspired awe and dread in equal measure. In the center of their group stood Granny Smith. However, few would have been able to equate the mare who stood there now with the doddering old mare who was often seen puttering about the farm or around town. Smith's wrinkled skin had smoothed, the lines around her body fading as she seemed to lose entire decades worth of age in a few minutes, her youth seeming to return the more of her power she exercised. However, it was also something of a disturbing sight. For all that Smith looked newly youthful, there was a sense of wrongness about it. Her skin was smooth, but it was drawn tightly about a body of bone and not much else. It gave Granny Smith a gaunt, stretched-out appearance, the look of a starved pony. Her ribs stood out starkly on her barrel. The bones of her legs were clearly visible. The musculature that had once filled out her youthful appearance seemed to have withered away. As a consequence, Granny Smith looked more dead than alive, despite seeming to be young again. However, no pony looked and no pony noticed, which was the way it should have been, as far as Smith was concerned. Arkenstone winced internally as their battle took them through yet another building. However, the smells of sugar, yeast, and flour that reached his nose told him that they had just plowed right through the middle of Sugarcube Corner. Sorry, Pinky. They crashed through the wall of a storeroom. Arkenstone's nose picked up the smell of flour all the more intently. He called forth a sextet of swords, feeling Tara tense in preparation to stop them. However, instead of attacking Tara, Arkenstone instead launched the swords at the bags of flour heaped around them. The swords sliced open the bag and scattered the flour through the air, filling the entire space with white dust. Tara paused, hesitating in confusion. That gave Arkenstone just enough time as he completely sealed his armor for a second, covering nose and mouth, sealing all the joints. For just a moment, Arkenstone's body became like a statue, unmoving. One of the blades scraped against a metal surface, sending up a few sparks. What remained of the Sugarcube Corner was consumed by a fiery explosion. Heat and flames washed over the two stallions. Tara hardly even noticed them, his magic easily resisting the heat and concussive forces of the detonation. Arkenstone's blows had carried more force than that. However, as Tara prepared to mount a counterattack, he realized that the explosion had done something he hadn't noticed before. It had consumed all the oxygen in his immediate vicinity. The consequences would last only a few seconds. However, for those few seconds, Tara was unable to breathe. Unable to draw in air, he simply couldn't continue to draw in the earth's power. He faltered. At that moment, Arkenstone's armored body sprang back into motion and slammed into Tara with all the blind stallion's strength. The explosion and the resulting lack of air had caused Tara's magical protection to falter. As a surface like steel slammed into him, Tara cried out in agony. The edges of Arkenstone's armor bit into his skin and the force of the impact caused something to crack, then snap. Tara felt the most intense pain he had endured yet. However, the force of the blow knocked him clear of the explosion's epicenter, granting Tara access to air once again. Taking a deep breath, Tara drew in an enormous amount of power, sucking the earth's strength into his body, using its power to strengthen him, solidify his muscles and hold broken bones in place, even as the bones themselves became like steel rods. His strength regained, Tara once again surged forward to clash with Arkenstone, the resulting impact driving the rest of the flames away. Arkenstone had apparently changed up his strategies. More swords appeared in the air around him, vanishing as they moved to slash at Tara. This time, instead of simply throwing them at the dark brown stallion, Arkenstone maintained his hold on the blades, wielding them as an extension of himself, slashing back and forth, up and down, in an attack that was coming at Tara from all directions, even as he waded in with his armored body to attack more directly. Tara found himself driven back, being forced to backpedal as he tried to keep Arkenstone's blades from surrounding him. The blades struck and withdrew before Tara's hooves could meet them, keeping Tara from shattering them as he had done on previous occasions. They also kept him from effectively countering the attacks Arkenstone delivered with his armored body. Growling, Terra jumped back, transforming to a blur as his form blurred back a considerable distance in an attempt to gain more distance so that he could gather his strength for a counterattack. However, the blades that Arkenstone was wielding came together in that instant, their forms merging together into a giant sword that practically leapt after Terra, aiming for his stopping point. Terra came to a rest, his eyes widened as he saw the gargantuan blade flying straight for his head. For an instant, both Terra and the sword vanished in an explosion of dust. Even before the dust had cleared, Arkenstone's nose and ears told him that the attack had missed. Terra had deflected the blade at the last second, causing it to bury itself in the earth right next to him. Thrusting out his elbow, Terra struck the side of the blade and shattered it like glass. There was a momentary lull in the battle as the two stallions circled one another warily. The fight had taken its toll. They were sore, battered, and wounded. Blood dripped to the ground, limbs trembled, bones creaked. Nerves burned, having been strained almost to the breaking point by being forced to fight so hard for so long. Neither spoke, whether to offer mercy or ask it. No such speech was needed or wanted. At that moment both Arkenstone and Terra had the same thing on their minds, death. The air between them literally crackled with pure, unrestrained killing intent. Even though they were not clashing or exchanging blows at that moment, the ground beneath their hooves hummed and trembled with tension. With a flick of his tail, Arkenstone released more pine needles into the air around him. This time, over a dozen of blades appeared to hover beside him, all of them aiming straight for Terra, who closed his eyes and breathed deeply, once again drawing in power from the earth. In the blink of an eye, Arkenstone's blades leapt into frantic motion as they lanced out at Terra. Terra vanished as well, his body seeming to disappear as he charged straight in at Arkenstone, seeming to cover the distance between them in a single step. Terra completely ignored the blades, allowing them to gash him from right and left as he aimed directly for Arkenstone. Arkenstone braced his own body, setting himself to take Terra's next blow as all four of the massive dark brown stallion's hooves slammed into the ground simultaneously. For the second time that day, Terra Hart and Arkenstone literally went head to head. The impact between them completely shattered the armor around Arkenstone's head, a shockwave running down the length of his body and causing the rest of his armor to seem to dissolve. The ground beneath their hooves cracked and split and exploded outwards in a shockwave that left another shallow crater in its wake. At the crater's center were the two stallions, their heads still pressed together. The swirling black dust that had once been Arkenstone's armor gathered into two serrated-looking whirlwinds, one over each of his shoulder. They condensed and, in the space of a fraction of a second, two long, slender blades stretched out from them, thrusting rapidly at Terra, piercing him in the flesh of his shoulders and emerging to draw lines of splashing red along the length of his body before they pierced into the ground behind him. Everything to stop. The entire battle seemed to briefly freeze in time as the two stallions remained in their position. Finally, something seemed to give. Arkenstone's swords crumbled away as the blind stallion slowly stepped back from Terra, his body swaying almost drunkenly. As he watched this, Terra's eyes narrowed and he lifted one foreleg, as though he planned to press the attack, only to freeze in place. His foreleg came back down. With a loud, gurgling cough, Terra let out a spray of blood from his mouth as he nearly collapsed down onto his belly. It was all he could do to remain standing. The two stallions staggered and stumbled, each attempting to gather his senses before the other could. Both of them drew deeply on the earth's power, strengthening their bodies, overshadowing pain, focusing their remaining strength in a race to recover from their latest exchange. For both of them, it was a painfully slow process that seemed to stretch on intolerably. Arkenstone's power stretched out into the air around him, once again drawing in dust, gathering it around him to reform his armor. However, because Arkenstone's recovery required that one extra step, Terra was able to fully recover first. Setting himself, Terra charged straight at Arkenstone once more, slamming his shoulder into the armor forming across Arkenstone's chest. The bladed edges of the armor crumpled under the impact and Arkenstone was thrown off his hooves and sent flying back. However, as Arkenstone was knocked into the air and sent flying through the wall of another building, his lips curled back into a triumphant smile. Terra Hart, Granny Smith smiled as she sipped from the mug of cider in front of her. Now there's a name I haven't heard in ages. He was my senior, correct? Asked Arkenstone. I suppose ya could say that, said Smith, shaking her head slowly. That lad had so much potential. It's a shame things ended the way they did. That darn colt was too stubborn for his own good. He was a student of the mountain route under you, said Arkenstone, and, unlike me, he did not branch out, as it were. That much is true, said Smith with a nod. He might have done much better if he had. How so? Do ya think are any weaker cause ya went from learnin' the mountain route to creatin' our own style? Asked Smith, raising an amused eyebrow at Arkenstone. I don't believe so, said Arkenstone, it just didn't quite suit me. And that's the way it's always been, said Smith. The biggest mistake ya can make about any, the three pillars is that there's one right way to learn any, ya start out by learnin' the basic form, but that's to help ya learn the principles of the art. Once ya learn those, ya can start shaping it in a way that best suits or traits as a pony and a martial artist. Terra's mistake was getting all hung up on the form, mighty obsessed with the purity, the art that one. Smith sighed. He'd have a hard time learnin' to do some technique or other and get mighty frustrated. When I suggested that he try adaptin' his movements to something that might suit him better, maybe look to other kinds, pony fair inspiration, he refused, said he had to learn to do it the right way. He was a tribalist. Arkenstone raised an eyebrow. Nah, said Smith, waving a hoof dismissively, got along perfectly fine with any unicorn and Pegasus he met, that fella. But fair some reason, where the mountain route was concerned, he was obsessed by masterin' it as it was. I don't know what happened to get him fixated on it like that. He didn't talk about his reasons really. Mighty stiff boy. A form over function type, suggested Arkenstone. As good a way, puttin' it as any, said Smith with a nod. If ya end up fightin', that's where his weakness is gonna be. I tried my hardest to teach that boy, I did. He certainly learned the technical aspects, the mountain route. But there's something deeper he plain didn't care enough to learn. Once I taught I'm the form, the 4-point strike, he skedaddled, sayin' he'd learned everything he needed to, was gonna go out and use the mountain route to change the world. So he knows the 4-point strike, mused Arkenstone. He knows how to do it, but he never really learned what it was all about, just figured it was the way an earth pony could hit their hardest. Smith sighed. He thinks himself a master, the mountain route. For most ponies, he may as well be one. But there's some things missing in his trainin' that ya can use. I see, said Arkenstone, I'll keep that in mind. The building that Arkenstone had just been thrown into was none other than his own tea house. He skidded to a halt in the middle of the serving room, having crashed through a pair of tables after his explosive entry through the wall. Getting back on his hooves, Arkenstone slowly turned his head, inhaling deeply, taking the familiar smell of the place, the wood of the walls and furniture, the ponies who had passed through the place in the months since it had opened, the faint scent of the mild cleaning solution he used, the smell of tea and spices that had sunk in and permeated the entire establishment. For the past few months, this place had been his home in Ponyville. Arkenstone had sunk more time and effort into this one building in the past months than he had in any other place he had stayed in all the years he had been a knight. He could pick out the scents of ponies who had passed through there, including the ones closest to him. He smelled Twilight and Spike, both of whom smelled of paper and ink. He smelled Dawn, Scootaloo, and the other Crusaders, who carried with them the sense of all the places they had been around Ponyville and all the things they had tried to get their cutie marks. He could smell Red River and Stormfront. He could smell Rarity, Applejack, Pinkie Pie, Rainbow Dash, and Fluttershy. He could identify the scents of the dozens of other ponies he had come to know during his time in Ponyville. Their scents were as much a part of this place as the walls and furniture that made it up. That sense of familiarity washed over Arkenstone, clearing his head like a blast of fresh air mixed with a bucket of cold water. The haziness brought on by his mounting injuries pulled back, and Arkenstone was able to appreciate the world around him with a brilliant clarity that made his body feel at once lighter and more solid. The building fatigue seemed to leave him entirely as Arkenstone stood up straight, heedless of the burden his body had been under previously. This is exactly what I needed. The strong sense of familiarity that pervaded the tea house, the feeling of being on his home ground, was exactly what Arkenstone needed to get that critical edge over his opponent. Just as Sweet Apple Acres was for Granny Smith, the tea house was a place that Arkenstone had cultivated and made into a place of power for himself. Taking a deep breath and basking in the familiar sense around him, Arkenstone filled the tea house with his power. The entire building began to creak and groan. Invisible power seemed to crackle through the walls, passing all the way down to the foundations. Tara Hart's hooves clicked on the wooden floor as he passed through the hole Arkenstone had opened in the wall. Tara said nothing as he came in, glaring at the blind stallion. Arkenstone's armor had completely reformed, leaving him fully protected once again. Tara growled and set himself in a crouch, preparing to charge in once more. Arkenstone made no movements in response, simply breathing deeply, continuing to immerse himself in the familiar sense around the building. The power he drew in from the earth continued to mingle with his own power, which had sunk into the foundation of the building itself. The entire place hummed with his magic. Arkenstone breathed in, drawing in still more power. Then it was gone. A single breath from Tara and the connection between Arkenstone and the earth directly beneath his hooves vanished. In that brief second, Tara charged forward, ramming his shoulder into Arkenstone's armored chest. Arkenstone was knocked off his hooves and sent flying backwards, crashing through the room at one of its corners. He ended up crashing into one of the storerooms where he kept his teas and spices. The burlap bags exploded around him, filling the air with fragrant particles. He managed to land on his hooves, plowing furrows through the wooden floor as he skidded to a stop. Starting at the point where Arkenstone had come crashing through the wall into the storeroom, the wood making up the building seemed to crumble to pieces, splinters and fragments mixing with the airborne spices and dried tea leaves. They all began to swirl around Arkenstone like a typhoon, some of it melding with his armor, making it more solid, more substantial. It merged with the greaves over his hooves, anchoring him to the floor and the ground beneath it. With each passing second, more of the building seemed to crumble away into minuscule pieces that continued to whirl around Arkenstone. Like a runaway locomotive, Tara Hart came charging in, his head lowered to deliver what he no doubt thought to be the final blow, having taken the absence of Arkenstone's counter as a sign that the blind stallion was on his last legs. Tara was prepared to use the infamous 4-point strike for the third and final time. The 4-point strike was the final technique taught to students of the mountain route, not because it was the most powerful blow an earth pony could muster if used correctly, but because using it required that the user had fully mastered all aspects of the art to their fullest extent. Without that mastery, the technique was more likely to harm the user than her enemies. Naturally, using one's own cranium to deliver such a powerful blow was not without its risks. The transfer of power, kinetic and magical force, from the user into the target had to be managed perfectly. If there was any disturbance in that transfer of force, the technique could not connect properly and the consequences could be disastrous for the user. At best, a concussion might be the result. At worst, a user who had executed the technique wrongly would not live long enough to realize her mistakes, as her brains would likely be splattered over everything in a 10-meter radius. A mistake would result in the user's skull shouldering most, if not all, of the force of their own attack. It was a technique designed to allow the user to show that she had fully mastered and understood the principles that lay at the foundation, the root, of the mountain route. Tara Hart, who had focused merely on the technique's destructive power, could not fully realize the ramifications of using it in his current condition and state of mind. Tinged with anger at the obstacles that had forced themselves into the path of what had been a supposedly simple mission, he was not fully immersed in the execution of the technique itself. That Arkenstone had already endured that very blow twice already was especially galling to Tara. The wounds he'd received over the course of the battle hurt more than they should, but one wound in particular stood out. The ugly, black line drawn along Tara's hip just below his cutie mark was especially distracting now, not in the least because it was the only wound on Tara's body that he hadn't received from Arkenstone. It was the wound that Dawn Lightwing's final attack had engraved upon him through all of his defenses. Throughout the fight, the painful sensation of that burnt cut had tormented Tara like a barbed thorn buried beneath his skin. Now, with all the mounting frustration of this battle, its impression was magnified in Tara's mind, which was reflected in his body. As a consequence, his hind leg faltered as he planted his hooves to execute the 4-point strike. That small error disrupted the flow of power generated by Tara's hindquarters, throwing his posture off just slightly. As focused as he was on delivering the final blow, Tara ignored the sensation and pressed forward, determinedly slamming his forehead against Arkenstone's own. A loud crack echoed through the air. The two stallions froze for the briefest of seconds. Then blood sprayed outward from the point of impact. Tara reeled back with a cry of pain, stumbling as he shook his head, splattering more red everywhere. Tara's mind, along with his awareness of his current situation, was all but destroyed. His mind was a jumble of confused thoughts, completely scrambled by the impact of his own technique. Arkenstone struck. The swirling dust of tea and spices in the air around him, mixed with fragments of his home, all of it saturated with his power and presence, crackled visibly with energy. They merged together, forming numerous blades, countless blades, a veritable storm of blades that swirled outwards to engulf Terra Hart from every conceivable direction. As they moved, more of the walls, the ceiling, and even the floor beneath Terra's hooves crumbled away to become even more blades. There was no opening to escape, no weakness that could be exploited. This was different from the deluge of relatively unguided blades Arkenstone had relied upon earlier. Each one of these moved as an extension of his body and will, guided as perfectly and precisely as if they were his own limbs. They closed in on Terra and buried themselves into his flesh, cutting deeply, sending even more blood flying through the air as Terra cried out in agony. Before the storm of blades could close completely in on Terra and hack him completely to pieces, Arkenstone pulled them back, merging them all together into the largest sword he had yet wielded with his own hooves. The blade stretched up, smashing a hole through a section of the unbroken ceiling above Arkenstone's own head. As he did this, Terra fell, his body turning away slightly so that he was almost perpendicular to Arkenstone, presenting a perfect target. Arkenstone brought the sword down, cleaving through his own tea house and home in the process, bringing the blade down at Terra's neck. In that instant, the battle that had rocked Ponyville came to an end. Author's notes. So, after major technical difficulties, we now bring you your regularly scheduled chapter, and maybe the next one, once I finish editing it. The idea for Terra's attitude regarding the martial arts was drawn from stories about Bruce Lee, who apparently got a lot of flack for his martial arts philosophy, which was about incorporating what is useful over particular styles, which didn't go over quite well with the masters of those styles. Terra was all about the keeping to the particulars of his style, whereas ponies like Arkenstone tend more towards Bruce Lee's philosophy. The idea of the 4-point strike is kinda like those techniques used by some martial arts where the practitioner uses their head to break rocks, cinder blocks, or various other sundry hard objects. It's taught not because it's a useful technique, it rarely is, but because it's a way for the wielder to demonstrate their understanding of the more advanced principles of a particular martial art, precisely because it would be impossible to pull off such a technique without hurting oneself unless it was done exactly right. Next chapter, ponies pick up the pieces. Broken and battered. Chapter 26, Broken and battered. Cease. The voice rang with the clarity of a massive bronze bell, echoing so loudly that it could be heard throughout Ponyville and even as far as Sweet Apple Acres, where the town's population awaited the battle's conclusion. It was filled with the weight of authority and the will of a ruler. Arkenstone's sword halted a hair's breadth from Terra's neck. From above, he felt a literal deluge of warmth and light that seemed to seep through his skin, into his flesh and bones. It was a calming sensation that put the blind stallion at ease. He relaxed, allowing the armor of dust and other substances to crumble away from his body. The massive sword he had been holding crumbled as well. Hovering above the tea house, looking down through the new skylight Arkenstone had opened its roof, was none other than Princess Celestia, her body shining with the light of the sun, her mane and tail shimmering, looking more like massive tongues of blue-white flames than the gentle aurora they usually resembled. Her eyes gazed sternly down at the two stallions. This battle is over, said Celestia, enough blood has been spilled this day. Terra blinked and shook his head fiercely before forcing himself to look reverently up at the princess. Your radiance, I. Silence. The single word carried enough weight in it to make Terra's jaw snap shut audibly before he had even fully processed what he had heard. I wasn't sure you would make it in time, said Arkenstone calmly as he rested the hoof that had previously been holding the sword on the ground. I came as quickly as I could manage, said Celestia, turning her attention to Arkenstone. Terra looked back and forth between Celestia and Arkenstone in confusion. She had saved him at the moment of his apparent demise. He had no doubt that Arkenstone had fully intended to kill him, yet the armored stallion had stopped the very instant Celestia had ordered it. It was practically divine intervention. However, he couldn't understand why she was not focusing her wrath on Arkenstone now. Where is Don Lightwing? Asked Celestia. Terra smiled slowly. Now Arkenstone would pay for his heresy. He is at Sweet Apple Acres right now, said Arkenstone. In his condition. Battered, bruised, drained of his magic, but alive, said Arkenstone with a slight smile. I don't doubt that he will make a full recovery. Celestia's stern visage melted into a relieved smile as she drifted down through the hole in the roof to land near Arkenstone. Thank goodness. The bottom went out of Terra's stomach at those words. Wah what? His voice was barely more than a whisper. Celestia seemed not to have heard it. Arkenstone's ear twitched in the faintest acknowledgement of Terra's voice. Your radiance, Dada. I told you to be silent, said Celestia, turning an expression of undiluted rage on Terra Hart. If you utter another sound without my leave, I will order my knight to finish what he started. Terra's voice died as he wilted beneath the rage in Celestia's glare. His insides felt as though they had liquefied. He simply couldn't process what he was hearing. Were there any other injuries or casualties? Asked Celestia. I believe the evacuation went smoothly. I don't know if any pony was injured in that, but it seems unlikely. Arkenstone lowered his head. However, both Red River and Stormfront were badly injured in combat. I am not certain that they will be able to recover fully. I see, said Celestia glumly. I've already sent the Royal Guard detachment that accompanied me to Sweet Apple Acres. More are bound from Canterlot by train with relief supplies. It would seem the two of you did quite a bit of damage to Ponyville during your battle. My apologies, said Arkenstone. Letting out a sigh, Celestia lowered her head before shaking it sadly. Still, there appear to have been no deaths this day. I'm glad for that. She turned her attention back to Terra. All that remains is to take this stallion into custody. From him, we will learn everything about the cult solar and stamp it out. Arkenstone spoke again, but his voice was lost to Terra's ears. It was as though a thunderstorm had taken up residence in Terra's head, pounding ceaselessly as he gaped unabashedly at Princess Celestia, the goddess he had worshipped. Everything that he had done, every deed he'd performed, all the injuries he'd suffered this day, all had been for her. But here she was, not merely rejecting him, but declaring her intent to snuff out the Order of Celestial Light, even calling it by that accursed name. What is going on? His world had been turned upside down. Nothing made sense anymore. With a low whine, Terra Hart sank to the floor in an unmoving heap. It seems you broke him, observed Arkenstone blandly. His hoof twitched as he turned his attention to Terra. The cultist stallion was extremely dangerous now, perhaps even more so, now that the foundation upon which he had built his principles and actions had been so rudely torn out from beneath him. While it wasn't a certainty, some ponies had gone into episodes of frenzied violence over such revelations. Even in his present state, Tara Hart was still dangerous. I should finish this. Arkenstone, said Celestia, her stern tone resonating in his ears, lower your hoof. Slowly, Arkenstone's hoof came to rest back in the ground. I gave the order to stay, she said. It was not your decision, said Celestia, you need not be the relentless here. But, Arkenstone's voice trailed off as he thought about what he had been about to do. Amongst his fellow knights, he had been known as the Relentless, one of his less favored titles. He had always tried his hardest to avoid violence and avert bloodshed. But when no other option was given and he was forced to draw his blades and strike, he made absolutely certain not to withhold anything and never left a foe alive. It had been his conviction. If an adversary could not be deterred through any other means and insisted upon resorting to violence to the very end, ultimately, such an enemy would only cease to be a threat if they were dead. He had believed in that conviction in order to assure that he would not strike unless he had exhausted absolutely every means to end a conflict without bloodshed. Every time he did resort to violence, he killed, using the memories of the lives he had taken to remind him of his failure to find a better way. But the conviction that he had held so firmly to in the past was now turning to bear its fangs at him. At that moment, he hadn't been fully committed to the reasons he'd been using on himself to finish Tara off. He had just been looking for an excuse to kill Tara on the spot to ensure that he had held true to his course of action. What am I thinking? Arkenstone, said Celestia, I have always respected your desire to seek better ways of resolving issues. I know that is your greatest virtue as a knight. In the past, you pushed forward and succeeded where even some of my finest diplomats would have thrown up their hooves and walked away. But you need not go that far any longer. Your conviction is not for cutting down the helpless, whoever they may have been or whatever they may have done up to that point. If you followed through with that, you would not be worthy to be one of my knights. And you would not be the stallion my dearest student loves so. I, said Arkenstone. He opened and closed his mouth slowly. You're right. Celestia nodded. Thank you. Her horn glowed, a nimbus of magic gathering around the unresponsive Tara and lifting him up. Can you walk? I can. Then I will meet you at Sweet Apple Acres, said Celestia. I need to check on the situation there. She beat her wings and took to the sky, making her way out to the farm. Taking a shuddering breath, Arkenstone willed his limbs into motion. Now that the battle was over, the adrenaline had faded from his system. He was conscious of the countless aches and pains spread throughout his body. Each and every step was a novel experience in pain. However, he knew his own body well enough to know that he could indeed make the journey. His current condition would draw that journey out for him. But perhaps that extra time was what he needed now. Celestia came in for a landing directly in front of the Apple family's barn. She could see the ponies that had been evacuated from the hospital resting inside. Already, her guards were taking stock of the situation. Spike had been pressed into service as a messenger, sending updated reports to Shining Armor on what supplies were needed. Later on, he would probably be communicating how many ponies were without shelter and the overall damage tallies for Ponyville. She knew that the young dragon would probably work himself to the bone to help get it all done. I'm going to owe him some special rewards when all this is over, she thought. She had some very nice gems in one of the vaults back in Canterlot that Spike would probably love. But she could ask him what he'd like later. Because they had traveled light, the squad that had accompanied Celestia from Canterlot wasn't carrying anything in the way of relief supplies. Given the aftereffects of the battle between Tara Hart and Arkenstone, it would be a while before any pony would be able to return to their homes for any length of time, at least until surveyors and engineers could determine the structural integrity of the homes affected, which was nearly all of them. To make matters worse, there were quite a few families and ponies who had no homes to return to, the buildings having been shattered, as though they were made of toothpicks by the battle. The destructive potential of a celestial knight was nothing to be trifled with, say nothing of a battle between one and a pony nearly equal to him in power. Arkenstone had won the day, but the price was high. It would be weeks, months even, before everything returned to normal in Ponyville. Making matters worse was the highly personal nature of the conflict. Tara Hart had come to Ponyville looking for Dawn, with the intent of killing him. Arkenstone had intervened and acted to stop Tara. This fight essentially boiled down to the presence of a single colt, which had led to widespread destruction and damage. Celestia silently prayed that ponies didn't take their anger out on Dawn. Princess greeted one of her guards, who had taken up a station by the barn doors. Would you like us to take charge of the prisoner? Yes, said Celestia, you have brought the binding shoes, haven't you? We have, said the guard. Make sure he is outfitted and then shackle him, said Celestia, giving Tara's limp form one last cold glare before she left him on the ground for her guards to deal with, then tend his wounds and make sure he is stabilized. It would not do for him to bleed out before we draw all the useful intelligence we can out of him. Her aura faded away as she left him behind, save for 4 rings of magic which restrained each of Tara's legs. Binding the power of accomplished users of Earth Pony magic was a difficult task. Both unicorns and Pegasi of nearly any level could generally be restrained by inhibitor rings and wing bindings respectively, thanks to the fact that the majority of their magical outlets were concentrated on those parts of their bodies. However, Earth ponies not only possessed a relatively even distribution of magical outlets across their bodies, but they also had an equal number of inlets for absorbing ambient magical energy, which made restraining them more of a challenge. It helped that few Earth ponies ever really learned to master their magic to its fullest capability. To bind Earth ponies like Tara, special horseshoes, called binding shoes, had been invented. Made of the same material as unicorn inhibitor rings, they worked by absorbing magic drawn into Earth ponies through the nails used to hold them into place. The consequence was that the shoes grew progressively heavier as the bound Earth pony relied more on her magic, while preventing her from actually using that magic at the same time. Of course, applying such shoes required subduing and restraining the Earth pony in question, which was a very tall order indeed if they were advanced practitioners of their craft. Once those shoes were on him, Tara wouldn't be going anywhere. Celestia walked sedately into the barn, looking around and taking stock of the situation. The barn floor had been swept clean of dirt and clutter, with tarps being laid down so that the place could be used to house the patients from the hospital. Celestia found herself admiring the level of organization. There weren't all that many patients, but the ones who were there were being exceedingly well cared for despite the conditions. She drew glances from the nurses and orderlies ministering to the patients and gave them encouraging smiles as she passed. One of the most important laws she had put into effect was that hospital staff were not to interrupt their work even when royalty was present, especially when they were working with patients. In the distant past, Celestia had seen more than a few injured ponies lose their lives because a doctor or nurse wasted precious seconds to prostrate themselves to her in the middle of an important treatment or operation. The one thing that truly caught her eye was the white blocky structure that stood near the entrance to the barn. Its form was definitely out of place, namely because Celestia could tell it wasn't composed of mundane matter, but actualized magic. Did Twilight create that with her ring? She wondered. If so, it was an impressive feat, one well beyond what most ponies with such an item were capable of. She also noticed two ponies in particular waiting outside the structure, their eyes fixated on it so intently that they hadn't even noticed Celestia's arrival. Applejack, said Celestia softly as she came up behind the farm mare. Ah, Applejack jumped nearly twice her own height in surprise before spinning about to face Celestia. Her Pegasus companion was so startled that she jumped all the way up to the rafters, clinging to them for dear life. I'm sorry, said Celestia in a soothing tone, I didn't mean to startle you. Picking up her hat, which had fallen to the floor when she jumped, Applejack brushed it off and wiped sweat from her forehead before slipping the hat back on. No harm, no foul, princess, she said in a relieved tone. The Pegasus, recovering her composure, released her hold on the barn rafters and drifted down to the floor, stooping neatly into a graceful bow in the same second that her hooves touched down. Celestia nodded to her, bidding the mare to rise. And what is your name, my little pony? Flitter, your highness, said the Pegasus shyly. Hey now, no need to be so shy, said Applejack, reaching over to give Flitter a reassuring rub along her back. The princess ain't gonna bite ya. Giggling, Celestia nodded. Under the circumstances, foregoing formalities is a perfectly understandable thing. She looked past the two mares at the white box once more. Can you tell me what this is about? Not a whole lot, said Applejack, nervously rubbing one foreleg with another. I made it to help the doctor with Storm and Red. They're in a mighty bad way. Ah, said Celestia. She hadn't gotten the chance to meet Stormfront, but she had met Red River when he had accompanied Applejack and her friends up to the royal palace for hearts warming. She assumed that Flitter was Stormfront's filly friend. It certainly seemed that way from how she and Applejack were visibly supporting one another as they awaited the results from inside Twilight's improvised sanctuary. Applejack in particular looked as though she needed support. Even as they talked, Celestia could see her swaying unsteadily. Applejack's orange coat was matted with sweat and her normally flowing mane sagged limply. There were also bags forming beneath Applejack's eyes that would have normally spoken of sleepless nights. Are you sure you're all right to be here? Asked Celestia, looking at Applejack worriedly. I'm just a bit tired, Applejack conceded, her voice faltering. She and all the other Earth ponies who could be spared used their magic to stop the tremors, explained Flitter. Celestia nodded. That explained why everything on Sweet Apple Acres was in such good condition even though an event that was comparable to a small-scale earthquake had occurred nearby. You should get some rest, Flitter was now saying to Applejack. No way, no how, said Applejack stubbornly, I ain't gonna get a lick, oh sleep till I know if Red's gonna make it. How long have they been in there? Asked Celestia. Flitter frowned. Almost 2 hours now, she said, a nervous quaver in her voice. It was obvious that she was also very worried about the outcome. Celestia pursed her lips and stared at Twilight's creation. Actualizing magic into such a large structure was no easy feat. Even if Twilight's magical reserves could have easily handled the task for days at a time, the mental strain of maintaining an object that was stretching the limits of what the Arcanasteel ring was designed for would be excruciating. Depending on the extent of the two stallions' injuries, the doctor might require hours still in order to finish the operations to the extent that any kind of substantial recovery was possible. Would Twilight be able to maintain it for that long? There wasn't anything Celestia could do directly to provide assistance. If she tried to catch Twilight's attention or use her own magic to aid in Twilight's work, she was more likely to disrupt Twilight's concentration than anything else. Instead, Celestia turned her attention to Flitter and Applejack. It was clear that the two mares were running themselves ragged worrying about their stallions. With a sigh and a sad smile, Celestia lit her horn, conjuring a drifting cloud of magic that settled across the two mares like a glowing fog. Both Applejack and Flitter's eyes began to droop and the two mares sank into an exhausted slumber. Quietly, Celestia motioned some nurses over to supply Applejack and Flitter with cots and blankets, leaving them sleeping peacefully. Good luck, Twilight, thought Celestia, giving the white box one last look before turning to look for the other pony she had come to check up on. She found him laying silently on a cot near the center of the barn. Don Lightwing was out like a light. Across his body, Celestia could see bandages and even a couple of sutures here and there to close larger cuts. Next to him lay a second cot where little Scootaloo was also resting. Sitting down and watching over both of them was an anxious Fluttershy, who was flanked by a pair of formidable-looking griffins. How is he? Asked Celestia as she approached Fluttershy. The two griffins turned their sharp, predatory gazes on her for only a second before they relaxed and stepped back to allow Celestia room to approach the canary-colored Pegasus. Celestia favored the pair with a nod before returning her attention to Don's mother. He's resting, said Fluttershy. I can see that already. Only centuries of practice kept the wry comment from leaping out from Celestia's lips. Fluttershy didn't need sarcasm right now. Settling down next to her, Celestia draped a wing over Fluttershy's back. His condition is stable, said one of the nurses, coming over, a clipboard hovering in the grasp of her magic. He was suffering from severe magic depletion when Scootaloo brought him in. We managed a transfusion and he stabilized. However, as you can see, he suffered plenty of other injuries. I noticed some cuts and abrasions, said Celestia. The nurse nodded. Those two. However, we also suspect that he's suffering from impact trauma in the chest area, possibly even fractured ribs. However, until the doctor is available to perform an examination and we have an appropriate environment for it, I'm afraid all we have is guesswork. I called down some additional medics from Canterlot, said Celestia. A hospital tent is on its way as well. It should serve as substitute until we can verify the structural integrity of the hospital and ensure that it is safe to move the patients and staff back in. We're grateful for that, said the nurse. She reached out with a hoof and, ever so gently, brushed the strands of Don's mane away from his face. I can't imagine how hard he must have been fighting to reach this condition. Celestia gave the mare a worried look. You aren't upset about this, are you? The mayor looked aghast at the princess. At him. No, I'd like to think that I know better than to blame the victim. I certainly hope that most every pony else in Ponyville is as reasonable. He even led the attack out into the park to try and keep it away from every pony. Celestia nodded. She turned her attention to Fluttershy, who was still resting against her side. Celestia could see that Fluttershy had fallen asleep in the shelter of her wing. Could you find another cot? Of course, said the nurse with a smile before walking off to do exactly that. Once Fluttershy was settled, Celestia took her leave of the barn to see how the rest of Ponyville was coping with this disaster. By and large, the residents of the town were surprisingly resilient. Then again, given the town's reputation as a trouble magnet in the past, the majority of ponies seemed rather inoculated against such incidents. All told, the ravening swarm of magically altered parasprites had probably done more damage overall than Terra and Arkenstone's battle. It helped that it was midway through the spring season and the weather was fair. Had it been in the middle of winter, the situation would have been much more dire. Celestia spoke with every pony she could and was relieved to note that, while most of them were aware of Don's involvement in the incident, very few of them seemed to hold it against him personally. The few that expressed frustration towards the colt simply seemed to be using him as a vent for their stress more than anything else rather than actually holding a grudge against him. About 3 hours after the fight's conclusion, a flight of Pegasi from the Royal Guard arrived towing large freight carriages loaded down with tents and bedding, along with food supplies and the most essential personnel to help the inhabitants of Ponyville through their situation. Still more ponies and material were on their way by train. Shining Armor had immediately started organizing relief efforts after Celestia left, not even waiting for reports to come in via Spike's Dragonfire to requisition items and get them organized. Luna had weighed in as well to move things along. Seeing that everything was going well, Celestia wrote out another letter and tracked down Spike to send it along to Shining Armor. It's time to end this farce, once and for all. That should do it, said Dr. Stable, sewing closed the last incision and snipping off the string. We've done all that we can. He turned to look at Twilight. You can let us out now. Oh okay, said Twilight, letting out a breath and relaxing. All around her, the white walls of actualized magic crumbled away into scattered motes of energy, allowing the ponies inside to view the interior of the barn once again. That was well done, Ms. Sparkle, said the doctor, adjusting his glasses. We couldn't have done this without you. Already, the nurses who hadn't been part of the operation were swooping down on the group, carefully moving Stormfront and Red River off to be hooked up to nutrient drips in preparation for the healing spells they would receive later. You're welcome, said Twilight in a dazed tone, swaying as fatigue crashed over her like a wave. Stable's smile faded as he looked at Twilight. She looked as though she had gone through several straight nights without sleep. He hadn't realized that the mental fatigue of what she had done would be so severe. Raising a hoof, he beckoned over an unoccupied orderly and ordered a cot for Twilight. He was feeling rather tired himself, having been operating for the past several hours, but felt that he needed to make sure that everything was in order before he rested himself. As it turned out, his work was mostly done. Amongst the ponies flown in by Celestia's Royal Guard were additional doctors, who had already seen to Dawn and Arkenstone. They had set up a hospital tent outside of the barn. The tent's fabric had many of the same wards used by hospitals, thus allowing the doctors to carry out their work with little difficulty. Princess Celestia was also still present, overseeing the distribution of supplies and shelters. Ah, doctor, said Celestia as he approached her, how do your patients fare? Well, given the circumstances, said Stable with a sigh, we did what we could, which was much more than I ever hoped I could. Stormfront will still be able to fly when all this is over and Red River will have little more than a slight limp. Still, I believe that they will not be as effective fighters even after their recovery. The damage was severe then. Stable nodded. It was, however, it was relatively undirected. They both avoided crippling damage to their joints, which made it much easier to piece them back together. It's thanks to your student that we were able to treat them as well as we did. Yes, Twilight has outdone herself this time, said Celestia. I am most proud of her. You should be, said Stable before remembering he was speaking to a princess. Apologies for my impertinence, your highness. No apologies, said Celestia with a titter. After everything you have done, you certainly deserve a little leeway. Rest, doctor. You've earned it. Stable bowed politely to Celestia. Thank you, your highness. Turning, he headed off to get some much-needed sleep. Don's eyelids slowly fluttered open and he yawned. Said yawn was aborted when his chest sent a jolt of pain through him, cutting off his yawn with a strangled grunt. The pain wasn't severe, more sudden and surprising than anything else. It served to sweep the cobwebs from Don's mind and punt him fully into wakefulness, though he still felt decidedly sluggish. He was staring up at a ceiling of white canvas that stretched out to meet 4 equally white walls. At one of the corners, he could see sunlight filtering in through the fabric. Otherwise, it was fairly dark inside what Don assumed to be a fair-sized tent of some sort. Outside, his ears picked up the chittering sounds of birds and insects and an undercurrent of muttering voices. Where am I? Given his circumstances, he figured that he had probably been evacuated to Sweet Apple Acres. The quietness of the setting seemed to indicate that the battle was now over. Given that Don had woken up at all, he guessed that Arkenstone had managed to win the fight. Don could only hope that the knight was not badly injured. Shifting about underneath the sheet lying over him, Don began to take stock of his condition. There was a lingering soreness and sensitivity in his chest. However, it was mild, suggesting that the damage had been healed somewhat. The cuts and bruises that had dotted his body when he'd passed out were now closed. Aside from his ribs, he felt quite well. A tugging sensation on Don's arm prompted him to look over and spy the IV he'd been hooked up to. I guess that means I've had a healing spell, thought the colt. It certainly explained why his injuries were, mostly, gone. Of course, healing magic meant that his body's reserves had been tapped to fuel the spell, which meant. A low growl filled the tent as Don's stomach demanded sustenance immediately. The noise seemed to echo through the room, causing something to stir and prompting Don to realize that he was not alone in the room. Something that looked a little like a pale pink hump slowly rose up beside his bed, seeming to loom like a cresting wave before giving way to the yellow of Fluttershy's coat as she raised her head and turned to blink sleepily at the colt. Don, she said, her tone tentative and worried as she rubbed at her eyes. Quote. Good morning, was all that Don could think to say at the moment. His mind was not operating at full speed, which seemed odd given that he was used to waking up rather easily in the mornings. It also bothered him that he hadn't even noticed that she was in the room until she'd started moving. Even by his usual standards for waking up after being battered around in a fight, this was unusual. Letting out a happy sigh, Fluttershy leaned down and planted a light kiss on Dawn's cheek before nuzzling it. "Thank goodness," she said, her voice practically a whisper. Dawn's stomach growled again, drawing Fluttershy's attention. She giggled. "I'll let the doctor know you're up and get you some breakfast," she said, getting to her hooves and leaving through a flap she opened in the tent's wall, leaving Dawn alone. Dawn blinked, then returned to staring up at the tent's ceiling, pondering his situation. He felt much more sluggish than usual, even pondering going back to sleep. His stomach wouldn't have any of it though, protesting its own emptiness all the louder. Fortunately, he didn't have long to wait. A few minutes later, the tent flap lifted to admit Fluttershy, now balancing a tray that held a glass of water and a bowl of something steaming on her back. Following behind her was the doctor, who smiled knowingly at Dawn. "I would say welcome back," said the doctor wryly, "but you managed to avoid landing yourself in the actual hospital this time, since we were forced to rely on a substitution." "Ah," said Dawn, having trouble of thinking anything to say about that. "Oh yes, I imagine you are feeling rather more tired than usual," said Dr. Stable, lifting the arm that had been hooked up to the IV. Carefully, he removed the needle and pushed the stand out of the way. "I've treated a few Pegasi with wing exhaustion before, but never full-blown wing stroke." Wing stroke. Dawn's mind struggled as it tried to process the unfamiliar term. Wing exhaustion is what occurs when you Pegasi push your magic too far. Your body's meridians shut down to keep you from wasting any more energy. It's a safety valve, a limiter of sorts. The doctor lit his horn and sent a beam of magical energy sweeping over Dawn's body. However, under rare circumstances, it is possible to override that limiter and continue to draw your magic until it is completely exhausted. Your physical and mental processes shut down, and deprived of the magic that flows through them, your meridians eventually collapse. In that condition, if you woke up at all, you would be unable to fly ever again. Dawn's eyes widened and a jolt of panic surged through the colt just as Stable raised a placating hoof. "However," he said sharply, cutting off Dawn's anxious train of thought, "you are most fortunate that you were treated promptly. Your filly friend was more than happy to donate some of her own magic to help restore enough of your own to keep your meridians functioning properly. The fact that her magic is still in your system is one of the reasons you're feeling so out of sorts at the moment. It will pass as your body restores more of its own magical capacity. But it is going to be a few weeks before you'll be strong enough to fly again." "That's good to know," said Dawn, sinking back onto the mattress. Stable raised a rectangular black plate in his hoof and projected his magic onto the plate. An image of the colt's skeleton appeared on the plate. "Your bones have mended nicely, though I imagine that you are still feeling a little sore." Dawn nodded. "That's to be expected," said Stable, lowering the plate. "Your ribs had cracks running all along their length. I've rarely seen anything like it. There was also a substantial residue of Earth Pony magic embedded at the center of the injury that resisted attempts to heal you initially." "Magic?" asked Dawn, raising an eyebrow. A polite cough from Fluttershy interrupted the doctor just as he was opening his mouth. Seeing that Dawn's mother was still waiting with the tray of food and watching the doctor with an uncharacteristically irritated gaze. "Oh, right," said the doctor nervously. "I'm sorry, Miss Fluttershy. You're free to give Dawn his breakfast." Breakfast turned out to be a bowl of some sort of savory-smelling broth. At least it was palatable, but it didn't feel all that substantial to Dawn as he sipped it down along with his water. "You don't want to try solid food just yet," cautioned the doctor. "Trust me. Your stomach will give you hay for it." He paused to pull off his glasses and wipe them with a cloth. "Anyway, about the magic. It's a rare phenomenon, something I've never actually seen with my own eyes before. An Earth Pony who's using her magic offensively projects the magic through physical contact, using the magic as a medium of transferal for force in order to send the impact of their blow into the target. It also enhances the force of impact. When that happens, if the magic behind the blow is strong enough, it can linger at the site of the injury, causing it to resist healing magic to a certain extent. It won't cause you any permanent harm, but it will slow your healing process somewhat." Stable shivered visibly. "Like I said, it's the first time I've actually seen that with my own eyes. Very few Earth Ponies know how to use their magic in an offensive manner, and even fewer can put that amount of power into it. Judging by the extent of the damage, I'm assuming you only just barely avoided making direct contact with the blow." "By a hair," said Dawn, literally. Dr. Stable went pale as he stared at the colt, shuddering. He remembered seeing the injury for himself. He'd assumed that Dawn had at least partially taken the blow, but if what the colt had said was true, then the true force of the blow must have been staggering. Dawn was lucky that his body hadn't been splattered across the landscape like a rotten fruit. Still, he managed to regain his composure and replaced his glasses. "I'm going to have you rest for today and tonight and give you another healing spell this evening. Hopefully you'll be in condition to move after that. However, I want to caution you against any undue physical exertion before your magic has recovered. You're liable to hurt yourself if you aren't careful." "All right," said Dawn with a slow nod. The doctor saw himself out and Dawn returned to what remained of his breakfast. "Can you tell me what happened?" asked Dawn, looking at Fluttershy. "Yes," said Fluttershy, her smile fading as she began to relate what had taken place while Dawn had been unconscious. "Oh," the low groan escaped Twilight's mouth as she struggled to pry her eyes open. It was unpleasant work given that Rainbow Dash had apparently flown back from Cloudsdale to prank her by replacing her eyelids with sandpaper. Even as her eyes opened, the only thing she could make out were bright blurs in front of her. Her nose was stuffed like she'd had a cold. Her ears were even less help given that Pinkie Pie had apparently brought out that weird mishmash instrument she'd used to get the parasprites out of Ponyville and was now playing it in the enclosed space like there was no tomorrow. To say that Twilight had a headache would have been the understatement of the century. Her head was pounding, throbbing to the point she could actually feel her head twitch in time with her pulse. On top of that, her head felt as though it now weighed a couple of tons and the effort of trying to lift it off of the stiff, uncomfortable pillow it was resting on was likely to snap her neck. Opening her mouth, Twilight tried to formulate some sort of coherent sound only to cough and hack as the dry air outside entered her mouth and went down her even drier throat. Something warm wafted across her muzzle, vapors that drifted up her nostrils, seeming to slowly flush out the accumulated snot that was blocking her primary breathing passage. Twilight inhaled deeply, welcoming the scent of something vaguely herbal as it continued to clear her nasal passages. Something was touched to her lips and Twilight could feel hot liquid splashing against her mouth. Opening her lips slightly, she sipped slowly, finding the liquid to be the source of the vapors that had cleared her nose, some kind of herbal tea. She welcomed the taste and smell of the tea as it filled her mouth and slowly soothed her throat. It was gently warm, but not hot, which was a welcome relief in her current condition. The din of Pinkie Pie's musical efforts began to fade into a background of murmuring voices that Twilight realized were actually the sounds of ponies talking around her. Geez, how lucky I am to get the hangover without even having a chance to get drunk in the first place, thought Twilight wryly. Though the ache in her head had faded, her horn was still throbbing slightly. But it was a minor distraction at best. Twilight made another attempt to open her eyes. This time, they slid open smoothly and without protest. Though her vision was still blurred, Twilight was slowly able to make out shapes and objects around her. Are you feeling better? Said the pony who'd been holding the cup of tea to her lips. Turning her head, Twilight was shocked to see who was beside her. Arky, she squealed, lunging up off her cot to throw her arms around the stallion. You're okay. Oof, exclaimed Arkenstone, wincing in Twilight's embrace. Almost immediately, Twilight let go and flopped back down on her cot. I'm sorry, she gasped, getting her first good look at him, now that her vision was coming back into focus. Arkenstone had certainly seen better days. All four of his legs and his neck were tightly wrapped in bandages, with even more strips of cloth crisscrossed over the center of his forehead. It's all right, he said with a fond smile, I'm glad that I was able to come back to you in one piece, more or less. I'm glad too, said Twilight, leaning up again, this time to gently kiss her cold friend on the lips. Settling back onto the cot, she smiled up at him. I take it that everything turned out all right. More or less, said Arkenstone, Terra is no longer a threat and Princess Celestia has the situation well in hoof. What happened? Asked Twilight, I figured the doctors would have healed you already. They are having some difficulty flushing Terra's magic from my body, said Arkenstone, it slows the healing process down somewhat. So, you won, said Twilight. Yes, I won, replied Arkenstone, and I hear that you played an important role in yesterday's events as well. Well, Twilight's cheeks bloomed with color and she looked away bashfully. The gesture was meaningless to Arkenstone, who couldn't really meet her eyes anyway. Instead, he leaned down and gently nuzzled the base of her horn. You were incredible, Twilly, he said, Princess Celestia is very proud of you. Those words made Twilight's heart soar as they turned her head back to capture Arkenstone's lips in another kiss. I'm just glad it's over, she said softly. Not just yet, said Arkenstone, not pulling his head away, but instead leaning forward to lean his head against Twilight's own. What do you mean? Ponyville was still badly damaged by our fight, explained the stallion, there is a lot of work to be done before every pony can move back into their homes. And then there's what? Asked Twilight, her eyes narrowing. Arkenstone sighed, we have Terra Hard in custody. With his actions, we now have full confirmation of the Cult Solar's intentions regarding Dawn Lightwing and ponies like him, that this is the actual policy of the Cult Solar and not merely the actions of a few extremists. Princess Celestia is mobilizing the Royal Guard. She intends to root out all of the Cult Solar's strongholds and drag every member she can before the courts. Oh, said Twilight, her eyes widening. She supposed this was a long time in coming. Still, after all the anxiety that Celestia had expressed about stepping across the line between authority and tyranny, this was still a dramatic shift. However, her mind went back to the limp forms of Red River and Stormfront as Dr. Stubble worked desperately to save them. She remembered the destroyed wall of Scootaloo's house and the filly sitting in the hospital waiting room, distraught from the act of putting a pony in the hospital when she was defending herself from said cultist's attack. This is probably something we should have done a long time ago. The logistics of the campaign are proving somewhat difficult to arrange, said Arkenstone. We haven't yet had the chance to interrogate Terra Hard on the location of the cult's strongholds, much less the location and identity of their leader. On top of that, mobilizing the Royal Guard is going to be a difficult task. She could supplement the Royal Guard with guards from other towns, said Twilight. She could, admitted Arkenstone, but that could prove counterproductive. She's actually been laying the groundwork for this operation for months now, using covert members of the Guard to ferret out the Cult Solar's hiding places and their strongholds, but sometimes the local guards of various towns have been less than trustworthy. Yeah, I can see why that might be a problem, Twilight thought to herself. Though the Cult Solar had only experienced a resurgence in the past 10 years, there were probably areas of Equestria where it had been entrenched for generations. Even in relatively new territories, it would be a simple matter to start seeding members of the group into organizations such as the local city and town guards, allowing them to control the flow of information to and from Canterlot and inhibit any efforts to actually locate them. Because of that, there was plenty of reason to distrust the Guard in areas where the Cult Solar was known to operate. However, the Royal Guard, while an elite force, was a relatively small one when their numbers were compared to the scope of what Celestia was trying to do. They would be spread thin if Celestia really wanted to cover as many places as she possibly could. Fortunately, the Royal Guard isn't gonna have to do all of this on their own. Twilight's eyes widened as she saw a familiar mare striding up to stand next to Arkenstone. Spitfire. Hey there, said Arkenstone's fellow knight and captain of the Wonderbolts with a friendly wink, I heard you saved the day with some heavy-duty magic. Well, Twilight blushed and looked away. A bit embarrassed by the praise, she decided to switch the topic. Wait, if you're here then. Sorry, Rainbow Dash didn't come with us, said Spitfire, still smiling, she's in training with Firefly right now. I got Spike's letter from Oranos, but by the time we got here, everything was pretty much over already. I sent the rest of the team back, but we'll be out there with the Royal Guard when the princess wants to start playing Cultist Roundup. She's called back Sparrowhawk too, added Arkenstone. I think she'll probably call in Firefly as well, said Spitfire, tapping her chin. With 3 of us on the job, I think we'll manage pretty well. Twilight sighed. She hoped that Princess Celestia's efforts to bring in the cultists were successful. At the very least, taking such decisive measures against the Cult Solar was sure to send a clear message that their beliefs were not valid and that the object of their adoration had a very serious bone to pick with their activities. The conversation was interrupted by a low growl from Twilight's stomach, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since the previous day. Both Arkenstone and Spitfire heard the noise and grinned impishly at Twilight. I see some pony is hungry, said Spitfire. Thank you for belaboring the obvious, muttered Twilight. Chuckling, Arkenstone gently rubbed a hoof against Twilight's foreleg. Do you think you're up to moving about? I can get something for you if you want. I'll get up, said Twilight, sitting up with a groan and forcing herself to roll out of the mattress. I'm woozy from holding my concentration for so long. It's literally all in my head. Still, standing up proved to be a challenging task. But with Arkenstone by her side to keep her steady, Twilight managed, and she was soon on her way, albeit slowly, to the mess tent that had been set up for the evacuated Ponyvillians. Sadly, breakfast was not to be. Just as they were about to enter the tent, Arkenstone's ears stood sharply upright and the stallion's entire posture stiffened. He pulled away from Twilight abruptly, nearly causing her to topple over. Only an outstretched wing from Spitfire managed to keep Twilight on her hooves. After the past couple of days, Twilight was not in the best of moods. She immediately opened her mouth to berate Arkenstone before noticing what had captured his attention. Arkenstone had turned his entire body to face the Apple family farmhouse. He seemed to lean towards the structure, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed, sounding almost like a dog on the trail. His expression, which had previously been jovial, was now one of the utmost seriousness. There was tension in every line of his body and, to Twilight's surprise, he had actually gone pale. Arky, she asked nervously. As it turned out, Arkenstone didn't need to answer her. Instead, Twilight picked up the sound of a frantic voice on the wind, a voice that was accompanied by the rapid clopping of hooves. Now she could see Apple Bloom as the yellow filly galloped toward them, tears streaming from her wide eyes, a look of stark terror on her face. Twilight, Twilight, she yelled frantically, help, it's Granny. Calm down, said Twilight, lifting a hoof and trying to follow her own advice. In spite of her efforts, her heartbeat was picking up pace as a faint feeling dread crawled upwards and started to worm its way into her head. It's Granny, repeated Apple Bloom, you've gotta help us. She's gonna die. Author's notes. Well, you wanted an extra chapter today, so you got it. Poor Ponyville, the more spectacularly awesome the fight is, the more cleanup has to be done after it. Next chapter, Arkenstone gets a new title. Painless Passing. Chapter 27, Painless Passing. A silly filly, said Granny Smith with a quiet chuckle as she gently ran her hoof through Apple Bloom's mane, getting all worked up by that. The tears hadn't stopped flowing down Apple Bloom's cheeks as she rested her chin on the bed, mere inches from the Apple family matriarch. But Granny, she protested, y'all were on the floor and y'all weren't moving none. I've been around fair a long time, ma little blossom, said Smith, gently brushing tears from beneath Bloom's eyes. I worked harder yesterday than I've worked in the past 10 years. Something like this was bound to happen. On the other side of the bed, Dr. Stibble withdrew his stethoscope and jotted down some information into a notebook. She's stable for now, he said, looking across at Big Macintosh, who was standing silently behind Bloom. At this point, there's nothing more for me to do. Macintosh nodded, his eyes taking in the solemn look on Stable's face. Without saying a word, Macintosh left Granny Smith's bedroom and waited for the doctor to join him out in the hallway. As the doctor left, he heard Smith speaking softly to the youngest Apple child. Now y'all listen here, Bloom. Everything's gonna be just fine. There ain't nothing to worry about. The two stallions made their way down the hallway to the living room, where Twilight Sparkle and Arkenstone waited silently. Twilight looked unquestionably worried about Smith's condition, while Arkenstone looked quietly resigned. So what's the word, Doc? Asked Macintosh. Her vitals are fading, replied Dr. Stibble. She doesn't have much time left, a few days at most. Twilight gasped softly, her hooves flying to her mouth and tears leaking out of her eyes. The doctor interpreted Macintosh's questioning look without any difficulty. I'm afraid there's nothing any pony can do, he said clearly. Her exertions from yesterday were simply too much for her body. To be honest, she's fortunate she survived past that. At this point, the only thing you can do is make her remaining time as comfortable as possible. For an uncomfortable moment, Macintosh was silent, the stoic stallion still clearly having trouble processing what he was hearing. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. I guess that's it then, he said. Thank ya for our help, Doc. Dr. Stibble said nothing, merely nodding and taking his leave. Silence descended on the living room before Macintosh finally took on the task of breaking it. Welp, I gotta give Bloom the news. Don't know how I'm gonna break it to her. He looked at Twilight and Arkenstone. Can y'all do me a favor and let AJ know what's happening? Of course, said Arkenstone quickly before Twilight could protest. Thanks. With that, Macintosh made his way back down the hallway to Smith's room, presumably to give Bloom the bad news. Do you really think Applejack should hear it from us? Asked Twilight, staring aghast at Arkenstone. You are practically family to her, Arkenstone pointed out. Macintosh is clearly going to be busy for a moment. I don't think there's any other pony that could be trusted to do this. She's going to be devastated, Twilight said with a whimper. She's already in bad shape because of what happened to Red River. But this. It is what it is, said Arkenstone. We can't change it, and trying to hide the truth from her or put off giving it to her would probably hurt her even more. Slowly, Twilight nodded. All right. Also, we should try to see if we can pry Spike away from his current duties. Apple Bloom is probably going to need all the comfort she can get. I'll go tell Applejack, said Twilight. Could you go get Spike? Arkenstone nodded and the two of them parted. Twilight was still a bit out of sorts from yesterday's work. However, she was steady enough to make the short walk to the medical tent where the injured had been gathered. It was a large white tent, easily half the size of the mess tent. It didn't really need to be all that large. The majority of Ponyville's displaced hospital patients were still being housed inside the Apple family's barn, with only those in the absolute worst condition needing to be housed inside the walls of warded canvas. Twilight pushed open the flap on one side of the tent and found herself in a small room. Resting on a cot in the center of the room was an azure earth pony stallion. Red River's chest rose and fell with slow, even breaths as he slept, heedless of what was going on around him. He'd required a powerful healing spell to get him on the path to recovery. An IV was hooked up to his leg, supplying all the nutrients his body would need as he recovered. Twilight only gave the stallion a cursory glance, instead choosing to give her full attention to the mare sitting next to the bed. Applejack's green eyes stared forlornly at Red. Her trademark Stetson rested on a table that had been set near the bedside. Her long, flowing blonde mane was tangled and twisted, barely held together by its usual tie. Beside the hat was a mug of coffee, the only concession to her own needs that Applejack had bothered with. However, the coffee had gone undrunk and the lack of steam wafting from it gave Twilight a good idea of how long it had sat there undisturbed. Applejack. Twilight reached out and gently pressed her hoof to Applejack's shoulder. Oh, hey TWI, said Applejack, turning to look over her shoulder. At the sight of Twilight's face, Applejack broke out into a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Applejack. Twilight swallowed, uncertain of what to do. Applejack was already worn down with worry over her cold friend. Can I really tell her? At the same time, Twilight knew she didn't have much choice. Either she told Applejack now, or let her find out later. Letting her find out later would probably be much worse. Applejack, I have some bad news. Is it about Red? Asked Applejack, the rising pitch of her voice betraying her anxiety. No, said Twilight slowly, it's your grandmother. Granny Smith, what about her? Seeing the grim look on Twilight's face caused comprehension to dawn on Applejack's own. Her eyes widened. No, she's not. She is, said Twilight, the doctor confirmed it. She's dying, Applejack. She has a few days left at most. Applejack's eyes widened further. Her breathing grew faster and more frantic. She can't. This ain't. Applejack. Twilight snapped sharply. She lowered her horn and let out a spark that burst with a loud crack right in front of Applejack's face. The orange mare jumped sharply at the sudden noise. Before she could go back to panicking, Twilight was there, wrapping the farmer up in her arms and rocking her back and forth. It's too much TWI, whimpered Applejack, pressing her face into Twilight's neck, tears dampening the unicorn's fur. Not Granny too. Applejack, Red River's going to be fine, said Twilight calmly. He'll pull through. We made sure of that. But Granny Smith wouldn't want you to tear yourself apart over this, said Twilight, pulling back so that she could look her friend in the eye. We're all here for you. We'll do whatever it takes to help you get through this. But Applejack. Twilight used her magic to levitate Applejack's hat and set it back onto her head. You should go to her. But Red River is in good hooves, said Twilight, smiling. He's going to get the best care possible. But he wouldn't want to keep you here when you need to be with your family. Wire right, said Applejack with a sniff. Another set of arms encircled the pair, along with a pair of wings, wrapping and warming the two of them with their feathery softness. Looking at the newcomer to their embrace, Twilight was surprised to see that Flitter had joined in the hug. Where did she come from? Twilight's gaze drifted over to one of the walls, which was opened slightly. She could even see Rumble peeking in from the adjoining room. Oh, that must be where Stormfront is then. We'll keep an eye on Red for you, said Flitter softly, nuzzling Applejack's cheek. You should go. Thanks, said Applejack with a sniff. She broke their embrace and exited the room. Thank you, said Twilight, smiling gratefully at Flitter. Flitter gave Twilight a small smile in return before heading back to the room where she and Rumble were keeping their vigil over Storm. Twilight was feeling woozy as she got back to the Apple family homestead. As she approached, her tortured stomach reminded her, rather forcefully at that she still hadn't eaten anything. She'd been forced to abandon the prospect of a meal to answer Apple Bloom's panicked summons, and it didn't seem that she'd be getting to the mess tent anytime soon. Looks like I did the right thing by grabbing a little takeout. Twilight jumped with a loud yelp when she heard Spitfire's voice. Whirling about, Twilight gave the fiery mare an angry glare. Spitfire merely met said glare with a wry grin before hefting a wing, from which dangled a bag that was apparently loaded down with various disposable containers. The sight of the promised food made Twilight's stomach loudly attest its admiration for the Wonderbolt's captain, despite Twilight's irritation at being spooked by the mare. Thanks, she said grudgingly, taking the bag in her magic, I heard, said Spitfire, her smile fading. I don't think it'll be long before the entire town hears about it. Twilight frowned darkly. You don't seem too troubled by the idea. Spitfire shrugged, the indifferent reaction raising Twilight's hackles. I don't know Smith personally. She was long retired when I was knighted. The Siege Perilous is more of an honorary position than anything else. You don't care at all? Asked Twilight. Of course I do, said Spitfire. I know that this is going to be hard, especially for Arkenstone, since Smith was the one who taught him. I know it's going to be hard for her family too. But still, she's incredibly lucky. Lucky? Yeah, said Spitfire, let me put this a certain way. Not many knights live long enough to retire. Smith was one of those lucky few. On top of that, she's lived long enough to watch entire generations of her family. She got to see the apples spread their roots across all of Equestria. On top of that, even though she's dying, she'll get to do it peacefully, in the comfort of her own home, surrounded by ponies who love and respect her, and all at a ripe old age. That kind of outcome is about the best that any pony could hope for, much less one of us knights. Twilight's head drooped. I suppose. Death comes for all of us, one way or another, said Spitfire, but the most we can hope for is that it comes gently. She took to the air, leaving Twilight alone with the food in the apple's front yard. Twilight watched Spitfire fly, the Wonderbolt's captain making her way to a tent that had been set up for Celestia while she oversaw the situation in Ponyville. I guess she's right, Twilight wrote to herself, but that doesn't mean I have to like it. With a melancholy sigh, she hefted the bag and the food it contained and made her way inside. An uneasy silence had settled over the apple's home once night fell. Apple Bloom had cried herself to sleep on the living room couch. She was curled up with Spike, his arms wrapped around her shoulders even as his tail coiled around the rest of her body. He'd spent the entire evening with her, doing his best to provide some form of comfort. For the most part, that had simply been holding her and encouraging her to eat once dinner came around. Applejack wasn't in much better shape. Though she wasn't openly weeping like her sister, Applejack had spent the remainder of the day in a quiet depression, sitting beside Granny Smith's bed, simply cradling the old mare's hoof in her own. Even though Smith had done her best to reassure her eldest granddaughter, Applejack hadn't seemed to listen all that much. Big Macintosh was probably taking it the best out of the Apple siblings. But even he had his limits. He'd kept up his stoic expression, steady and unshakable, trying to remain a pillar of calm support to his sisters. Only when Ditzy had come home from her work the mail didn't stop simply because Ponyville's post office had been reduced to a pile of splinters did Big Macintosh break down in tears, holding and being held by his new wife. The two of them had retired to their room after Ditzy had tucked Dinky in. The poor filly, now officially the youngest member of the Apple household, was only slightly less distraught than the rest of the family, having developed a strong affection for the elderly mare over the course of Mac and Ditzy's prolonged courtship. Twilight and Arkenstone were there as well. All of Applejack's other friends had drifted by throughout the day, doing their best to offer their condolences. Both Scootaloo and Sweetie Belle had visited Bloom. Sweetie had even sung one of her unique, wordless songs in an effort to provide some comfort to the grieving family. Ironically, she had been the one who'd ended up putting Bloom and Applejack to sleep. Macintosh had barely made it to the bedroom with Ditzy before they too passed out, the strain of the day catching up to them. Now the house was quiet. Across from the couch where Spike and Bloom rested, Applejack slept in a large armchair, curled up like an oversized cat, hugging her own tail even as her hat dangled from a corner of the chair's back. Nearby, on a pile of cushions, Twilight and Arkenstone lay side by side, Twilight resting her head across Arkenstone's forelegs even as he rested his head over hers. As such, no pony noticed when a cloud of glowing golden motes of light seeped in from the crack beneath the front door. The dancing orbs of light trickled in at first, then forming into a single large but ultimately shapeless cloud that began to flow in a smooth, undulating motion down the hall. There, the cloud paused once again as the lights flowed beneath the crack of another door, this one leading to Granny Smith's room. Inside the room, Smith lay awake, staring out the open window. It was a beautiful spring evening and thanks to the fact that the weather schedule had been put on hold by the battle in Ponyville, there were no clouds to be found in the sky. The entire tapestry of Luna's work was now laid out for her to see and she didn't feel like missing it. After all, this was probably one of the last nights she had left in the world of the living. It would be a shame to pass without appreciating Princess Luna's night one last time. Her gaze didn't deviate as the cloud of golden light crept into her room, forming into a large mass by her bed before coalescing and fading, leaving behind the form of a large white mare with a shimmering auroral mane and tail panting slightly as the last few glimmering lights faded, leaving the room in darkness. Sounds like ya winded yourself a bit, Princess, said Granny with a wry chuckle. That trick is more Luna's forte than mine, Celestia admitted, pausing to wipe her brow. She always had more patience for the subtler aspects of magic than I did. I was wondering if y'd drop by, said Smith idly, so busy right now. I wasn't sure y'd be able to take some time for a dying old mare like myself. She finally turned away from the window to look Princess Celestia in the eye. Celestia let out a chuckle of her own as she reached out to gently stroke Smith's mane. After everything you've done, I think I could afford to take some time to visit you during your final days. But I knew you wouldn't want me to risk exposing your secret in front of your family. I'm grateful for that, said Smith, looking out the window again. They don't need to be bothered by the things an old mare like me's done. When I go, they'll remember me as their lovin' granny and nothing more. That's the way it ought to be. It doesn't bother you that you're lying by omission to your daughter, the holder of honesty. Smith let out a dry cackle. The hardest thing to learn about honesty is when not to rely on it. The truth has its place in the world, but so do lies. Sometimes what's needed ain't honesty, but a little slight, oh hoof. She sighed. None, my students really got what that meant. But, at least that one fella gets it pretty well. You mean Swift Stride? Asked Celestia, raising an eyebrow. Yep, that's the one. I wish I knew where he was. If there's one wrinkle that I don't like about this whole thing, it's that he's not here. So you were planning on passing your seat to him? Celestia was a little incredulous. She knew for a genuine fact that, for all his faults and eccentricities, Swift's heart and actions were in the right place. In truth, she cared quite deeply for him. However, she hadn't realized that Smith considered him a candidate. That was my plan, said Smith. I thought he was the pony to trust with my seat. She sighed. Oh well, it ain't no use in crying over an upset trough. Arkenstone's up to the job. He may share that knowledge with Twilight though, Celestia pointed out. That's fine, said Smith. If he trusts her enough, then that's his call. If you've got any objections, now's the time to spit 'em out. None, said Celestia with a sad smile. Well then, that's that. Any other reason y'all want to talk to an old mare on her deathbed? Just to thank you for your service all this time, said Celestia. You have my gratitude. I'll miss your delicious apple cakes. Go in peace to the ones who went before you. I'll wait for y'other, said Smith. Are gonna join us someday. I will, said Celestia with a nod. Leaning down, she gently nuzzled Granny Smith's cheek. When she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. Thank you and goodbye, my dear friend. With that, Celestia called upon her magic and transformed into a cloud of glowing lights that flowed out through the window, leaving Granny Smith alone once more. Huh, muttered Smith, wonder why she didn't come in through there in the first place. Oh well, y'all can only understand that mare so much. She chuckled to herself and rolled so that she faced the window once more. I think it's our turn now, Young-un. A pair of black hooves hooked themselves over the sill. With a grunt of exertion, the Pegasus colt hauled himself up and through the window, landing on the floor with a quiet thump. His movements were clumsy and uncoordinated, which was only to be expected given what he'd just been through. His eyes glowed faintly in the darkness as he watched Smith. Well now, I wasn't sure if I'd see ya again, commented Smith with a wry smile as she looked at the colt. Ya ain't in any shape to be up and about yet. Does our ma know we're here? I heard you didn't have long left, said Dawn. I wanted to speak with you one last time, while I had the chance. Ya seem awfully calm about this, commented Smith. My master knew when his time was coming as well, said Dawn. It was the first time I had ever seen another pony die. He reared up so that he could rest his hooves on the bed. Thank you, Dot, for everything. That's an odd thing to say after what I put ya through, said Smith with a chuckle. I think we had that conversation before. We did, said Dawn, but I am still grateful. Also, I believe you may have done more than the others know. That's Smith raised an eyebrow. The first signs of Terra's presence were very early in the morning, Dawn pointed out. However, he didn't show up until much later. Originally, I had simply thought that a sign of how powerful Terra Heart was. However, I now believe that you went out to meet him and kept him at bay for as long as you could. What makes ya say that? Apple Bloom said she was worried that morning because you were nowhere to be found. That was because you were confronting Terra, weren't you? Smith sighed and looked away. Even when it's with the best intentions, even when it turns out well, a wrong's still a wrong. I did wrong by ya Young-un. By Celestia, ya needed that poundin' to get ya back in the right track. But that don't change the fact that I had those two stallions put ya through Tartarus to do it. I wanted to do something, however small, to make up for that. Did you have to give up your life? Asked Dawn. I didn't give up anything, said Smith sharply, giving the colt a stern glare. My time was comin', one way or another. All I did was use what I had to make that time mean something. Her glare faded and she smiled again. And even if that were the case, are a pony worth an old mare like me giving up her life fair anyway? If you say so, said Dawn uncertainly. I'm guessing ya heard ma little chat with Celestia. Have any questions? Some, admitted Dawn, but I will not ask them. I am still not certain that I want to strive for knighthood. That being the case, there is knowledge that I am not entitled to. So, while I have questions, I will not ask them. That's kind, oh yeah, said Smith, or a mighty fine colt. I'm proud to have met ya and I feel better knowing y'all be around fair ma kin, even when I'm not. Keep an eye on them fair me, especially AJ. She always takes these kind of things the hardest. I'll try, said Dawn, but I think that's more mom's role. True enough, said Smith, both ma granddaughters have been blessed with some mighty fine friends. Now then, y'all best be getting back before any pony knows are gone or y'all get an earful. Thank you, said Dawn, stepping back and bowing his head one last time. He clambered back out the window, landing with a strained grunt on the other side. However, Smith could hear his hoof steps as he made his way back towards the hospital tent. Smith snorted. To think, I'll get more visitors when I'm dying than almost any other time. I ain't been this popular since ma prime. She softly laughed herself to sleep. The next few days passed uneventfully. Once Celestia was certain that the area was secure, she departed back to Canterlot presumably to finalize plans for the attack on the cult Solar. In the meantime, more relief arrived from Canterlot, especially in the form of surveyors and engineers, who began the task of inspecting Ponyville's buildings, determining which ones were still in danger of collapse and which ones needed to be rebuilt completely. On top of that, other surveys needed to be taken for the roads and open spaces. Parts of Ponyville's topography had been permanently altered by the course of the battle. Deep fissures running through and across roads needed to be patched, craters needed to be filled in, and foundations for entire blocks of buildings needed to be assessed before reconstruction could begin. Fluttershy's house was declared safe immediately. Well away from the town proper, it was completely unscathed by the fight, although a few items had been knocked off shelves and some windows had cracked from the resulting tremors. It was all easily replaced and Fluttershy quickly moved back in with Dawn. To their mutual delight, they were soon joined by Caramel, whose house had been amongst those decimated by the battle. Caramel was a little surprised, as he hadn't expected the issue of what to do with his house to be solved in such a decisive fashion. His only real concern was about where Coco Pommel would stay, seeing as she had been using his guest room. However, he'd made arrangements with the ponies heading the reconstruction efforts to build a new, smaller house in the lot he still owned for her. In the meantime, Coco was staying with Rarity, Sweetie Belle, and Flaxseed. Fortunately for Twilight and Spike, though the library had been sitting right next to the spot where the battle had both climaxed and concluded, the old tree had held up under the stain, its roots keeping it fast against the worst that Arkenstone and Terra Hart had been able to bring to bear, though a substantial amount of cleanup and reshelving was needed to make it habitable again. Unfortunately for Arkenstone, the tea house had been almost totally decimated by the fight's end. Arkenstone himself had torn up a substantial portion of the place in order to use it for his weapons, and many of his supplies of tea and spices were lost. While he'd be able to stay with Twilight and Spike in the meantime, as he had before the tea house had opened in the first place, it would be a while before he was ready to open up his business again. Others were not faring as well. Sugarcube Corner had been gutted by the flower dust explosion Arkenstone had set off at one point, leaving Pinkie Pie and the Cake family without a home. Fortunately, Applejack allowed them to stay at the bunkhouse the Apple family used to house their seasonal workers. While she was upset about the loss of her home, Pinkie Pie was ecstatic that she'd be able to live in the same building as Mayweather for a while at least. Likewise, the Carousel Boutique, while not directly affected by the catastrophe, had been structurally compromised by the resulting tremors and would need careful repairs before it was declared safely habitable again. Fortunately, Rarity's parents also owned a house in Ponyville, which they rarely used thanks to their frequent trips abroad, which was large enough to hold Rarity, along with Sweetie Belle, Flaxseed, and Coco. Said house had escaped the battle with only minor damage and had quickly been declared safe. Rumble, his brother, Cloud Chaser, and Flitter had been displaced by the damage from the battle. Like Caramel's home, their house had been one of the buildings utterly decimated by the fight. Fortunately for them, Scootaloo had allowed them to settle in the cloud house left to her by Rainbow Dash, said house having been untouched by the ravages of battle. Scootaloo's house was relatively unscathed by the whole ordeal. Both the filly and her mother counted themselves lucky that they wouldn't have to arrange or deal with extensive repairs for the second time in under a year. All told, they were the lucky ones. Plenty of other Ponyvillians were left without their homes or a place that they could stay, even temporarily, and were forced to rely on the shelters erected by the relief workers brought in by Celestia. The task of rebuilding promised to be a lengthy and difficult one. The inhabitants of the town counted themselves lucky that this had occurred mid-spring, rather than during the fall or winter. In some places, times like this brought out the worst in ponies, causing them to turn on each other in a scramble for what resources and shelter were available. Sometimes they were prompted to focus their ire on the ponies they held responsible for a particular disaster. Fortunately, Ponyville was not one of those places. Instead, times like this brought out the best in ponies. They pitched in, worked together, and did what they could to help each other to get through this difficult time. On top of that, even though the impetus for the incident could technically be placed almost entirely upon two ponies in particular, no pony seemed to hold what had happened against them. The door to Granny Smith's room slowly opened and Arkenstone trotted in. "You wanted to see me?" he asked. Given the fact that Smith had sent Big Macintosh to fetch him, the question was a bit rhetorical. "Course I did," said Smith, nursing a mug of black coffee as she spoke. The doctor might not have approved of her choice of beverage given her delicate condition, but Smith was unconcerned given that her death was inevitable in any case. She saw no reason to skimp on her vices simply for the sake of buying a few extra hours. Closing the door behind him, Arkenstone took a seat by the bed. "What do you need me for?" Setting her mug aside, Smith sighed. "Ya know my place in the Celestial Order, right?" "The Siege Perilous," replied Arkenstone automatically. "It's a position held by a knight who has retired, a sort of honorary position. Her purpose is to serve as something of an advisor to active knights and help in the fostering of the next generation." "That's mostly true," said Smith, "but there are a couple things ya don't know. First, the Siege Perilous ain't just fair a retired knight. I was active myself when I took the empty seat. It's more than just a cushy retirement title. It's a responsibility, a burden, knowledge. The lids over Arkenstone's eyes slid back and his mouth opened slightly. For a moment he said nothing. Then, oh. As the siege perilous, I have one last duty to see through, said Smith, her expression softening. Before I die, I need to pass my seat, that knowledge to the pony who'll succeed me. That pawn'll be the next siege perilous and tasked with the duty of holding that knowledge until it's their turn to pass it to the next one and so on. That's the main reason why most ponies who take the seat are ones who either retire as knights or have already retired. Because if they were to die in the line of duty, then the knowledge that they carry would be lost, observed Arkenstone. Therefore, it falls to the one who occupies the empty seat to withhold themselves from unnecessary risks to protect that information. That's right, said Smith. What's left is my final duty, my final responsibility. I need to pass this knowledge on and the rank along with it. You intend to pass it to me? That's right, said Smith. She raised a hoof and beckoned Arkenstone closer. As he leaned in, she pressed her hoof against his cheek, rubbing it gently. I ain't telling ya that ya have to do this, but I am askins. Are the only pony here I can trust with this. Raising his own hoof, Arkenstone wrapped his fetlock around Smith's foreleg, pressing her hoof against his cheek a little harder as he leaned into the touch. After everything that you have done for me, I would be honored to accept your final burden. Are ya sure? Asked Smith. Once I'll give ya this, there ain't any going back. I already have such secrets, admitted Arkenstone. A few more is nothing too terrible. Letting out a breath, Smith relaxed, tension leaving her body. All right then, let's get this done. I ain't so flexible right now, so I'll need ya to lean in. She used her hooves to guide Arkenstone towards her, bringing their foreheads gently together. Without even needing to think about it, Arkenstone synchronized his breathing with hers, the two of them falling into a deep trance. Smith's eyes drifted shut. The sounds of the room and the world outside faded away, leaving nothing but the two of them. Then it came. Arkenstone realized that while it was knowledge, it wasn't communicated purely as memory. What was occurring wasn't telepathy, the exchange of thoughts directly from one pony to another. Rather, it was something else, an ancient spell probably. The information was stored, almost like a scroll in an archive, in a specific portion of Smith's mind. The spell simply functioned to move that scroll from one shelf to another. In the space of just a few minutes, that knowledge had moved from its place in Smith's mind to his own. Then it was over. The two of them pulled away. Arkenstone was breathing hard, his face dripping with sweat. On the other hoof, Smith looked relaxed, as though a tremendous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. And that's that, she said with evident satisfaction. I can't thank ya enough for that, Arkenstone. Y'ave made it so I can go easy with no more regrets. Arkenstone wasn't really listening to her, his mind busy absorbing and assimilating the information he'd just received. This is. Hush, said Smith, y'ave done our part. There's nothing else. Go back to her filly friend and don't trouble yourself with this old mare no more. But. What did I just say, young-un? Go on, get. With a resigned sigh, Arkenstone took his leave, shutting the door behind him and leaving Granny Smith alone once more. Reaching over, Smith took up the mug of coffee again and settled back against the pillows, smiling contentedly. Macintosha's ears perked up at the sound of the small bell ringing from Granny Smith's room. He had been in the kitchen, baking some treats for the ponies still without homes. He and Applejack had been trading that job off and on for the past few days, doing their best to make the situation for those displaced by the battle and its aftermath a little brighter. It was an ideal excuse, giving them a reason to have at least one pony in the house at all times in case their grandmother needed them. For all that, Smith didn't care to have ponies fussing over her day and night. Thus, it came as a real surprise to McIntosh when he finally heard the bell that they'd left by Granny Smith's bedside to ring if she needed anything. Up until now, she hadn't used it, not apparently needing anything save for the small meals brought to her by her grandchildren, which were delivered like clockwork. For a pony on her deathbed, Smith still held a healthy appetite, often remarking that, if her approaching demise wasn't a good enough reason to indulge herself, then no such occasion existed. McIntosh left off what he'd been working on and headed down the hall to Smith's room. Opening the door, his eyes widened when he saw his grandmother struggling to roll her wrinkled, emaciated body out of bed. Granny, what in tarnation? Don't y'all start giving me any lip, scolded Smith as she carefully set one hoof on the floor, followed shakily by another. I ain't gonna waste what time I have left layin' in bed. It's too fine, day fair that. But. Oh hush now, I ain't fixin' to go out fair an afternoon jog. Smith chuckled dryly as she worked her remaining two legs off the bed. I just wanna go out and relax in my favorite rockin' chair. On a day like this, I'll be able to feel the breeze through my mane. The weather's perfect. She fixed McIntosh with a stern look. Now help me out to my chair. Okay, Granny, said McIntosh almost automatically. At this point, he knew better than to start arguing with her. She was an apple through and through after all. Once her mind was set on something, she was as stubborn as any of them. Moving to stand by Smith's side, McIntosh held her steady as they slowly made their way down the hall to the living room. From there, he helped her navigate out to the front porch where her favorite old rocking chair waited, already moving back and forth in the light spring breeze blowing across the farm. With more than a little help from McIntosh, Smith settled her haunches into the seat and leaned back with a contented sigh, shifting her weight to make the chair rock a little more. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, taking in the sense of the farmhouse's wood, the smell of spices trickling out from the kitchen, the aroma of green spring grass from the land ahead, the sweet smell of the apple blossoms beginning to bloom, all of it intermingled with the smells of her children and their children and their children's children, all the way down to the current generation. It was the smell of home, of family, of everything she had ever worked and fought for, even during her time as a knight. Smith raised her ears, listening to the sound of the wind as it blew through the trees in the orchard and made the old planks of the house creak and groan. Further in the distance, she could hear the sounds of other ponies as they worked and talked amongst the shelters set up for them while they waited for their homes to be rebuilt. She could even pick out the laughter and high-pitched voices of foals, fancying that she even heard the voice of Cheerilee as the teacher did her best to continue her work, even in the absence of the schoolhouse. Smith opened her eyes and gazed out over her home. She took in the brilliant green of the grass, the aching blue of the sky above, the pure and puffy white clouds that dotted said sky, and the browns and greens of the orchard and its trees. She was home and everything was as it should be. It was a beautiful spring day and Granny Smith drank in every minute of it she could. Certainly, there had been trial and grief. But the worst had passed and every pony would be stronger for it. Her youngest generation of children were strong enough to continue on their own. The last of her unfinished business had been seen to in the past few days. There was nothing holding her back anymore. "You're still there, Mac." "Yup," said Macintosh, a faint hitch in his voice. He hadn't budged from his spot by the chair since helping Granny Smith to sit down. "Her the eldest," said Smith. "I want ya to look after her sisters, especially AJ. She's always had the hardest time letting go." "Yup," agreed Macintosh. "Poor Bloom'll probably wail up a storm, but I want ya to let her know just how proud I am o' her. Make sure she don't let go o' that Drake o' hers. He's a real keeper." With a sniff and a snort, Macintosh nodded, pausing a second to dip his head so he could wipe his nose. "Yup. And make sure you treat that mare o' yours right," she said finally, "both her and her little girl. Don't ya do wrong by either o' them." "Yup," said Macintosh a little more firmly. It wasn't as though he actually needed any encouragement to do his best to take care of his wife and daughter. "Good," said Smith, her eyelids drooping. "Now, we're supposed to be working on some treats for all them ponies. Y'ad best get back to it. Leave this old mare in peace. I'm fixin' to take a little nap." "All right, Granny," said Macintosh, getting to his hooves. It was reluctant, but he slowly turned and walked back into the house, casting one last glance back at his grandmother, the mare who had raised him and his sisters after their parents had died, the one who had guided the family since before their parents could even remember, and the mare who had helped build the town that they all called home. Finally, Macintosh was gone from sight, returning to the kitchen. He would work the remainder of the afternoon like a stallion possessed, as the work kept him from breaking down into tears. Meanwhile, Granny Smith continued to rock back and forth in her seat, her eyelids dropping ever lower with each swaying motion. Her vision was starting to grow dark, but the scents and smells of her home and the feeling of the wind against her coat were as stark and fresh as ever. She treasured the sensation as the last vestiges of her consciousness slipped away. Granny Smith's eyes drifted shut. As they closed, she let out one last breath, almost like a sigh of satisfaction that seemed to go on forever before it finally ended. Her chair's rocking slowed, then finally came to a stop. Her head slumped slightly, resting her chin against her chest as her entire body seemed to droop a little, the very last vestiges of tension leaving it. There, in her rocking chair, Granny Smith rested and did not move again. Author's notes. Even though I may have drawn it out a bit much, this was the vision I've had of Granny Smith's death for a while. If she was going to go, this is the way I wanted her to go. Also, yes, she's really dead this time. Next chapter, plans are made, lots of plans. To be concluded. Moving on. Chapter 28, moving on. The funeral was a quiet affair. For a pony who had such a remarkable and storied history, the practice of laying Granny Smith to rest seemed almost criminally subdued. Aside from her immediate family, there were only a few others. All 5 of Applejack's closest friends were in attendance, along with the Cutie Mark Crusaders. Rainbow Dash had flown straight down from Cloudsdale the moment word had reached her about what had happened. Arkenstone was there as well, silently leaning against Twilight Sparkle's shoulder as she sobbed quietly. Filthy Rich had come, dressed in his best suit, but had left Diamond Tiara at home. The only other outsider there was a wheelchair-bound Red River, who had insisted on attending, even though the doctors at the hospital were reluctant to allow him to travel. Granny Smith hadn't wanted a large funeral. Rather, as detailed in her will, her body was quietly cremated and her ashes were laid to rest amid the trees of Sweet Apple Acres, a single granite plaque set into the ground marking the spot. The ceremony was swift and perfunctory, once again per Smith's instructions. Once it was over, every pony turned to head back to the farmhouse to hold the wake. Mayweather, the Cakes, as well as several other ponies were preparing the food, setting up an occasion where every pony else in town could have their own chance to mourn Smith's passing. Only Applejack stayed behind. "Go on, y'all," she said, her voice choking with sorrow. "I just wanted to stay here a spell." To her surprise, a hoof rested on her shoulder. Looking over, she could see Red smiling at her. He'd been through multiple healing spells by this point. As a consequence, he was in something of a dazed state, but still lucid enough to stay awake through the funeral itself. When all was said and done, he would probably be whisked back to the hospital before the wake had even started. "I'll stay with you," he said. "But I'm staying." Red's tone was firm and indicated he wouldn't be budging without Applejack. Like Stormfront, Red had foregone the use of painkillers in between healing treatments. While his body wasn't in searing agony, he was beset by a near-constant barrage of aches and bizarre sensations from his flesh and bones literally binding themselves back together. Despite that, his face didn't so much as twitch as he smiled at his filly friend. Quote. Single quote. "K," said Applejack after a moment's hesitation. She gave him a small smile before leaning in to kiss Red on the lips. "Thank ya." Red nodded and settled back in his seat as Applejack turned to Smith's grave. Behind them, the others were already making their way to the farmhouse. Applejack gently ran a hoof along the edges of the stone square that marked Granny Smith's final resting place. "I don't know how I'm gonna carry on without ya," she said. "Ya were their fair everythings when I was born, when I started walking, when I got ma Cutie Mark, when ma and pa died. Y'ave always been there, as much a part o' this land as the grass and trees. And now we're gone." Tears ran from Applejack's eyes and her legs buckled. She fell to her stomach and laid her head on the stone. "I don't want ya to go, Granny. I thought y'd be here, always." As the tears running down Applejack's cheeks spattered on the stone, something happened. Through her stomach and hooves, Applejack felt a pulse through the earth. She couldn't rightly say where it came from, but it flowed into her, warm and welcoming. It wrapped around her like a gentle embrace and Applejack felt the faint, phantom sensation of a hoof stroking her mane. However, Red, the only other pony present, wasn't in a position to reach her from his wheelchair. At that same moment, the trees around them began to rustle. They were in a section of the orchard that hadn't started flowering yet. However, over the space of a few seconds, the trees all around the gravesite suddenly put forth a whole host of new buds that then bloomed into beautiful blossoms, filling the trees around them with color. Stunned, Applejack could only gape and stare as she lifted her head away from the gravestone. "What in Celestia's name?" "It's just as you said," said Red, rolling his chair towards her. "She's a part of this land, as much as the grass and trees. Her entire lifetime, she poured her power and will into this place, and even though her body has departed, her love for you remains." Getting up, Applejack looked over at her cold friend, who lifted a shaky hoof to caress her cheek. "I don't think she'll ever be truly gone. Her presence dwells here still and, I think, shall remain until the mountains crumble. She's stubborn that way." "That's true enough," agreed Applejack with sobbing laugh. Taking the side of her cold friend, she was abruptly reminded of how close he had come to death. Applejack's heart shuddered at the thought of losing not just Granny Smith but Red as well. She was almost overcome by the urge to throw her arms around the stallion and hold him tight. Only by remembering his currently delicate condition did she manage to keep herself from doing so. Instead, Applejack settled for resting her head over Red's shoulder and pressing their necks together. I'm so glad are gonna be okay. I'm not going anywhere, said Red, leaning into Applejack. Your grandmother had a message for me as well, though I'm afraid mine was more strict than yours. What did she tell ya? She told me not to do wrong by you. There was the implication that she would probably come back to haunt me if I did so. Red chuckled. She had a few other things to say, I think, about foals and the like. I don't need to hear that, snapped Applejack, her cheeks flushing as she jumped back from Red, prompting a laugh from the stallion. Allowing herself a small smile, Applejack started to chuckle along with him, her heart feeling lighter now. We should go, he said, carefully pulling at the wheels of his chair to turn himself around. The others will start to worry. With a sigh, Applejack settled in behind the chair and began to push it. I'm sorry about our spear, she said as they headed to the farmhouse in the wake. I heard it got broken during our fight. Red shrugged indifferently. I'll simply have to make a new one. Applejack stopped for a second. I thought y'd be sadder. Didn't our teacher give ya that spear as a goodbye? Oh, that wasn't the spear the old abbot gave me, said Red blithely. That spear broke a long time ago. All weapons do that eventually. This latest one was the one I made to replace it. I was also experimenting in creating a spear that was more travel-friendly. Y've gotta be kidding me, grumbled Applejack, and here I was, all worried that y'd be all mopey because of it. Even if I was so sentimental about it, I can't really afford to be mopey, said Red with an impish grin over his shoulder. I think you've been mopey enough for the both of us. Why outa? Applejack's irritated grumbles and Red's amused laughter flowed between the trees as the two of them returned home. The conference room was more crowded than usual. Even during the most important of diplomatic negotiations, Princess Celestia had always preferred more intimate and personal discussions rather than flooding the place with ambassadors and their retinues. It was rare for this room to see more than 10 ponies at a time. But now it was filled nearly to capacity. Every seat at the table was filled and the table itself was covered by maps and charts, overlaid with stacks of paper detailing the logistics of the plan that Celestia was about to order into action. I understand you have your reservations, Captain, said Celestia, looking over some of the papers hovering in front of her at Shining Armor, who was seated at the table across from her, with Cadence next to him. I understand your desire to do something about this, said Shining, his face grim. I want to put an end to this as well. But the Royal Guard will be stretched far too thin for this. Even with the Wonderbolts lending us their assistance, there's no way we can possibly cover every sector in such a short amount of time. It just isn't possible. On top of that, it means leaving Canterlot almost completely unguarded. The citizens and most definitely the nobles won't like idea of the entire Royal Guard shipping out at once. There's going to be an uproar. Celestia pressed her lips together. She wanted to put an end to the Cult Solar's farce once and for all. Her unwillingness to take direct action had brought harm to a great many ponies. However, by her reckoning, simply trying to go through Equestria, one town at a time, would ultimately work against them. Word would spread ahead of the Royal Guard's advance after their first crackdown, the cultists would go to ground, and their dismayingly persuasive leader would probably still find some way to twist Celestia's actions back against Luna and ponies like Dawn. Then, to her surprise, the pony on Shining's other side raised a hoof and tapped the table. He was a handsome, bright orange Pegasus with a dark blue mane named Flash Sentry. In addition to being Shining's lieutenant and second in command of the Royal Guard, he had also been named as the pony to succeed Shining once he retired from his captaincy. I'd like to suggest something, said Sentry, rather than trying to cover everything at once or do this one town at a time. Why don't we select a few particular points that we can strike at in order to maximize our effectiveness? What sort of particular points? Asked Shining, raising an eyebrow. Places where these cultists gather, replied Sentry. They're a religion after all. They must have meeting places, worship spaces, points where they can commune with each other and organize their efforts. The reports already mention a temple in Appaloosa. We should be looking for places like that. Speaking of the temple, said Celestia, what's the status of the squad that's en route? They should arrive the day after tomorrow, said Shining. Celestia had wanted to move against the Appaloosa temple immediately after Terra's attack in order to find what the Cult Solar was hiding there. However, organizing relief efforts for Ponyville had derailed that plan and the squads assigned there had only just departed by train. Celestia fully intended to go out there and join them herself when the time came. If nothing else, her leading the investigation of the cult's temple personally would hopefully send the strongest message possible to the group that she was not happy with them. Have you located any such places of interest? Asked Celestia. We've been looking, replied Sentry, but so far, all we've found are meetings of small groups, usually at ponies' houses and rarely in the same place twice. But for the Cult Solar to have so much traction, I'd be willing to bet my commission that they have something more prominent somewhere. He glanced past his captain at Princess Cadence, who was looking distinctly uncomfortable with the situation. I was hoping that since we apparently have the Cult Solar's second in command in custody, that we might get some more definitive information on that. Anything yet? Asked Celestia, looking to her niece. Nothing, said Cadence with a sad shake of her head. Terra hard as a broken stallion. He hasn't uttered a single word since you brought him here. He barely even eats. I think that his mind might have been broken. Perhaps I should speak to him again, said Celestia, a hint of anger creeping into her voice. If you try harsh methods, you'll only break him further, said Cadence. That won't get you what you're looking for. He'll just shut down completely. If only there was some clue, muttered Shining. At that instant, the door to the conference room slammed open to reveal a heavily panting Pegasus decked out in the uniform of a high-security courier tasked with carrying only the most sensitive information for the guard. Behind her, the thunder of hooves echoed down the hallway as a half-dozen rank-and-file members of the Royal Guard charged up behind her, clearly intent on apprehending the mayor, who apparently hadn't bothered to follow proper procedure in her rush to deliver her message. Emergency communication for the princess, gasped the mayor frantically as her pursuers closed in, highest priority. Celestia stood and stepped out the door, forcing the mayor to back up into the hallway. She lifted a hoof, bringing the pursuing guards to a halt. Return to your posts, she said. Pausing, the guards turned reluctantly and did as they were bid. Celestia then turned her attention back to the courier and smiled warmly. Please give me the message. I'm afraid I don't have a lot of time right now. The mayor nodded and slid a sealed tube out of her sleeve. Celestia took it up with her magic and examined it. The message tube was indeed one used to transport high-priority messages. Only the highest-ranked members of the guard had access to these canisters and used them for only the most urgent communications. Who is this from? He called himself Milk Snake, said the mayor, blinking in confusion. I don't think he was from the guard, but the confirmation code he used was legitimate. She paused, apparently trying to recall more details. I see, said Celestia. She turned back to address the ponies assembled in the conference room. This meeting is adjourned for now. Something urgent has just come up. Shining Armor, Cadence, please accompany me. Shining and his wife exchanged baffled glances even as the rest of the assembled ponies broke down into confused mutterings. Still, they did as they were told and followed Celestia into the hall as she led them down towards her room. What's going on? Asked Shining. Who is this Milk Snake guy and why is his message so important? Celestia couldn't keep an amused smile from her face. Shining Armor, I think you can work it out for yourself. Just what is a milk snake? Shining mulled the question over, trying to remember an obscure bit of zoological trivia he'd probably learned back in elementary school. Beside him, Cadence was doing much the same. Oh, shouted Shining and Cadence simultaneously, freezing in place for a second as the revelation dawned on them, swift stride. I suppose a message from him would be important, said Shining, but is it really something this urgent? Celestia frowned, her eyes drifting down to the message tube held in her magic. I believe so. Swift never contacts me unless there is a serious need. The last time I spoke to him was after that one escaped from Tartarus. We narrowly managed to avert disaster that time. I would much rather err on the side of caution. If you say so, said Shining hesitantly. He wasn't so sure. Swift Stride was known by the few who knew about the Celestial Knights at all as the most eccentric of the knights. Coming from a group with ponies like Arcana Lulamoon, that was saying something indeed. He was deceptive and evasive, always saying one thing and doing another. He rarely came to Canterlot or the royal palace, preferring to wander Equestria and its neighboring countries seemingly at will. Shining had received word about Swift's actions sporadically over the years but had only met the stallion himself a grand total of twice. Neither of those occasions had left a good impression on him. The three of them arrived at Celestia's private chambers. Celestia immediately went to her desk as Shining and Cadence closed the doors behind them. Popping the top off the tube, Celestia slid out the scroll and unrolled it. Her eyes scanned the message, reading rapidly. She started smiling, the smile getting wider as she read each successive line. However, as she reached the end of her letter, the smile vanished and Celestia let out a startled gasp. Her magic vanished, leaving the scroll to drop down to the surface of her desk. Princess, asked Shining, stepping forward. He reached out a hoof for the scroll so that he could read it himself. However, to his shock, Celestia slammed her hoof down on the paper and pulled it over to herself. Shining Armor, said Celestia. Her tone caused both Shining and Cadence to stiffen as they heard it. They'd never heard Celestia speak like this before. She sounded somewhere between absolute terror and overpowering rage. Yes, snapped Shining, automatically coming to attention. Mobilize the SES at once, said Celestia, have them ready to move out within the hour. Organize the rest of the Royal Guard for rapid deployment. All of them. But we don't have enough Pegasi and chariots to do that, protested Shining. As many as you can then, replied Celestia, but I want as many ponies as you can get underway ready in an hour. Send the rest by train and make sure that the tracks are clear on all routes. This gets absolute highest priority. This situation just got upgraded to a national emergency. What's going on? Asked Shining. What's in that letter? Targets, snarled Celestia. Shining swallowed. He'd never seen Princess Celestia like this before. She was both angry and terrified at the same time. However, the tone of her voice made it perfectly clear that she didn't want any arguments over this. Seeing that the conversation was over, he scrambled out of the room to carry out her orders. Cadence remained behind, watching with concern as the torrent of emotion faded from Celestia, leaving her to stare dumbly at scroll in front of her. What is it? Asked Cadence, stepping closer. Celestia sighed. Ever since that flash spark fellow appeared, I'd wondered what he was doing, what he was up to. Her eyes drifted closed. I probably should have seen this much sooner. What are you talking about? Asked Cadence, disturbed by what she was hearing. However, Celestia seemed to simply ignore her niece as she stared at the letter in front of her. Morning Star. Oh bother, muttered Morning Star, gently rubbing his nose as he watched the reconstruction efforts. This is troublesome. The damage done by Swift Stride's little act of sabotage had been more severe than Morning had initially thought. Though a great many components of the mechanism could simply be moved back into place, doing so had proved a tedious task, one that his workers had tackled with commendable zeal, but tedious all the same. Making sure everything was moved back into the right place was a tad more complicated than building it in the first place, especially when damaged pieces had to be removed and replaced at the same time. Already, they were past the deadline of the spring equinox. Terra Hart had already carried out his attempt to kill Dawn Lightwing. From everything Morning had heard about the affair, Terra hadn't succeeded. Fortunately, Celestia's efforts to mobilize the Royal Guard had been delayed by dealing with the damage done to Ponyville. But the game was up now. He'd already learned from his Canterlot sources that Celestia was moving out the Royal Guard. They were on the move and were heading straight for the temples, even the ones in secluded areas, like the one he was in now. Swift Stride. Was there anything he didn't ferret out? Wondered Morning idly. He didn't have much time left. Even more agonizing was that he didn't know just how close the deadline was looming. In spite of this, a faint smile played across Morning Star's face. It's a good thing I took some precautions then. Coco Pommel swallowed as she looked up at the library. She'd been here numerous times in the past few months. She'd checked out books, sometimes at the request of Rarity, sometimes for her own enjoyment or for the benefit of her personal projects. But now she was here for an entirely different reason. Her eyes drifted down to the ruined remains of the tea house that had once stood next to the tree. She'd been to that building as well, enjoying the taste of a warm cup of spiced tea while chatting with Rarity over whatever they'd been working on at the time. Her stomach dropped at the sight of the establishment's remains now. For some reasons she couldn't fully place, Coco had felt surprisingly safe and secure in the tea house, like she was under the watchful eye of some pony who was more than willing to keep her safe from harm. Given what she knew now, that much had apparently been true, aside from the watchful eye part. I should tell them, she thought, returning her attention to the library. Surely Mr. Arkenstone can help me. He must be strong enough. Ever since she had come to Ponyville, even through Pearl and Bluestreak's multiple visits to the town, Coco had never fully endorsed the idea of telling any pony the truth about her situation. After all, Perlin had made it quite clear who he worked for. If Baron Elderflower thought that she was going to be a liability, if he even suspected that she'd told any pony about being under his control, Coco was sure that Perlin would deliver her a swift death. She'd gotten first hoof experience in just how far the Baron's reach extended. His brief arrival in Ponyville back before spring had come was like a jolting reminder, which was only reinforced with each of Perlin's subsequent visits. And, as far as Coco knew, there was no pony that could stop them. She had seen Perlin effortlessly slaughter 2 score of trained fighters without so much as a scratch. He was a living weapon with wings forged from a nearly indestructible metal that could cut through steel like paper. How could Anpony hope to stand against something like that? Certainly, she'd heard that Don Lightwing was an accomplished martial artist and a capable fighter. However, Coco had only heard vague statements about the colt's abilities. It was hard for her to imagine that some pony could hope to equal the threat Perlin posed, especially some pony so young. But then Tara Hart had come to Ponyville. Coco counted herself lucky that she hadn't been present when the fight had actually started. Tara had apparently come for Don because of some superstition about Don's eyes, and Don had fought back. But Don had lost. However, Arkenstone had taken up the fight and Arkenstone had won. That fact stood out in Coco's mind. Tara Hart's arrival had been likened to an oncoming natural disaster. If Arkenstone could beat a monster like that, then, perhaps, he could protect her from Pearl and Bluestreak as well. Coco could tell him everything, and she knew that Arkenstone could keep Perlin or any of Baron Elderflower's other agents away from her. So why haven't I told him already? She dithered over the decision ever since the battle, inventing excuse after excuse. Arkenstone had won, but he'd been pretty seriously injured in the fight. It wasn't right to dump her situation on him when he was still recovering. Then it was because she was too busy helping Rarity salvage what they could from the Carousel Boutique so that they wouldn't have to start from scratch when the shop reopened. Then she was too busy helping with other relief efforts around town. All of them were just excuses to hide the real reason she hadn't gone to Arkenstone already. She was afraid, not of Perlin and Baron Elderflower's retribution this time, but because it would mean revealing that everything about her move to Ponyville, from working on Rarity's costume for the Heart's Warming pageant to wanting to finish her apprenticeship under Rarity, had been done under false pretenses, the result of Baron Elderflower's machinations. Certainly, Coco's enthusiasm for working under Rarity had been real, but that didn't change the fact that she was still a pawn, however unwitting and unwilling, in Elderflower's strange political game. Once Arkenstone learned the truth about her circumstances, it was only a matter of time until Rarity learned the truth as well. How would she respond? Would she feel betrayed? Would she still want Coco to apprentice under her? Or would Coco simply end up in the same straits she had during the nadir of her career, when Viscount Eventide had sunk her previous employer, Surrey Polymere's reputation and Cocos along with it? That was what truly frightened Coco the most. Every minute she had spent in the Carousel Boutique was a betrayal of Rarity's trust. Once she told Arkenstone, that betrayal would be revealed. Coco was certain that there was no way that Rarity would be able to forgive her. After everything she's done for me, how have I repaid her? By lying to her face every single day. Still, Coco couldn't bear to simply wait passively until the day the Baron decided to make use of her. She had to tell Arkenstone at some point. She was certain that the blind stallion was the only one with capacity to actually protect her from Elderflower's reprisals. Taking a deep breath, Coco did everything possible to steady her nerves and took her first steps toward the library door. Only to be drawn up short as something wrapped tightly around her neck, cutting off her air. Coco barely managed to force out a strangled noise before she was yanked bodily off her hooves and onto her back. Then, the mysterious force gripping her neck dragged her away from the library. Coco's eyes widened with fear as she found herself being pulled down towards a pair of closed shops and the alleyway between them. She thrashed and struggled, but it was a futile effort. Her vision was starting to go dark as her lungs burned from a lack of air. Just as she was on the verge of passing out, Coco's journey ceased and the unknown force released her neck. Flopping to the ground like a landed fish, Coco gasped and coughed as her abused throat both demanded and rejected the air she drew in. Breathing was a painful task and it took a few minutes for her to get herself back under control. Trying to get her bearings, Coco rolled over to get her hooves back under her and slowly forced herself to stand up. Her eyes managed to make out some pony in front of her. A unicorn mare with a blotchy white coat stepped forward, gazing at Coco with soulless, pitch-black eyes. The stare sent shivers down Coco's spine. However, at even that tiny motion, the mare's eyes narrowed fiercely and her horn began to shimmer with black lines of energy, paradoxically illuminating the cracks that ran along its length and sometimes shining out of them. As her magic built, the mare's horn began to let out faint wisps of smoke. Coco froze at the sight, realizing just what force had dragged her into the alley. Furthermore, as the smoke from the smoldering horn reached her nostrils, Coco had to fight back the urge to retch. Paying a late-night visit to the library, were we? Taunted a gruff, masculine voice from above Coco. Before she could tilt her head to look up at the source, she felt something cold and sharp press lightly against her neck, the edge of some sort of blade, held just a fraction away from breaking the skin of her throat and drawing blood. Careful to not move her head, Coco rolled her eyes upwards as far as they would go to try and see the speaker. She caught a glimpse of a shadow hanging between the buildings overhead. Struggling to keep from shaking, lest she accidentally press her neck down onto the blade against her throat, she opened her mouth, debating whether or not to say anything at all. Who are you? What do you want? She stammered. You could say that we're co-workers, taunted the voice from above, which is why we wanted to make sure that you weren't having thoughts about betraying our mutual employer. So these ponies were working for Elderflower as well. To make matters worse, they certainly weren't working reluctantly. But if they were here then, where's P. Perlin? In spite of herself, Coco actually found herself missing the presence of the young stallion. At least he'd never abused her like this. A faint chuckle escaped the figure above her. Your little colt friend hasn't come down with us. The Lord Baron has doubts about the boy's work ethic when it comes to you. Coco swallowed, the motion causing her throat to push uncomfortably against the edge of the blade. Now then, to business, continued the stallion above her, since you obviously were not planning on going to spill whatever you know about Baron Elderflower to Twilight Sparkle, we have no reason to kill you here and now. That's quite fortunate because we have a little job for you, courtesy of the Lord Baron. Coco whimpered. So this was what Baron Elderflower had gone through the trouble of having her placed under Rarity's care for. Something dropped down from the space above but was caught in a field of ebony magic before it could hit the ground. It was a tiny vial of some kind of transparent liquid, probably no more than 5 ounces. Hanging in the mare's magic, it hovered over to Coco so that it hung in the air directly before her eyes. Hold out your hoof, instructed the stallion. Coco did as she was told and the vial began to drift down to her hoof where she could take hold of it. However, it paused in the air just above her hoof. Do not drop it, said the stallion sternly. If that vial hits the ground, the next thing to hit the ground after it will be your head, sans the rest of you. Coco whimpered in acknowledgement and the vial was set gently so that she could curl her fetlock around it. Take good care of it. You won't need much at all. It's extremely potent. The blade to her throat began to slide forwards and upwards, scraping ever so gently against the underside of Coco's neck as it traced her contours all the way along her jaw to the very tip of her chin. Only then did it come to a stop again. In its new position, Coco now had a better view of the weapon that was threatening her. A long, slightly curved blade that tapered down to a vicious-looking point at one end hung just below her chin. On the other side, it joined perpendicularly with a shaft of rough wood that stretched upwards into the darkness above, a scythe. The stallion on the other end of the scythe slowly pulled the blade upwards, and with it Coco's head as she tilted it upward to keep the blade from cutting into her chin. The stallion guided Coco into tilting her head all the way back so that she was looking straight up at him. An emerald green Pegasus, his coat covered in blotches and scars, had wedged himself between the two buildings making up the sides of the alleyway. His hind legs were spread out so that his hooves pressed against the walls while his wings did the same. His forelegs were curled around the shaft of the scythe that still rested just barely against Coco's chin. Listen carefully, said the stallion, grinning as he met Coco's eyes with his one good one. You're going to do exactly as we say or you will die. The mare in front of you has a very good set of eyes and she will be watching you carefully to make sure that you don't have any thoughts about betraying us. Now, daughter, are you going to cooperate? Tears leaped out of Coco's eyes. Why yes, she said, her hold on the vial tightening. Good, said the stallion, now here's the plan. You've been quiet, observed Twilight as she lowered her book to look at Arkenstone. The two of them had arranged themselves on a pile of cushions in front of the fireplace. Twilight, as almost always, had a book laying open in front of her. In contrast, Arkenstone was laying all the way down, resting his chin on another pillow. With his eyes closed as they always were, he could have easily been mistaken for having dozed off. However, by now Twilight knew well enough that he was awake and that he was clearly being pensive about something. I've had a lot to think about, said Arkenstone. He was never one to not think, of course. But recent events had given him more food for thought than even he was used to. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised that I wasn't the only one keeping secrets. You mean that thing you went to see Granny Smith about? Asked Twilight. Can you tell me about it? I can't, said Arkenstone, letting out a breath. Granny Smith passed her seat to me. Her seat? Asked Twilight, a little confused by the vague terms. It turns out that the Siege Perilous is not simply a title for an old, retired knight, said Arkenstone. Even at this late stage, Granny Smith was still fulfilling an important duty. A secret? Twilight ventured. Yes, said Arkenstone, a very important secret, one that could do untold damage in the wrong hooves. It exists as a check to Princess Celestia's power. A check, mused Twilight. Arkenstone nodded. Remember what we learned recently about Princess Celestia's ultimate punishment? Twilight nodded. She remembered quite clearly, including her own worries about such a punishment. Then, that knowledge is. Arkenstone smiled. That's right. It's all here, the ponies she excommunicated, the crimes they committed, everything pertaining to their cases. Apparently, the Siege Perilous serves as a repository for this knowledge, a single pony to remember in order to keep Princess Celestia from ever abusing that power. I can also tell you that everything she said to us at that time was truth. Twilight felt a faint relief settle into her heart. She knew better than to believe that Celestia would actually abuse her power, especially when using such a terrible punishment. If anything, Celestia was regularly afraid of exercising her power too much, sometimes to the detriment of others. However, it was a relief to have confirmation of that. I'm glad, said Twilight. So am I, said Arkenstone, leaning his head against Twilight's shoulder. Thank you for trusting me, she whispered. Thank you for being some pony I can trust, he replied. Dawn pushed the bowl away. I'm full. On the other side of the table, Fluttershy and Caramel shared a relieved look with each other. Since his fight with Terra, Dawn's constitution had been weaker than usual, reminding the two of them of the days when he had first come to Ponyville after a year's time spent eating little but grasses, herbs, and whatever else he could scrounge up in the Everfree forest. Back then, more substantial fare, such as baked goods or anything especially sweet, had been enough to make him physically ill. This time had been slightly different. As could be expected from a pony who'd just been through a potent healing, Dawn's appetite had been enhanced. But, at the same time, as a consequence of his being on the receiving end of a magical transfusion, his stomach had rejected more substantive food and he'd been forced to rely primarily on broths and stocks. On the doctor's recommendation, Fluttershy and Caramel had been slowly working him back onto solid foods. The transition hadn't been an easy one. They'd started by switching from broths to progressively thicker gruels and porridges made from grains like oats, barley, and corn. Eventually, they would build up to more solid fare and get him eating normally within a couple more weeks. Tonight, he had eaten a fairly thick barley soup made by mixing a vegetable broth with grits ground from hulled barley, seasoned with a few herbs and spices. Fluttershy and Caramel had turned the soup into a stew for themselves, adding cut potatoes and several vegetables. Dawn had managed 2 fair-sized bowls for himself, which at least showed that he was feeling better. There were other consequences from Dawn's fight. His experience of what Dr. Stibble had termed wing stroke had left him unable to use his magic until it sufficiently recovered. Initially, Fluttershy, Caramel, and even Dawn himself had figured that it simply meant he would have to go without flying or practicing the Gale King for a while. However, even Dawn had underestimated just how much he'd relied on his Pegasus magic to go through his daily life, namely his wind sense. Initially, Don and his parents had attributed his bouts of clumsiness to general weakness and exhaustion. However, as time progressed and Don's physical strength and stamina recovered, he noticed that he was still unusually clumsy, bumping against items and ponies he thought were a safe distance away, knocking over objects he'd been reaching for, stumbling over unexpected obstacles, and being much more easily surprised than before. Once Fluttershy had come up behind him and wrapped him in a hug. Normally, such an action wouldn't have troubled Don in the slightest. But, on this occasion, he jumped and wrenched himself from her grip, actually kicking her in the stomach with his hind legs in the process. Only his awkward position had kept it from being a proper buck, which had saved Fluttershy from any injury more serious than a bruise. Don had been mortified by his actions and it had taken both Fluttershy and Caramel to calm him down after much cuddling and nuzzling. It was then that Don had realized his real problem. Ever since learning and refining his wind sense, he had gradually grown more and more dependent on it beyond simply using it in battle. Though he'd never realized it before, Don relied on his wind sense to gauge distances, his proximity to objects and other ponies. He used it to keep track of the things in his environment. In his current condition, without his magic to support it, Don's wind sense had been muted completely. Just as some pony with a cold who finds her nose stuffed or her ears feeling plugged, or how a pony who has recently lost an eye might struggle with depth perception issues, Don was feeling oddly detached from the world around him and it hampered his ability to engage with it. "Thanks for dinner," said Don before trying, and failing, to suppress the burp that forced its way up his throat. "You're welcome," said Caramel as he took their bowls to the sink and began to wash them, Fluttershy joining him. Don had tried helping on previous occasions, but a few broken dishes had ultimately led to him staying back and allowing his parents to take care of cleanup after meals. After the dishes were finished, the three of them retired to the living room. Caramel settled himself onto the couch while Fluttershy settled in next to him, cuddling up and laying her head against his shoulder. Don then climbed up next to her and tucked himself under her wing. The three of them settled down to read books that they'd recently checked out from the library, an activity that had become commonplace ever since Caramel had moved in. After a short while, the quiet evening was interrupted by some pony knocking on the door. Glancing at the clock, Fluttershy noted that it was still early in the evening. However, who could that be at this time? "I'll check," said Don, sliding out from under Fluttershy's wing and walking to the door. Upon opening it, his eyes widened in surprise at the pony before him. "Scootaloo." "Hey," said the filly, grinning at Don from beyond the threshold, "I just wanted to check up on you." Don blinked, a bit unsure about what to say. There wasn't exactly all that much to say about his condition. It was improving gradually, but he still wasn't feeling at his best. At this point in time, simply walking to the tent that had been set up as Ponyville's temporary schoolhouse was a chore. He hadn't been able to go to Scootaloo's for training in the mornings like he was used to, nor was he able to play as hard with his friends in the afternoon. Between his recovering stamina and his newfound clumsiness, regular life was much more difficult. "I wanted to train with you for a little while," said Scootaloo, giving Don a warmer, more sincere smile. "Since we can't go out to the quarry, I figured I'd come here to your place." "But Scootaloo cut off his protest with a derisive snort. "Come on, Don, even if you can't use your magic right now, you should still be going through your forms. It's good exercise and you need it. Besides, you'll get rusty if you spend every evening just sitting around on your rump after getting back from school." But Don cast an uncertain glance back at his parents, who were both smiling at him. "The doctor did say some light exercise is fine," said Caramel. "Just don't go overdoing it," advised Fluttershy with a smile of her own. "You put her up to this, didn't you?" inquired Don, his eyes narrowing slightly. Caramel coughed politely into his hoof. "I may have mentioned something about you laying around to Melon Cream earlier today." His hoof was still up by his mouth, but now it was hiding a grin. Don snorted, but was suddenly caught in a flowing stream of air that began to pull him out the door. Whipping his head around, he stared in surprise at Scootaloo as she swept her wings back, using the airflow to draw Don towards her. When did she get this good at regulating her strength? His question went unanswered as Scootaloo threw her arms around him and pulled the colt into an enthusiastic kiss as soon as he was in reach. "Come on and stop sulking," she said with a playful grin. Once she pulled back away, "I didn't give you a ton of my magic so you could spend every day down in the dumps." Don was unable to keep a smile from his own face as he sighed in resignation. "Fine, let's get started then." "Now that's what I want to hear," cheered Scootaloo as she pulled them both out into the yard. "Have fun," called Fluttershy as she shut the door behind the foals. Still smiling, Don took up his position beside Scootaloo and spread his wings. Before long, the two of them began working their way through the first form, pausing occasionally whenever Don stumbled, which was fairly often. However, as he continued, Don's heart felt lighter and lighter with each passing moment. "I suppose everything's going to be alright after all." To be continued. Author's notes. Alas, the latest story of the Savage Skies series comes to a close. The set has been thoroughly trashed and some shady things are going on in the background. I can't say how long it will be until the next story is ready to be uploaded, given that I'm not very far into it yet. Granted, not very far is roughly around 50,000 words or so. I think it'll be a few months before it's ready to go up. That said, now that I'm not working on editing and posting for this beast, I should be able to make a bit faster progress. The next story is set to be the climactic arc of the series, which means, for all intents and purposes, we are near the end. As it stands, including the next story, I have 2 more entries planned for the series before calling it completed. I have some other plans for side stories and the like as well, so you'll hopefully have those to look forward to. Also, check out my blog for the follow-up. Next time, Story 9 of the Savage Skies series, Dark Matter. Fool's Errand. A Knight's Tale, Fool's Errand. The night was eerily silent along the wooded path that ran just outside of Trottingham. In the wilderness, silence is an aberration. Even during the darkest hours of night there is always some source of noise, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, the creaking of trees, the sounds of various nocturnal animals as they go about their business. Even at this hour, the forest should have been filled with countless small noises. That it was completely silent was a subtle, but sure, indicator that something was terribly wrong. A sound broke the silence, a rustling of cloth as it brushed across the ground. Another sound joined it, the slow clop of hooves stepping forward at an almost glacial pace. Paradoxically, the noise made by the traveler only seemed to make the silence around him deepen as he went upon his slow, ponderous way along the path. There was little need for worry or concern. This forest was no Everfree, but one of the tamer forests that had grown up amidst pony cities, almost as cultivated as any Earth pony farm. It was a clear, moonless night, the darkest kind of night. Such a night suited him perfectly. Over 1,000 years and I am reduced to this, thought the traveler as he continued upon his way, his sights set upon the town beyond the forest edge, shuffling through the woods like a worthless vagrant. If I hadn't happened upon those fools, it would have been much worse. He had gotten lucky after all. He'd stumbled across a small merchant caravan a ways up the road, or rather, they had stumbled upon him. Pony compassion was a wonderful thing. They had lowered their guard so easily at the sight of a cloaked figure collapsed upon the road's edge. The unicorn mare who'd tried to treat him had been his first victim. Her magic, which had started as a healing spell, tasted deliciously sweet as he drew it out of her, leaving her limp and almost lifeless upon the ground. Her companions had immediately sprung to her defense, but they were but mites. Even in his present state, the traveler was not one to be trifled with. He had swatted aside Pegasus and Earth Pony alike. There had been other unicorns in the caravan, carelessly casting their spells at him, which he simply consumed along with their magic as he caught them. The last unicorn had foolishly tried to run, only to be snared and sent to join his brethren lying on the ground. Considering the situation, he would have been well within his rights to kill them. But, in his present state, the traveler couldn't afford to waste his strength. He'd simply decided to leave his victims where they had fallen. If they died there, then that was what they deserved. He would need his strength for the city and what lay beyond, where resistance would undoubtedly be stauncher. He would have to be subtle at first, a few unicorns here and there. Their magic was the easiest to draw, seeing as it was closest in essence to his. Eventually, he could work his way up to Pegasi, then Earth Ponies. He wouldn't be able to stay in one place very long. Once he began his work in earnest, Princess Celestia was sure to find out about him and would begin seeking him out. He could not confront her until he was ready. At least he was making better time, now that he had more magic. Before, his pace had been a literal crawl and his legs had barely been able to support his weight. But now, it was possible to manage a walk. At this pace, he would be at the city sooner than he'd originally planned. The sooner I begin, the sooner I can take what belongs to me. Beneath the cowl, two eyes, sparks of yellow swimming in pools of black, narrowed as the traveler looked down the path. Someone had moved. A short distance down the path, a pony wearing a cloak not unlike the traveler's own was examining something on the side of the road. The traveler's eyes widened and a rope of viscous drool leaked out of his mouth to dangle from his chin as he saw the glimmer of magic from a horn hidden beneath the hood. Thin lips curled into a savage smile and the traveler began to pick up his pace just a little. To be able to feed against so soon after the last batch of fools was truly a wonderful happenstance. As the traveler drew within hearing distance of the unicorn, he enacted his plan, slowing his gait once again to a shuffling crawl, bending down and lowering his posture, his movements becoming irregular, pained. Ponies are such bleeding hearts. The instant he sees another in pain, he will drop his guard. Sure enough, at the sound of the traveler's approach, the unicorn looked up. His eyes weren't visible from the traveler's angle, but the pony's mouth opened in a silent "oh" as he turned to face the traveler. Beneath the pony's robes, the traveler could make out some sort of garment of black cloth that hung loosely about the pony's body. However, that was of no interest to the traveler, whose eyes were fixed upon the light brown spike of the unicorn's horn protruding out from under the hood's edge. Who are you? Asked the pony. You aren't hurt, are you? Who is he? The pony asks, said the traveler in a faint, wheezy voice. Is he friend or is he foe? Hold on, said the unicorn, drawing nearer. I'll help you. I am most certainly not your friend, little pony. The traveler's lips curled back in a grin as began to inhale, as though he were sucking on a straw. Streams of magical energy began to flow from the pony's horn and into his mouth. Beneath the pony's hood, two narrow eyes widened as he watched the traveler drain his magic away. However, said the traveler in a mocking tone, just as you said, you shall indeed help me. He needed more. From beneath the hood, a red hand, attached to a spindly arm, snaked out at the pony, who was rooted in his spot. Before he could react, the hand reached his horn, fingers curling about the shaft. Yes, you shall help me. Then, the expression of fear and surprise on the pony's face melted away, the eyes narrowing once again and his mouth stretching into a victorious grin. Nah, just lying. The pony jerked once, yanking away from the traveler's hold. To the traveler's shock, the horn came away from the pony's head with a faint click. Instead of falling to the ground in agony, the pony instead became a blur as he leapt back away from the traveler. His cloak fell to the ground, revealing an Earth Pony stallion with a khaki-colored coat. In the darkness of the night, his spiky white mane stood out sharply, along with his tail, which looked strangely fox-like as it stretched out behind him. Wrapped around the stallion's midsection was a broad, white sash with two ends trailing off behind him like an extra pair of tails. He grinned playfully at the traveler. You were a lot easier to track down than I thought. I can't believe you fell for the old fake horn gag though. The traveler glanced down at the replica of a unicorn horn in his hand before glaring back at the stallion. As he did so, he straightened his legs and raised himself all the way upright. You dare to make a fool of the almighty Lord Tyrk. Well, not so much dare, as did, replied the stallion blithely. I figured that you haven't consumed all that much magic yet, so you couldn't have gone too far. I also figured that you'd jump at any chance to suck up some more magic like the greedy guts you are. One false horn with a charged crystal inserted into it later in. Viola. One escaped denizen of Tartarus apprehended. With a low growl, the traveler doffed his robe, letting it fall to the side, revealing the figure of a creature completely alien in this realm. Four thin and wiry legs held up a body that was unquestionably equine. However, where the shoulders and neck of a pony would normally be, the traveler instead sported a second torso, sprouting up perpendicularly from his hindquarters, all of it covered in pitch black fur. The second torso was not dissimilar from a minotaur's in nature, two thin, spindly red arms stretching out from equally red shoulders. His head sported a dangling, gray beard which served to frame a mouth pulled back in an angry grimace. Those terrible eyes, bright yellow irises floating in pools of black, glared balefully at the pony in front of him. From the top of his head, a pair of wickedly curved horns jutted upward out of a shaggy gray mane that hung down his second back. You believe you have captured me, little pony, snarled Tyrk, thrusting out the hand holding the detached horn, with this paltry parlor trick. His fingers tightened their grip around the horn as Tyrk glared at the stallion, who seemed unfazed and continued to grin impishly. Do not dare to think that you've captured me simply by luring me to you with this bauble. Oh, yeah, said the stallion, still grinning, about that. I was lying about the horn. What? Tyark looked again at the object clenched in his fist. Oh, it does have a crystal loaded with unicorn magic in it, said the stallion, but that's not the only thing. It's also packed to the brim with black powder. Tyark opened his mouth to answer, but a faint hiss, accompanied by a whiff of smoke coming from the object in his hand, drew his attention downward just as it blew up in his face. The monstrous centaur's bellow of pain was eclipsed by the thunderous clap of the explosion, and Tyark briefly vanished in a ball of fire and smoke that sent dirt and rocks flying in all directions. Tyark himself was launched backwards, slamming into the ground and skidding across it. His body, reinforced with his recently acquired magic, endured the blows, but it had been a near thing. As Tyark struggled back up to his hooves, he noticed that his hand was now blackened and burned. By the way, said the stallion, now smirking as he approached, pushing right through the column of smoke that lingered from the blast and coming out the other side, I figure I should introduce myself. I'm Swift Stride, Knight of the Celestial Order. How's that for an introduction? Knights, growled Tyark, the princesses have been busy. But still, it was rather foolish of them to send a mere earth pony after me. Hey now, said Swift, drawing himself up, I'll have you know I'm the strongest of the knights. You think that the princess would send any pony less than her best to take you down? In spite of the burning sensation on his hand, which was lessening as Tyark channeled his magic to heal it, the centaur laughed derisively. The strongest? Ha, do you honestly expect me to believe such tripe? A mere earth pony could not possibly be Princess Celestia's greatest champion, and certainly not one who relies on gimmicks and toys to fight me. To Tyark's surprise, Swift laughed and raised his hooves. All right, you've got me. I was lying about being the strongest knight. I'm actually the weakest. But you don't think the princess is crazy or stupid enough to send a unicorn after you, do you? His grin widened. Besides, it's not as though she needs to send her absolute best. Given how scrawny you look, I'd be surprised if you could put up any kind of fight at all. It began as a speck of light sparking into being in the space between Tyark's horns. With each passing second, it grew in size and brightness until a miniature sun the size of a small apple hung there. With an angry roar from Tyark, a bolt of burning, molten energy lanced out from the orb, aiming straight for Swift. Whoa, exclaimed the stallion as he dodged to the side, the beam passing by him and drawing a glowing line in the ground. Watch it. Some pony could get hurt if you do that. Tyark didn't even acknowledge Swift's taunt, instead launching another attack. The stallion ducked under this one, which struck a tree behind him and exploding it into matchwood. Tyark fired a third beam, aiming lower this time. Swift jumped over it, hanging in the air as he was. The earth pony stallion was an easy target for the next shot. But, as Swift hung in the air mid-jump, he reached a forehoof under his sash and pulled out a small cylinder, which he then threw to the ground below him. The cylinder exploded with a loud hiss, filling the air with white smoke that completely obscured the area for several meters, including the space where Tyark was standing. Tyark fired anyway, aiming for the place he'd last seen Swift stride. But the beam simply sliced through empty air. Can't hit what you can't see, taunted Swift from somewhere in the smoke as Tyark looked around for him. The smoke was slowly starting to disperse, but Tyark was noticing something else. His limbs were starting to feel heavy. His eyelids began to droop, and the world around him, despite the fact that the haze was clearing, was starting to get hazy all over again. This isn't just smoke. From above, Swift watched as he perched on a tree branch that shouldn't have been able to hold his weight, smirking as he stared at Tyark's silhouette in the smoke, watching as the grotesque creature began to slump. It's working. I was worried that he might not be affected by any of my compounds. But he seems to be susceptible to this one at least. Crimson nostrils flared and Tyark let out an enraged snort. The glowing sphere of energy between his horns flared, then launched a blaze of energy out in all directions, pushing the smoke away from him. At the same time, Tyark sent a stream of tingling magic down through his own body, sweeping away all traces of the drug that had been taken into his bloodstream. Did you really think you could defeat me with such a cowardly trick? He yelled, looking this way and that as he sought his adversary. Hey, it was worth a try, said Swift, before freezing as Tyark's gaze zeroed in on him immediately. Whoops. Tyark fired again, sending lances of fiery power punching through the forest canopy. Moving like a squirrel, Swift bounded from one tree branch to another, landing on one and using it as a springboard to fuel his jump to the next, twisting and flipping to avoid Tyark's shots with each jump as his path inscribed a circle around the centaur. Abruptly, Swift changed directions, launching off at a sharp angle that sent him flying directly above Tyark's head. Tyark moved to track the motion, but was too slow as Swift landed and immediately pushed off of the trunk of another tree, his next jump sending him to land directly on Tyark's equine hindquarters. If he's channeling magic through his horns, then maybe they're as vulnerable as a unicorn's as mid-cast, thought Swift, raising a foreleg. A slim, triangular blade slid out from beneath his sleeve. Moving quickly, Swift slashed at one of Tyark's horns. The blade actually sparked as its edge made contact and skipped off. However, instead of screaming in agony, Tyark growled and whirled around, moving so sharply that Swift was knocked off his hooves as Tyark's hindquarters whipped themselves out from under him. But before Swift could fall all the way to the ground, Tyark's uninjured hand snapped out, moving with the speed of a striking snake and closing around Swift's throat. I guess that's a no then, thought Swift as he struggled to breathe, dangling from Tyark's grip, which was surprisingly strong, given how skinny the centaur's arms were right now. I have had enough of your mockery, growled Tyark, I will make your death slow. That doesn't really work for me, said Swift as he struggled to remain breathing in Tyark's grip. At least the monster wasn't trying to actively choke him yet. You presume you have a choice in the matter, hissed Tyark. Well, if I can't beat you, said Swift, his grin coming back, I need to at least make sure I take you with me. From somewhere within his black clothes, he produced a grapefruit-sized sphere with some sort of string dangling out of it. Gripping it in the fetlock of one foreleg, he smacked it against something hidden in the sleeve of his other foreleg, creating a spark that caught on the fuse and set it into sparking life. This is the biggest bomb I've got, said Swift, raising it so that Tyark could see. Already, the fuse was burning past the halfway point. This'll take out everything in a 50-meter radius. Let's see us stand up to that. Fool, snapped Tyark, tossing Swift away from him. However, Swift had already dropped the bomb, which landed right at Tyark's hooves. His eyes widening in a panic, Tyark scampered backward, the orb of magical energy hanging between his horns blazing to life once again, creating a glowing barrier between him and the bomb. On the other side of the barrier, Swift didn't move, giving his opponent a mocking grin. The fuse burned all the way down and vanished into the interior of the bomb, which then let out a little puff and hissed slightly. Sorry, said Swift, laughing again, I was lying about the bomb. It's a total dud. You didn't really think I was stupid enough to try and kill both of us like that, did you? You cowardly little. Tyark dropped his barrier and strode forward, fully intent on twisting Swift's grinning head off with his bare hands. Oh, said Swift suddenly, sitting down, sorry. I was lying about lying. Did you know that blowing stuff up isn't the only thing you can do with bombs? He raised a hoof and pointed at the still smoking device. Look more closely. Tyark's eyes automatically followed Swift's hoof and fixated on the bomb, just as it burst. The world went white in a deafening roar that eclipsed even the explosion of Swift's first bomb burned its way into Tyark's ears, completely drowning out his agonized screams. Even telling me to look more closely at the bomb was a trap. He realized as his hands rushed to cover his eyes, even though the reaction was far too late. In the wake of the explosion, Tyark was left reeling, staggering on his hooves as his eyes burned and his ears rang. His hearing was just barely good enough to pick up the thud of hooves on the ground directly in front of him before two more hooves connected right where his torso joined with his hindquarters, knocking him off the ground and sending him flying as Swift hit him with a powerful buck. Tyark's body slammed into a tree, breaking it in two. He slumped to the ground, unmoving, his body going limp. Rather than pressing his attack, Swift instead dodged off the path and into the foliage, hiding himself amongst the forest undergrowth. Once he was hidden, he pressed his back against a tree and settled onto his haunches, reaching down to gently massage his hind hooves with his forehooves. Damn, what the hey is that guy made out of? He's got that scrawny, starving look that makes ya think he'd break like a twig if you breathed on him too hard. But I think I'd be hard-pressed to find a hunk of refined orichalcum tougher than this nut. Carefully, Swift glanced around the side of the tree at the unmoving form of Tyark. He's faking it pretty good, noted Swift. Tyark's outstretched hand was pressed, palm and fingers down, against the ground, looking as though it had landed like that when the centaur had collapsed. In fact, Tyark was carefully attuned to the vibrations in the ground, using that to sense any approach while his sight and hearing recovered. On top of that, he might even realize that I can see through his ruse and is just using it to buy time until his senses recover. A cold sweat broke out across Swift's forehead as he went back to hiding behind the tree. I'm just barely staying ahead of that guy with my tricks. Geez, even fresh out of Tartarus, this guy's a real monster. Despite these grim thoughts, Swift's grin didn't fade in the slightest. This is the most fun I've had in years. Using his magic, Tyark was beginning to restore his sight and hearing. With a low, rumbling growl that belied his slight physique, he got to his hooves and stood up once again. You are a persistent insect, he growled. Hey, protested Swift from within the undergrowth, where do you get off calling me an insect? If anything, you're more like an insect than I am. Zeroing in on the sound of Swift's voice, Tyark sent a fiery bolt searing through the leaves and bushes, leaving a trail of flames behind it. However, there was no sign of the infuriating stallion. I mean, when you think about it, continued Swift's voice, now coming from the foliage on the side of the path opposite where it had first come from, you're the one with 6 limbs. You've got a head, something that could be called a thorax, and an abdomen. Get it, bug guy? Tyark turned and fired at the new source of the voice. But, once again, the beam of energy struck no pony, simply burning viciously through the undergrowth. Swift's voice popped up from a new location. Come on, you've gotta admit it. When it comes down to bugginess, even changelings don't hold a candle to you. Cease this annoying prattle and come out, roared Tyark, the blazing sphere of light between his horns flaring yet again, this time sending waves of explosive energy radiating out of him from all directions. Trees shattered and their splinters caught fire. Leaves were sent spinning through the air, igniting as they did so. The entire area was filled with burning shrapnel scattering in all directions. At the explosion's center, Tyark stood. His shoulders were hunched and he was breathing hard. His arms hung at his sides, feeling much heavier than they had before. Even the 4 legs he was standing on were beginning to tremble. From the edge of the area Tyark had just destroyed, Swift stride emerged from the smoke and flames, coming to stand on the slope of the shallow crater Tyark had just created. Running out of juice, huh? You haven't had the chance to suck the magic out of many unicorns yet. I figured you couldn't keep this up for too long. For a moment, Tyark glared silently at his adversary. Then, he slumped further, sagging almost all the way to the ground. Unbelievable to be bested by the likes of you. Even though you are an earth pony, you are, by far, the most cunning adversary I have ever faced. Ah, said Swift, waving a hoof demurely, you're just saying that. You're making me blush here. True enough, his cheeks were turning a shade of pink as he faked a shy grin. It almost makes me wonder, said Tyark, what is such a brilliant strategist such as yourself doing as a mere errand boy for Celestia? Swift's ears perked up. I mean, as clever as you are, you could easily do whatever you please with your life, said Tyark soberly, spreading his arms out, you could take what you want and hardly anyone in the world would be smart enough to stop you. What hold does Celestia have over you that would make you bend to her will like this? Swift's smile began to fade as he listened to Tyark's words. What makes you think that she has something over me? He canted his head attentively. Twin streams of something that looked like smoke burst out of Tyark's nostrils as he snorted. Please, I know that mare well enough. She despises deceit and lies. She clings to paltry platitudes, such as honesty, and harmony, and all the things that go with them. There is no way she would accept a pony with your skills and talents running loose without a collar. You serve her because she has left you with no choice in the matter. Swift's eyes widened as he glared at Tyark. You really think I could pull one over on her? She's been around for thousands of years now. Seeing through little lies like mine is practically fool's play for her. But you can escape her hold, said Tyark, smiling now, a glimmer of triumph in his eyes. I misjudged you earlier. You are truly a worthy adversary. If you were to join me, then I could help you escape from Celestia's control. You will be free to do as you wish, tell whatever lies you please, take whatever your heart desires. Lies are for manipulating and crushing the weak. You have that power. You should be permitted to use it the way it was meant to be used. You really think you can beat the princesses? Asked Swift, raising a skeptical eyebrow. With your help, I'm certain that it's possible, said Tyark, his lips curling up in a sneer. With your mastery of deception, you can easily deflect their suspicions whilst I regain my strength. Then I shall be able to come for the power of the princesses themselves. That's a tall order, mused Swift, tapping his chin. She may not be one for lying, but given how long she's been around, it's gonna be tough getting one over on Her Majesty. I am sure that you are more than capable of it, said Tyark. What do you say? Will you join me? Speaking as an accomplished liar, said Swift. What proof do I have that I can trust you? I've heard you're a pretty gifted deceiver yourself. Proof, Tyark idly tapped his chin with a finger before he broke out into a smile once again. Oh yes, I do have something I can use to show my sincerity, a gift of sorts, if you will. A gift, huh? Tyark raised a hand to his neck. For the first time, Swift noticed a triangular golden medallion, hanging from a fine gold chain. Pulling the medallion off his neck, Tyark held it out towards Swift, letting the chain dangle off of his hand. This once belonged to the one closest to me, my dear brother. It is a symbol of the friendship and trust that existed between us. Allow this to serve as proof of my sincerity. Your brother, Swift looked thoughtful for a moment before grinning widely. I guess if you're willing to entrust me with something that important, I can't really say no. It's a deal. Coming in closer, Swift reached out a hoof towards the medallion. As the hoof got closer and closer, Tyark's smile widened. Then, just as Swift was about to take the medallion from Tyark's hand, Tyark dropped it, instead moving to quickly grab Swift's foreleg and pull the stallion towards him. Aha, now I've got you, worm. Something clicked and Tyark looked down, suddenly realizing that he wasn't actually holding Swift's foreleg. Instead, his hand was holding another cylindrical container, slightly longer than the smoke bomb Swift had used earlier. What? Before he could even continue asking, the end facing him flipped open and Tyark was suddenly sprayed in the face with a fine, white powder. By the way, I was lying about joining you, said Swift, still grinning, but standing farther away than he had been a second ago. He lifted up hoof he'd been reaching out with. Dangling from it by its chain was Tyark's medallion. I think I'll hold on to this, he said, twirling it about his leg. You, snarled Tyark before cutting himself off. There was a burning, itching sensation in his nose. More poison. I wasn't actually ever planning on coming over to your side anyway, said Swift idly, stowing the medallion in his clothes, but even if I was, you really need to work on your lying skills. You really don't think Princess Celestia told me all about your story? I mean, holding out that medallion as a symbol of trust and then saying it belonged to your brother, the brother who's best known for siding with us ponies and essentially stabbing you in the back. The princess warned me that you were a pretty slick talker, but your lies are actually pretty lame. Seeing that Tyark was having trouble responding, Swift chuckled. Oh, and by the way, that's not poison that you were sprayed with. It's actually high-grade sneezing powder. AHCHOO. Right on cue, Tyark began to unleash a storm of sneezes, practically doubling over as they racked his body. Desperately, he tried to use his magic to purge the fine dust from his nostrils, but every attempt to cast was interrupted by another succession of sneezes. All the way, Swift simply watched and cackled merrily. Lurching forward, Tyark lunged at Swift's stride, wildly swinging his fists and trying to crush the stallion with them. Swift leaned to the side, allowing one of Tyark's swings to plummet down right past him before suddenly darting right inside the centaur's reach, coming up short against Tyark's stomach. He pressed a single hoof up against Tyark's front belly. On the ground, his other three hooves suddenly twisted sharply and dug into the earth with a series of loud crunches. Swift's body seemed to lean slightly forward and he extended the foreleg that was touching Tyark a little bit farther. Tyark was launched backwards, hit by a force comparable to a runaway freight train. His body slammed into the edge of the crater, plowing straight through the ground and digging a trench along the earth before he came to a stop. Still sneezing and snorting, Tyark tried to get up, only for his eyes to widen as he saw another cylinder flying right at him. At least this one was a much more conventional bomb. The fiery explosion engulfed Tyark, knocking him back further still. Unable to summon his magic thanks to the sneezing powder, Tyark was forced to endure the heat and pressure with his own body, crying out in pain as his skin blistered and burnt, the fur of his coat being scorched away. However, the explosion had another, less harmful effect. The fiery fumes seeped into his nostrils and burned away all traces of the sneezing powder. Getting back up, Tyark looked up just in time to see Swift's stride closing in again, leading with that slender blade hidden within the sleeve of his clothes. Enough, he roared, releasing another explosion of magical energy in all directions. This one was much smaller than the last one, only extending a couple of meters in any direction. However, Swift ended up charging right into it and was blasted back with a grunt of pain and sent sprawling. I have endured all the humiliation I can stand at your hooves, growled the centaur, rearing up to his full height once again. Ironically, his injuries only served to make him an even more intimidating sight, his skin marred by sections of cracked red and black that slowly shrank as the burns he received from the explosions began to slowly knit themselves back together. Woo, that was a doozy, said Swift as he stood up. However, before he could fully get his hooves under him, a glowing orange aura coalesced around his body and he was lifted from the ground. I will make you cry, snarled Tyark, tossing his head. In sync with the motion, Swift's body was suddenly hurled against a tree with a loud, groaning crack. I will make you scream. This time, he sent Swift's body slamming down into the ground. I will make you beg for my mercy and then I shall skin you, inch by inch, before allowing you to finally die. Swift was slammed into another tree, then back into the ground, the process repeating over and over again. Finally, the aura released him and the stallion came to a stop, lying limply on the path. Tyark stood over him, panting hard from his exertions. I am Lord Tyark. All the magic in this land is mine. You ponies exist for my sake. Learn your place, insufferable vermin. Step by ponderous step, Tyark advanced on Swift, glowering down at the stallion who had caused him so much pain and hardship. Had this battle occurred at a later date, after he'd had more time to consume power from additional unicorns, Tyark would not have struggled so. The fact that Swift had caused so much harm, even in Tyark's present state, was an insult that could not be borne. To Tyark's surprise, Swift's body twitched once, then twice. Then, with a low groan, he rolled over slightly and opened one eyelid wide enough for Tyark to see a light blue eye glaring up at him. Why you should have listened to your brother. My brother was weak, snarled Tyark. He swallowed your pony lies and betrayed me because he could not stomach the fact that he would always be inferior to me. Hey, Swift chuckled, but the sound came out more like a pained grunt. That just goes to show how little you understand about ponies. That's why you're going to lose here. Both of Swift's eyes opened wide and he grinned menacingly up at Tyark. Tyark reared back, launching another lance of energy down at the stallion. But Swift was already rolling out of the way. The force of the blast hitting the ground where he'd been resting a second ago launched Swift into the air. However, Swift turned the motion into a roll that brought his hooves back under him and he landed in a standing position a few meters away, looking slightly more bruised and battered, but still more than capable of fighting. Impossible, gasped Tyark, how can you still be standing after that? Come on, said Swift with a laugh, you didn't think Princess Celestia would make me one of her knights if I didn't know how to take a few hard falls. There's a trick to it, but you're gonna have to do much worse if you plan on putting me down. That can be arranged, hissed the centaur, charging up another shot of his magic. Swift suddenly lifted a hoof sharply. Hold up. Caught off guard by the sudden change in Swift's tone, Tyark hesitated. You're a lot tougher than I expected, Swift admitted, reaching into his sash once again. If I'm gonna beat you, then I'm gonna need to bring out my secret weapon. Tyark's anger faded, immediately replaced by a sense of caution as he stepped back. However, instead of withdrawing another bomb, Swift instead pulled out a silver flask. Sitting down, Swift popped the top and began to chug down the contents with ever evidence of enjoyment. Tyark looked on, too confused by the unexpected action to even think about acting. What are you doing? Lowering the flask, Swift wiped his mouth on a sleeve and grinned. Just wetting the old whistle. I need to get a good buzz going to do this right. He tucked the flask back into his sash. For a second, nothing happened. Then Swift hiccuped. It seemed to jerk his entire body and he began to sway on the spot. Alright, he said, getting to his hooves, now wobbling, dash the stuff. He lifted a hoof, looking as though he was going to start walking towards Tyark, but instead staggered to one side, swaying to the point where it seemed he was going to fall over, but managing to catch himself at the last second. Doing so only seemed to send him staggering in the opposite weapon. What are you doing? Repeated Tyark, his frustration growing at the sheer ludicrousness of the situation. ITSSH ma secret weapon, slurred Swift, giving Tyark a dazed-looking smile. Thish ISSH drunken hoof. He bobbed and swayed again. Now listen here, ya weird thingy, you. Ah don't like ushin' thish. I'm really gonna feel thish in the mornin'. Sure you'd better be worth it. Drunken hoof. Tyark stared at the unsteady stallion a moment longer before his lips curled up in an angry snarl. I've had enough of your mockery. The shimmering orb of power hanging between his horns flared to life once again, this time launching a bolt of energy straight at Swift's hooves, intending to destroy his footing. Swift staggered to the side once again, seemingly by accident, but the motion carried him clear and the bolt smashed into the empty earth right where he had been standing. Tyark tracked Swift's stumble and aimed where the stallion was going to end up next. However, Swift seemed to tilt over and went into a quick roll that carried him over and past the target area before Tyark's shot could even reach it. Whoops! Exclaimed Swift, coming back up to his hooves. Ya mished. Roaring, Tyark fired again, but every shot he took seemed to just barely miss as Swift stumbled, lurched, and even tripped out of the way, the stallion's jerky, irregular motions frustrating the centaur's aim at every turn. What Tyark failed to notice was that, even as Swift stumbled from side to side, he was actually stepping in closer with each and every dodge. Before Tyark had even realized it, Swift had closed the distance between them. Tyark lashed out with a fist, intending to cave in Swift's skull with a punch. However, at the last instant, Swift suddenly seemed to trip and fall forward, causing Tyark's fist to pass just over his head, barely brushing against Swift's mane. Swift's fall became a forward roll and he lurched unexpectedly up from the ground again, this time planting a shoulder against Tyark's front stomach. From where his legs connected with the ground, his body seemed to undulate and Tyark was once again slammed by an incredible impact that had his hooves plowing furrows in the ground as he was driven back. Holding out one open hand, Tyark conjured a ball of flame in his palm and pitched it at Swift. The stallion lurched backwards unsteadily as the flame impacted the ground in front of him. However, instead of exploding, the ball instead seemed to soak into the ground. An instant later, a rocky spike exploded outwards, its tip aiming right for Swift's chest. Swift reached out with a foreleg and hooked his fetlock around the end of the spike, even as it continued to drive towards him. In a single, flowing motion, Swift pulled himself up and rolled over and across the spike, managing to plant his hooves on the stone spire near its base. Using it as a platform, he pushed off into a jump that sent him rolling through the air in a lazy motion as he brought one hind hoof down on the top of Tyark's head, the kick landing right between the centaur's horns. Reeling back, Tyark howled with agony. He staggered from the impact. Looking up, he tried to find his target only to see nothing. Swift had already stumped off to one side of Tyark. No sooner had all four of the stallion's hooves touched the ground had Swift reared up onto his hind legs and lashed out with his elbow, the motion causing him to practically fall against Tyark's side. As clumsy as it appeared, the move was powerful enough to send a spike of pain through the centaur as the elbow crashed into the barrel of Tyark's equine half. The force of the blow was nearly enough to knock Tyark over. Spinning his second torso, Tyark swung one spindly arm backwards, aiming to catch Swift with a backfist to the head. Even as Swift's elbow was still resting against Tyark's flank, Swift's foreleg unfolded and extended back out, reaching over and up to the top of Tyark's back. Swift's stride clamped down, actually pinching Tyark's spine and his fetlock through the skin and muscle on Tyark's back. The powerful grip on Tyark's spine sent a razor-sharp jolt of agony through him. Screaming in pain, Tyark could only watch as Swift used his hold as a point of leverage to pull himself up and over Tyark's back and out of the way of the incoming fist. As he reached the apex of his motion over the centaur's back, Swift's body seemed to jerk unsteadily again, changing the axis of his roll. The sudden change in motion caused him to channel all his body's momentum to his fetlock, which was still pinched around Tyark's spine. There was an almost inaudible pop followed by yet another jolt of pain through Tyark's body, then Tyark's hind legs ceased to heed his mind's commands. Swift released his hold and went into a cartwheeling leap away from Tyark, landing on all four of his hooves but nearly falling once again. Pretty neat, huh? He said, wobbling in place. When ya practice holdin' cup SSH all the time, ya get a pretty strong grip. You. Tyark's growl trailed off as he realized his condition. His body was battered, burnt, and broken. The injuries he'd received throughout the battle were taking their toll. To make matters worse, he was reaching the limit of his magical capacity as well. The magic of the few unicorns he'd managed to consume before now was not enough to keep him going for much longer. This is unacceptable. Did I finally manage to orchestrate my escape from Tartarus to end up falling to this drunken buffoonery? Tyark froze, his eyes going wide. Drunken, that's it. Staggering, Tyark sank down, his forelegs buckling. In his condition, it was easier anyway, given that his hind legs had practically folded up on themselves. His magic was already working to repair the damage and realign his spine so that he could regain his mobility, but it would take time and his power was already at its limit. To think that a worthless pest like you could push me this far, he growled. "Aw, ya ain't fakin' or ya?" asked Swift, staggering slightly closer. "Fool," rumbled Tyark, "you've taken my power to even stand and you're doubting your victory." I ain't doubting nothin'." Swift paused, his eyes rolling upwards. "RISSH that one, oh them double nega whatsits." Swift didn't notice the subtle, orange lights that were beginning to outline his body. Tyark was barely using any magic at all. To think that I would use the spell my brother created to keep me in line during our victory feasts. Just as the spell was nearly finished, Swift suddenly realized that he was once again in the grip of Tyark's magic. "Wait, ya tricked me, again. To think that you would actually give me the means to defeat you," said Tyark, laughing now. "I hope you enjoy the consequences of your foolish actions." WHAAAAT consequences. Slurred Swift, "What kind, oh magic thingy ISSH thish?" "A simple sobriety spell," said Tyark. "It immediately advances you from a drunken idiot to a hungover one." It clearly took a moment for Swift's strides-addled mind to process what Tyark's words meant. It gave Tyark just enough time to finish the spell, which ignited with a flash of energy that washed across Swift's body. He staggered again, this time much more clumsily, actually falling over as his hooves went to his head. "Oh www, damn it." Tyark's laugh boomed through the night. He deliberately made it as loud as he could, delighting in the sight of Swift's face twisting in agony as the loud noise tortured his newly sensitive ears. Now that his foe was incapacitated, Tyark could focus on his own recovery. Finally, with another pop, the displaced vertebrae moved back into pace, tormenting Tyark with another jolt of pain, but also giving him back use of his hind legs. The burns and bruises from the rest of the conflict were fading as well. But his magic was near its limit. "He may be a fool, but he forced me to fight much harder than I'd anticipated," thought Tyark. "I will need to rest to recover what little strength I've managed to gather so far." "No mere mortal pony has ever challenged me to this extent," said Tyark, still talking loudly as he stood up to exacerbate Swift's pain. "You may have only managed to do so because my powers are limited at this time. But I suppose you deserve some praise for doing so well. It is a pity that your death shall be in vain." Tyark lifted one hoof and brought it down on Swift's side, deliberately doing it slowly, rather than stamping down. He also chose a soft, fleshy bit rather than somewhere with breakable bones. This pony had given him a great deal of trouble and he intended to make Swift suffer as much as possible before killing the stallion. "I am going to enjoy this," said Tyark, leaning forward and grinding his hoof into Swift's body. Swift opened his mouth, crying out in pain, but the sound exploded out as a wheezing grunt. Tyark's smile widened and he turned his attention to Swift's sash. Leaning over, he reached down and pulled out the flask that Swift had put away earlier. "But first, assuming there's any left, I think a celebratory drink is in order." A quick shake of the flask indicated that there was still liquid swishing about within it. "Excellent. The volume is low, but if it got him inebriated to such an extent, then it must be a potent spirit indeed, the perfect drink to crown the end to this fight." Popping the top of the flask, Tyark lifted it to his lips and allowed the liquid within to spill across his tongue. Then his eyes widened. Instead of the harsh bite of alcohol that he'd been expecting, he instead tasted something sweet with some added astringency. The liquid that he'd just drunk came spraying out of his mouth. Shocked, he pulled the flask away from his mouth and stared at it, aghast. "Cranberry juice. Hey, don't knock it, that stuff's good for you." The sound of Swift's voice from below instantly caught Tyark's attention and he looked down just in time to see Swift roll out from under his hoof. Swift's roll actually carried him beneath Tyark's barrel so that he was lying, belly up between all four of Tyark's legs. Swift's four legs kicked up in unison, all four hooves planting themselves into Tyark's underbelly and launching him upward with a cry of agony. As Tyark's body soared upwards, Swift rolled again, getting his hooves under him just in time to push off the ground and launch himself at a nearby tree. Rolling again in midair, Swift landed hooves first on the trunk and kicked off and upwards at an angle that allowed him to intercept Tyark's flight. As he flew past Tyark, Swift's foreleg whipped out and he hooked a fetlock around one of Tyark's small, weak-looking but deceptively strong wrists. The wrist that was connected to the hand holding the flask for that matter. "I'll take that," said Swift with his characteristic mocking grin in place, using his other fetlock to pluck the flask from Tyark's grip, quickly popping the top back in and secreting it back into his sash, all before Tyark could even begin to react. Then the fetlock that was holding Tyark's wrist increased its pressure, tightening like a steel vise. Beneath its grip, Tyark could feel the bones of his wrist grinding together, an immense power threatening to crush the joint into powder. It was agonizing. But Swift wasn't done by a long shot. Using Tyark's wrist as a fulcrum, he pulled himself into a flip that sent him heading back towards the ground. A moment ago, he had been leaping through the air as though he weighed nothing, but now he fell as though his body weighed several tons, pulling Tyark along with him. As they neared the ground, Swift altered his flip, using his body as a fulcrum and bringing Tyark's body down into a heavy slam that cracked the ground and filled the air with Tyark's latest bellow of agony. Even as his body bounced off of the rock-hard earth, Tyark raised a hand once again, filling with fiery power before slamming it down into the ground. Just as Swift's own hooves touched down, an array of rocky spires launched themselves from the earth, threatening to impale Swift once again. Swift was forced to roll backwards to avoid being struck. As he did so, he barely missed one of the spikes as it grazed his face, cutting a line of red through his khaki coat. Rolling back to his hooves and standing back up, Swift could see that Tyark was sprawled out on the ground. The battle had definitely taken its toll on the centaur. At one point, the tip of one of his horns had snapped off. The glowing sphere of magic hanging between those two curved horns was now barely the size of a fireplace ember, flickering weakly, only just barely remaining lit. "Almost there." "Another lie," groaned Tyark, trying to stand. Swift couldn't help but grin. "There's a funny thing about drunken hoof. It's pretty much impossible to do if you're actually drunk. But that's how it's portrayed in all the comics and film reels, so it gets ponies every time. You're not the only one with a sobriety spell out there." Tyark was almost standing all the way up now. However, his body looked even thinner and weaker before, looking as though it had shriveled. Before, even with how scrawny he had towered over Swift. But now, he was only half again as tall and Swift was certain that he was getting smaller with each passing minute. "I cannot lose," rumbled Tyark, "not to a mere mortal, earth pony." Swift laughed. Hey, he said, remember what I said earlier, about being the strongest of Celestia's knights? Tyrk's eyes narrowed. You were lying. Yeah, well, Swift seemed to step forward and vanished. Tyrk's eyes caught a flash of motion right in front of him and looked down to see that Swift was now standing within inches of his front belly, having seemingly crossed the distance between them in an instant. I was lying about lying. Tyrk heard all four of Swift's strides hooves hit the ground simultaneously. After that, the only thing he knew was pain. At last, silence descended on the forest once again. The echoes of the battle that had taken place faded into the distance and the sounds of the forest itself resumed their natural chorus, free of the wrongness that had tainted the area before. It now sounded just like any other night. Swift's stride looked down at Tyrk's unmoving form. The ember hanging between the centaur's horns had dwindled down to a minuscule spark flickering. Finally, with a tiny popping noise, it vanished. Swift could feel the magical essence that Tyrk had stolen from every unicorn that had crossed his path since his escape, swirling out into the ether, hopefully to return to their owners. I hope the ponies of that caravan managed to get out of this. Swift had come across the caravan while following Tyrk's trail from Tartarus. At the time, the most he'd been able to do was provide some basic first aid for them. He'd loaded them up on one of their wagons, trying to get them as comfortable as possible before scattering some chemicals around it that would deter any predators that might be roaming the woods. This forest was not one of Equestria's wild zones, like the Everfree was, but there was still some risk for injured and immobile ponies. Hopefully, once the unicorns got their magic back, they would be able to help their companions and at least get them the rest of the way to civilization. Swift wasn't currently able to afford them any assistance. He had needed to catch up to Tyrk before the centaur had reached Trottingham and had started draining the magic of the ponies within. Even now, Swift didn't dare leave Tyrk unattended for a minute. Such a wily foe would almost certainly find a way to escape if Swift took his eyes off him for even a moment. And the next time they fought, Swift figured that he would probably be the one lying helpless on the ground. Still, he muttered, now I have to haul this guy back to Tartarus. Tyrk's body jerked sharply, making Swift take a cautious step back. Slowly, lethargically, wincing in pain with each movement, Tyrk turned his head just enough to gaze blearily at Swift. Why? He gasped, his voice coming out as a choking wheeze. Why would someone like you follow Celestia? What hold could she possibly have over you? Swift snorted. What makes you think that she needs something to hold over me? Doesn't she though, said Tyrk. She prattles on and on about the importance of honesty and integrity. It was even one of those blasted elements of harmony that she and her sister used on me in the first place. A deceitful creature like you could not bear to serve the will of a pony like her. There must be something. The stallion laughed once again, long and loud. Well, maybe it's because she's the only pony I've never really been able to lie to, he said. She's the only pony I've never wanted to lie to. We do crazy things for the ones we love after all. Still more lies, growled Tyrk. Smirking down at the centaur, Swift said, maybe. I could be lying. I might not. You'll never know. You'll spend the rest of eternity in Tartarus wondering just what the answer might be. It's something to keep you occupied. Tyrk looked as though he wanted to say something else, maybe hurtle another threat at Swift. But instead, his head slumped back down and his eyes drifted closed. Looking around, Swift winced as he felt bruises along his sides and back. Horse apples. The jerk nearly got me a couple of times. He sighed. Damn, it's a long trip back to Tartarus. I wish I'd borrowed a wagon. Celestia's hoof tapped a steady rhythm, sending a clicking noise echoing through the throne room with all the consistency of a metronome. The staccato noise was not lost on those attending the day court, and the ponies looked around anxiously to see what had their ruler so agitated. Princess Celestia was normally the incarnation of regal calm, listening to her little ponies with boundless patience, no matter how frivolous the matter at hoof might be. Thus it came as something of a surprise to Celestia herself when the noble in front of her had finished listing her grievances towards some shopkeeper or another, and Celestia suddenly realized that she had missed the entire presentation and had no idea of what the mayor was talking about. My apologies, said Celestia, doing her best to maintain her composure, but I would like to hear the details one last time to avoid any mistakes. Her graceful recovery seemed to at least fool the noble mayor into thinking that Celestia wanted to check the facts once more, and gladly launched into a tirade about some clothier who had refused to grant her the discount the mayor clearly thought was due some pony her rank. Working as hard as possible to keep her eyebrow from twitching, Celestia settled the matter quickly, wanting to move on. There was still a line of ponies leading out the doors, along with the attendant audience, all of them waiting eagerly for each decision she made. Celestia just wished that she had the energy to spare for court at the moment. It was hard to remain focused on what was in front of her when she was distracted by the constant worry caused by the knowledge that he was still out there. At first, it had been a rather amusing interlude. Celestia had come to the Starswirl, the bearded wing of the Royal Archives, to find a pineapple upside-down cake recipe, amongst other things. Starswirl had been an accomplished baker when she'd stumbled across Twilight Sparkle, dressed in a rather bizarre outfit. Further confusing matters was the presence of both Spike and Pinkie Pie. Celestia had desperately wanted to know what was going on, but she had noticed that Twilight had apparently had a rather rough week, if the state of her mane, the eye patch, and the black, skin-tight outfit were anything to go by. So Celestia had decided to save her favorite student some embarrassment and act as though nothing was amiss. It had been an amusing story to hear, one that Twilight had related though a letter later on about a rather unpleasant affair involving time travel. I told Starswirl that spell was nothing but trouble. However, one particular detail had immediately sent a chill down Celestia's spine. Cerberus had been in Ponyville. More importantly, it was nowhere near his regularly scheduled day off when one of the Celestial Knights took over his post for a brief time. Something had drawn Cerberus away from his post. Terrified at the thought of what might have broken out, Celestia had rushed to Tartarus immediately and had found her suspicions confirmed. Tyrk was gone. In all of Equestria, there were only a few ponies whom Celestia would have trusted to track down the monstrous creature and return him to Tartarus. Twilight and her friends were not yet ready to face such a dire foe. In the end, she'd turned to the pony she'd thought most likely to succeed. Over a week later, and Celestia had yet to hear from him. The next pony was coming forward to make his case when Celestia's steward rushed in through the doors, trotting past the line of waiting ponies and making straight for Celestia's throne, pushing aside a very miffed stallion as he came to stand right next to Celestia. Your Majesty, said the stallion, his voice barely a whisper, there is a stallion named Ash Borer here to see you. Celestia's eyes widened and she whipped around to stare at her steward. Did he say why? He did not, said the steward, but he did say that it was at your convenience. For a second, Celestia's body slumped as she let out a loud sigh of utter relief. That must mean he succeeded. And he came back. Thank goodness. A faint smile crossing her face, Celestia looked up at the ponies still waiting for her. I am very sorry, my little ponies. However, something of the utmost importance has come up and I am afraid that I must suspend this session of the day court until tomorrow. Please leave your case information with my staff and I will see if I cannot expedite my judgments when you arrive. Stepping down from the throne, she cut a swath through the crowding ponies as she made her way out of the throne room, her steward following in her wake. Behind her, she could hear a melange of discontented muttering and baseless speculation. None of that mattered though. A great crisis had been averted and there was some pony she needed to thank for that. I see your taste in aliases hasn't changed since the last time, said Celestia as she strode through the doors of her room. Behind her followed a few maids carrying trays of tea and assorted snacks. She paused at the sight of Swift Stride sprawled out on the pillows in front of her fireplace, staring up at the ceiling through eyes so squinted that they might as well have been closed. It was strange to see him without his loose-fitting black outfit and outlandish white sash. Celestia was probably one of the only ponies who had ever seen him like this. Before her maids could follow her into the room, she used her magic to swipe the trays from them and quickly dismissed them before closing the doors. Without his clothes on, Swift looked so much more vulnerable to her eyes. She traced the numerous scars running up and down his barrel, his legs, and across his back. On his sides, she could see some evidence of fading bruises. On his cheek was evidence of a small cut recently healed. Apparently, he'd managed to get through this mission without any permanent reminders. At the sound of the closing doors, Swift's ears twitched and he rolled over to look at her. Sorry it took me so long to get back to you. I had to check up on a few things before I came to report in. I've brought you a souvenir, he said, holding out a hoof and showing her the medallion that dangled from it on a golden chain. The old blowhard didn't seem to be terribly attached to it, so I figured he wouldn't mind if I held onto it. Celestia took the medallion in her magic and floated it over to hover before her eyes. Scorpion, he gave this to his brother, hoping that it would serve as a sign of their bond. I suppose Tyrk only ever saw it as a sign of betrayal. Huh, maybe I did the jerk a favor by taking it off him, muttered Swift. Even if you did, I am still grateful that you brought it to me. Tyrk may have received this medallion from his brother, but Scorpion actually received the medallion from a pony, a very brilliant mage by the name of Starswirl. Celestia smiled as she tilted the medallion and watched the light shine off its surface. Well now, said Swift, that story didn't make it into any of the histories. Giggling, Celestia set the medallion down on her desk and set out the tea and snacks for the both of them. It's quite a fascinating story. Would you like to hear it? Swift gave her a warm and genuine smile as he made himself comfortable on the cushions. I certainly would. I've got plenty of time now. He sat and listened as Celestia began her tale, basking the warmth of the fire and savoring the taste of the tea. At this moment, there was no place in the world he would rather be. It is true that I value honesty. However, the truth can be a double-edged blade. Depending on how it is used, it can cause harm just as grievous as any lie. That is why I believe that lies and deceptions do have their place in this world. But no lie can truly be good unless the liar understands the truth that lays beneath it. To be the greatest liar, you must also have the greatest understanding of the truth, a lying tongue and an honest heart. It is with that in mind that I hereby knight you, Sir Swift Stride. Normally, your titles come from your peers, but I shall give you a title of my own making. To others, you shall be the false. However, that title is itself a lie. Your true title, known only to me, shall be the false tongue and true heart. Know that, whatever lies you tell, I shall always have faith in you, my dear little pony. Even as he listened to Celestia's story, Swift smirked at the memory of Tyrk's question. I told him that we do crazy things for the ponies we love, maybe that's a lie. Maybe trying to put a name to this feeling is another kind of lie. But whatever it is, it's more than worth living for. Setting aside thoughts of the past, Swift turned his full attention and listened to Celestia's tales of ponies long ago, certain that there was no place he would rather be. Author's notes. Happy April Fool's Day everyone. This is My Sorta Prank, which is releasing a side story featuring none other than the diabolical Swift Stride and just how Tyrk ended up back in Tartarus and how the season 4 finale never occurred, which is a bit redundant, seeing as the season 3 finale hasn't occurred in this setting either. I guess I should have been a bit more specific with the hint from the last chapter. This was what I meant by that time of year. Sorry if I led you to the wrong conclusions. An updated teaser will be placed in the most recent chapter. I had a lot of fun writing this chapter. It was a bit tricky for me to make a freshly escaped Tyrk into a credible threat when he's hardly had the chance to steal the power of more than a few ponies. But I think I pulled it off rather well. Even if he'd only managed to take the magic of a half dozen or so unicorns, that'd still mean he'd be carrying a good bit more power than your average pony around right there. On top of that, being a quasi-immortal being that's been around who knows how long, Tyrk's sure to have some nasty tricks up his non-existent sleeve, even at his lowest. I kinda ended up rushing this one out a bit to make the April 1st deadline, so the editing might be a bit rough. Again, thanks to any of you who spot any errors. Next time, we return you to your regularly scheduled chapters.